Book 1 In My Beginning. Chapter 1 Spring of what seems so long ago. Growing up in boarding schools develops in a person a unique perspective on life's goals and options, as well as a somewhat distorted perspective of what friends and family mean to you. The experience varies for the people I've met and those I grew to know. From my perspective and in my environment, the people I observed always began with wealth and most often included the entitlement that goes with being wealthy. Students I met at the boarding schools I attended came from a wide variety of wealthy backgrounds on an international scale. That was a testimony to the school's perceived value in the world and was reflected in the cost our parents or guardians paid to ensure we could take advantage of the opportunities the world was sure to offer graduates of such a fine institution as ours. My own path to exile began earlier than most due to two tragic life-changing events, my mother's death and my father's freedom. I was born Canadian by nationality, but never actually lived in Canada. Prior to my mother's death, we lived in Copenhagen in a very tall industrial-like complex. As I remember, it was nice on the inside, in a museum sort of way, but very cold on the outside. I left that place for the last time at the age of 5 to attend my first boarding school. I never returned to any place I called home after that because after my mother's death, my father took a job in Hong Kong to pay for his true passion. My father was a yachting enthusiast to the extreme. In his early years he competed on the international yachting scene, which is where he took advantage of the connections he made. Working with his yacht moored close enough to spend every waking minute on it was his only plan in life that I was aware of. Whether he had to work or not was debatable. All the money in our family belonged to my mother's estate, and although he kept his yacht and a small annual stipend, it seemed he was surplus to requirements, having served his purpose. My formative years were spent at a very nice school in northern Switzerland, in a town called Schaffhausen, on the German border. The winters were fantastic for all types of sporting events, and those of us who stayed for the summer grew to love the place even more with its rugged terrain and hidden valleys between every hill. Apparently, Schaffhausen had been around for 1,000 years before I got there. I didn't make many long-term friends at that school because students came and went as family fortunes rose and fell. Additionally, the children of the wealthy and privileged or royal and noble tended to be a bit high-strung to say the least, and it was difficult to develop enduring friendships. One friend I did make during those years in Switzerland was Juan Pedro. His family fortunes rose and fell in spectacular fashion by changing the politics of his country. People chanted his father's name in the streets after the revolution, and he was naturally the first president of the new republic. As time passed, he grew more comfortable in his role as an icon for the revolution and the rewards such notoriety made available to him. I think it was about that time Juan arrived at the school, and in fact in the same dormitory as I was in. I liked Juan right from the start because he didn't come from old money. He came from new money. This meant he didn't know how the privileged were supposed to behave. While his family was rapidly gaining experience with the behavior of the privileged, Juan's education of privileged behavior was being deprived. At school, life was orderly, and goals had to be achieved. Eventually Juan's family felt they were more privileged than the rest of the country perceived them to be. A hasty vacation on the family plane found them 5 countries away at a relative's jungle retreat. I said farewell to Juan that weekend. He was whisked away to follow his jungle path through a series of connections and transfers. We could not exchange addresses, but we did exchange a hollow promise to meet up again someday. Preferably after one of us has changed the world, Juan prophesied. During those formative years, my encounters with my father were limited to holidays such as Christmas and intermittent short summer vacations that were always in warm weather climates, near the water. The port would have lots of nightlife and plenty of yachts around. That may sound like a lot of fun, but for someone of my age there was no nightlife and not a lot of excitement. Eventually I didn't miss going on holiday with my father at all. My father's indifference and my mother's bequest allowed me to choose my own educational options as I grew older, as long as I achieved the targets and goals of their expectations, should anyone bother to check. Therefore, when I was old enough, I made my way to Ridgeway School in Scotland. The location placed it well among the esteemed Scottish institutions of higher learning, as well as a great base for adventure and escape. That is where I met my lifelong friends. It seems I owe my Uncle David, on my mother's side, a thank you for the opportunity to enter Ridgeway. The question of entry into Ridgeway was not the funds required. The screening of the candidates for both their academic achievements and, more importantly, for what their name could do for the school was far more critical. The right reference was the best offense. Whatever influence Uncle David wielded seemed to be enough to get me in the door. Whatever that influence was, it served me well as it gave me the opportunity to meet the friends I made in the years to come. Others in my sphere of influence had more specific demands made upon them than I did. One of my best friends at Ridgeway was Ian. He was actually some level of English nobility that had the option to grow into something much more depending on family health and welfare. At this point, due to his position within the family, his options pointed to medicine or diplomatic channels. Ian would be a star at either, however he was doing his best to point his path towards medicine. Many people claim to be interested in benefiting all of mankind, but very few put any effort into it and probably don't have much to offer anyway. Ian was the exception. Ian had the look that the German-bred British royals all had. His blonde hair and blue eyes also came with a bit of a sour look. Most of his family had this trait, and I always thought when I saw them in pictures that they must be smelling something the others weren't. Ian would say his oldest sister Anne could turn milk sour just by looking at it. Throw in a couple Habsburg chins, the odd glacial forehead and such an abundant enough supply of teeth to make Rocky the squirrel envious. That was Ian's family portrait. He led our group study sessions. They usually just included the night before the exam and a great set of condensed notes. His attitude was, everyone gets over the fence and no man is left behind. That was his position on all team events, and that's what motivated us to be prepared. More than anything else we were prepared because nobody wanted to let Ian down. We were all reasonably smart people, so achieving the milestones of this academic world weren't really a serious challenge. Ian's mind was more than just a memory bank of data, and he was always thinking on at least the next level. You might call him a forward thinker. He knew what he wanted to do in life and planned to get there as fast as he could so the real work could begin. Although he was christened as a Protestant, he was not religious at all. In fact, he had a distaste for all religions that accumulated the wealth of their subjects to buy golden trinkets. That could be the definition of royalty also, but not here. His younger brother Richard was less respected by the group. Although he was a student at the school, he was not in our age group for assignments or even excursions. Richard did, however, make his presence known from time to time because he shared a room with Ian. It seemed Richard's options in the family succession plan were directed toward the clergy, and that suited him just fine. He was the definitive rat bastard of the school, turning anyone in for any crime as long as it moved him a step closer to his goals. Languages were Richard's forte, especially dead languages, because these held the secrets to many great treasures of knowledge as well as wealth. He regretted being a Protestant rather than a Catholic because the Catholics had infinitely more ancient texts with more ancient secrets. Also, as a Protestant he couldn't be Pope. Richard was not the type of person you would want to have witness any of your indiscretions because his silence would not come cheaply. I can't imagine anyone crazy enough to confide anything to him, but he had his devious ways. You couldn't take the good without the bad because for those of us who were generally left to our own devices on special occasions such as Christmas, Easter, and summer vacations, it was important to stay on their good side. An invitation to one of their estates for the summer or Christmas was a hotly contested ticket all year long. Perhaps my closest friend was Gordon Zola. Gordon was the type of friend you usually got into trouble with. He had a mischievous side that always struck a chord with me, and he was also a willing ally when the idea or scheme was mine. But honestly, who in their right mind would name their child after the foulest of all cheeses? In his parents' defense, where Gordon comes from, his name is Corridon Zola, and it only gets changed to Gordon when he's in English-speaking countries. His father, Count Laszlo Zola, inherited the title and money from his family. The family owns a small casino somewhere on the French Riviera, but that's not where they originate from. The Zola roots reach back in Hungarian history. Count Laszlo operates the family casino and manages several independent casinos along the coast. The Count was a security expert with incredible security systems and knowledge of the criminal element, at least on the Riviera. We could have called him Gordy or Gordo or Stinky, but instead I chose Cheesy, and it stuck. Cheesy had an eidetic memory, an ability to recall text and images from memory after just a brief look. He could memorize anything in barely a blink. Test scores were nothing for him to master, and you could almost see him reading documents in his mind looking for the answers during the test. Cheesy taught me that academic final tests were always predictable. They have limited source material and they are going to focus on the big money items. Forget about the low-lying fruit. That's for interim tests. His graduation goal was to go, in disguise, to his father's casino and break the bank by counting cards. The counting skill was easily mastered, but the deception tended to be somewhat more difficult as his father was always paranoid. That was why security was his forte. Cheesy had a darker look about him with shoulder-length raven hair and a swarthy complexion. In fact, that was the look of his entire family, including his sisters. He was just spending time at school collecting awards and diplomas while trying to decide what he wanted to do to keep his life exciting. He assumed he would eventually inherit the family casino because he was the oldest, but his father continued to add to the flock every year or two, diluting the future fortunes. Out of all of us, Cheesy was definitely the thrill-seeker. It was his role to manage our off-campus procurement crew that consisted of a number of local fools and idiots who could procure a wee dram for us or some cobby wobblers or dasky narcos, albeit at grossly inflated prices. Cheesy would then send out the call with a coded message for a group of us to meet in one of our favored remote locations in the woods to consume our ill-gotten booty. We never knew who was going to show up or the route we had to take, but it would always be a challenge to get there in time and past school security. The school had decent security to protect the important children in residence from various incidents, many of which were self-inflicted, but some through terrorism at home. Mr. Halpern ran the school's security, and although not extremely diligent, he was beyond reproach. He worshipped Miss Davis Smythe, the headmistress, so bribing him was out of the question, however tricking him was not. Cheesy loved to trick Mr. Halpern when he was ignoring his job trying to ingratiate himself to a board member or Miss Davis Smythe. The more awkward the result, the better. The security forces of the special students were a slightly different story. As long as you were not involving their charges, they'd turn a blind eye or could be persuaded to turn a blind eye. Roly-poly Prince Albert had a staff of 3 security agents assigned to him. I told Cheesy it was just to guard his chocolate. With this taken into consideration, Cheesy would guide us through the security screen of everyone involved in this particular outing. He made a lot of points with the other residents by occasionally including one of the wealthy heirs or royal offspring who could do him a favor at a later date. They never escaped their security, and the journey could be their first semi-independent move in their entire young lives. For this they were usually grateful to Cheesy, especially if it was a success. There was only one American at the school, Richard Kennedy Wadden III. Of course, we called him Dickwad when we weren't happy with him, but generally just Dick. He was the tallest person in the school, including the staff, and was extremely fit. Every day he would spend as much time on physical fitness as he would on schoolwork, and this gave him an almost chiseled look. Dick loved to embarrass the gym teacher, Mr. Colburn, who was grossly overweight. He would ask Mr. Colburn's advice about nutrition, exercise, or sports in front of the class. My favorite queries were the sports advice questions because Mr. Colburn would allude to the fact that he was really fit and a great athlete back in the day. Pictures, trophies, or awards seemed to have eluded him or been lost in transit when he changed schools, unfortunately. Dick would say, "I tell ya what, that's a shame, Mr. Colburn, I would have really loved to see that. Maybe you could show us how it was done." He was the oldest son of a prominent U.S. political force. His father, the Honorable Dickwad Jr., was the governor of Oregon with aspirations for the White House. Dick's grandfather, the Honorable Dickwad Sr., had been the military chief of staff under an earlier U.S. president from Texas. The big money in the Wadden vaults came from pipelines and Texas oil. That would prove to be important to us all in the future. I never heard Dick talk about religion, and I don't think it played any role in his day, which was split between exercise and study. His body was his temple, and his grandfather was his god. Dick's options were clear. The day he was old enough to go to West Point, he would be on a plane to the States. In the meantime, he was going to treat us like his squad. Any sporting event or fitness challenge we had, he was the team captain. His strategy was always the same: pound them into the ground. I had a lot of other acquaintances at school and most other students knew me, but this was my core group and the people I would come to rely on in the future. The school took us on lots of excursions to the local sites. Edinburgh Old Town was full of steep streets and historic monuments everywhere like Street Giles's Cathedral, Holyrood House Palace, and Edinburgh Castle at the top of the hill. We would have liked to visit the pubs, but unfortunately, they were never on the excursion list. One of Cheesy's favourite places to visit was Arthur's Seat because you could see all of Edinburgh from atop it, and he said it made him feel like he was the king of all he could survey. At Ridgeway there was a young noble we called Viscount Fauntleroy, who was the squeakiest whiner in the world as well as a pompous little turd. He was always frustrated and complained about everything, so his psychiatrist decided that primal screaming would be a good therapy for the young Viscount. Every day he had to scream 7 times, so he would be escorted to the roof above the dining hall by his manservant to give his best screams. One morning Cheesy went up on the roof before his first scream and hid a microphone, then lowered the cable down to me in the dining hall, and I connected it to an amplifier hidden inside one of the large cabinets. People were moving about the building, but many were still just getting up when the little Viscount climbed the stairs to the roof and took up his normal position. He inhaled a great breath that forced out his chest like he was getting a new medal. Then he released his scream with such guttural force that his little body shook with a convulsion, causing him to expel a great deal of gas from his butt. The only thing louder than his whining was the laughter that could be heard throughout the school. Not everything in life is fair. Some born of wealth and opportunity squander those opportunities, while others born into poverty achieve Herculean triumphs. The gravity pendulum is a weight on the end of a cord suspended from a pivot. Without friction, it's at an equilibrium that conveys to most an image of rest, peace, and tranquility. It represents fairness to both sides of any opinion, right down the middle. However, when stimulated with friction, the pendulum will move away from its restful place and be set in motion. Pendulums move from side to side but are always seeking equilibrium to bring them back to rest and peace once again. Sometimes an opposing friction comes from another source that would prefer to keep the pendulum at rest. Between the two opposing forces they create a balance both can live with. I endeavor to train myself to look at life from both sides and be objective, but when the pendulums of human well-being start swinging, who's going to help them reach equilibrium again by providing that equal resistance? Who or what will be that force that helps regain equilibrium? With one more year at Ridgeway before university, I knew I had to find the passion that would navigate me through my life. I needed an epiphany. Chapter 2. Spring of a memorable graduation year. I spent last summer with Cheesy after a brief visit with my father. It was supposed to be a 7-day week with dear old Dad, but it turned into a 4-day week, and I still felt like I got there a day early and stayed a day too long. My father was anxious to leave for Macau with the Duchess. At least he called her the Duchess. I don't know if she was really anything more than someone with more money than taste and a bigger yacht than him. She wasn't a terribly bad person, just spoiled by her money, making her seem self-centered. It had been a typical dad vacation, but I was making the best of it. After all, the accommodations were primo, and Dad was busy working on an opportunity to improve his lot in life with the Duchess. The Duchess obviously had wealth based on her behavior and demeanor and was a lady who was used to getting what she wanted. At that moment in time, she wanted to go to Macau and Dad was ready to lift anchor. That gave me the opportunity to visit with Cheesy for the rest of the summer. I hopped on a plane to Marseille to meet up with him. He gave me a phone number to call when I got to the airport and he sent a car to pick me up. The tiny car zipped through back alleys barely wide enough to squeeze though at any speed. The car finally came to rest in a courtyard where Cheesy was waiting with the bikes he had purchased for us. The plan was to drive the French Riviera, stopping at beaches, hotels, and casinos along the way. The French Riviera was the part of the world Cheesy knew best and called home. He'd grown up on this strip of highway and most of the casino management along this strip knew Cheesy and more importantly his family. That limited any gambling we planned to do, but gambling wasn't really a lot of fun with Cheesy because it wasn't really gambling. Our focus changed to beaches, bars, and hotels. There was no better tour guide than Cheesy for this strip of highway. The motorcycles were Yamaha by make and I believe the model was YZF-R1 or something like that. They were streamlined and awesome looking, which was just as important to me as performance. I don't think Cheesy would agree with that assessment, but they did have tons of power and acceleration just the way he liked his bikes. We sped along the twisting and curving coast road, snaking through the tiled roof houses and estates that never quite reached the sea. The Mediterranean always seemed to be by our side or looking over our shoulder. The scene reminded me of a Tintin adventure where he would be traveling like mad along the Mediterranean shores, chasing or being chased by bandits after some contraband. I had one of those iconic Tintin motorcycle t-shirts when I was young, and I wore it all one summer. Of course, the part of Snowy would have to be played by Cheesy. Cheesy dictated our speed and course. I didn't have to pass him on the motorcycles, but I did have to keep up with him, which was no easy feat. He discounted the Tintin scenario and said he felt more like Che Guevara on his travels through Argentina. All he needed to complete the scenario was to find a cause. The more he thought about finding a cause, the faster he went. As I struggled to keep up, I wondered whether his cause would fit the epiphany I was still looking for, or would we end up as Don Quixote and Sancho Panza chasing windmills. The trip that Cheesy planned for us was a stretch of the Côte d'Azur on the French Riviera that included many of his favorite places and people. The first stop was in a small town named San Remo, because there was a casino there that had a circus act which was their main attraction. He told me it was actually the circus that owned the casino and that this was the best circus. I asked, the best on the Riviera? And he replied, if you have to add where, then it's not the best. It turned out that the star attractions of the best circus were two of Cheesy's childhood friends, twins going by the moniker of the One-Eyed Jacks. We found the casino, parked the bikes, and headed for the front door. The attendant at the door gave Cheesy a nod and opened the door to the lobby for us. The lobby was incredibly opulent with large Greek columns and statues of semi-naked gods at play everywhere. Lights flashed from the ceiling to the floor as we passed and the noise in the background grew louder as we proceeded down the hall. We weren't exactly dressed for the casino, but we were heading for the circus entrance. A large poster revolved around a column in the center of an equally large room. It was three-sided and advertised their star attraction, the One-Eyed Jacks. The next frame showed the Jack of Hearts all dressed in red with fiery images flaming around him. The final frame showed the Jack of Spades. A solemn figure dressed in black and blue with white images of water and blue images of ice chilling everything around it. Again, a nod to the attendant seemed to get us through the doors to the circus arena. People were cheering and children were squealing with joy while clowns and dogs performed. The attendant walked us down to a box in front and we took our seats in a 4-person box while the stands were packed to the rafters. Refreshments were even laid out, which made me wonder what was going on. We no sooner sat down than the lights dimmed, and the stage went to darkness. A spotlight hit a podium in the middle of the ring. 2 objects were on top of the podium. One was red, one was blue. The next spotlight was red and revealed the Jack of Hearts. The crowd went hysterical with more screaming and squealing than I had ever heard in person. It was an amazing costume of red and gold with a cape and superhero boots. He milked the applause for a few moments by striking a few poses and then began to stroll towards the podium. With a flourish he snatched up the red object from the table and with a flick of his wrist it snapped in the air. There was an ear-shattering crack as the whip he was holding snapped to the air about 25 feet from where he was standing, but exactly where he was pointing with his other finger. I thought I saw a flash of fire as it cracked, but I couldn't be sure because it all happened so fast, and I wasn't expecting it. The Jack of Hearts then returned to the red spot on the stage. The blue spotlight appeared on the opposite side of the stage and the Jack of Spades was revealed. An equal number of screams and squeals rose from the audience. He waved to his fans and strutted towards the podium. Grabbing the blue whip, he waved his arm back in a smooth motion and snapped his wrist. The whip unfurled and snapped almost over our heads. Cheesy didn't flinch, but I almost shit myself. It sounded like a rushing wave as it approached us, and I was sure I felt a drop of water land on my face as I looked up. The Jack of Spades strode back to his spotlight to cheers and applause. The spotlight on the podium grew more intense as the podium began to rise out of the floor. When it reached about 5 meters it stopped. The Jacks grew ready by snapping their whips. I had no idea what was going to happen, but the audience seemed to know what was coming and their excitement was palpable. The Jack of Hearts whip began to glow red like it was starting to burn and the Jack of Spades whip began to turn shades of blue and seemed to flow from the handle to the tip. Suddenly objects began to spew out of the top of the podium like a volcano. A red object and a blue object about the size of basketballs appeared in the air above the podium as the audience looked up. They were strikingly brilliant against the absolute blackness of the ceiling background. Almost iridescent. The red Jack snapped his whip and picked a red object out of the air, smashing it into millions of tiny pieces of ash that dissipated as they fell to the crowd. The crowd responded appropriately. Then the blue Jack created a waving motion with his hand and snapped his wrist at its full extension. The blue object was smashed, bursting into what appeared to be tiny droplets of water. The crowd responded appropriately. A scoreboard at the bottom of the podium kept score as the balls began to come out faster and faster and got smaller and smaller until they were no bigger than ping-pong balls. The whips rang out, first fire, then water, then fire again. The scores began to mount up 10, 20, 40, 60, 90 and then 100. The whole thing was over in about 4.5 minutes of sheer frenzy by the crowd. My eyes were hurting from the spectacle of the light show created and my neck was stiff from looking up. I think I was sweating from the excitement as well. Of course, the score was 100 to 100. A convenient tie, and who in the audience could debate it or even really cared? It was a spectacle like I had never seen before. The Jacks left the stage as they had entered, to the crowd cheering and clapping. The lights went up and out came the clowns who began tumbling and falling. Cheesy gave me the elbow and pointed to an exit. The exit led to the backstage area. A large fellow looked over at us as we went through and then smiled at Cheesy. Again, I was confused as to why people were being so accommodating to us, but I followed Cheesy through a passage of crazy circus acts, animals and props waiting their cues. At the end of the hall, we reached a closed door. He told me he wanted me to meet some twins who were childhood friends of his, so I immediately thought back to my Tintin scenario and thought, oh no. The Thompson twins. ... Cheesy knocked on the door. It opened a crack and a vertical slice of a face appeared. Gordon. Came the cheer from behind the door as it swung wide open to reveal a dressing room full of chaos behind it. I could hear the call, Gordon, reverberate around the room. People were running and pushing with costume pieces or makeup brushes while others were checking technical details and equipment pieces. The 2 Jacks were seated in huge barber-style chairs in front of large mirrors and lights everywhere. Both were being pecked at by a gaggle of attendants, each competing for a moment's attention to the detail they were trying to button down. Marius waved an arm in Cheesy's general direction and said something in a language I didn't recognize, but Cheesy certainly did because a big smile came over his face and Marion laughed. Cheesy introduced me as his go-to friend when the Jacks weren't around. Both laughed. Again, the conversation turned to a foreign language, and I just tried to take in as much as I could of what was going on around me. We stayed only a few moments more before Cheesy said we had to go back to our seats for the big finish. I nodded at everyone in the room that I had made eye contact with and turned to leave through the door. Again, a cheer went up for Cheesy as we left. Traveling back through the corridor, Cheesy informed me we were going to go to a party with the Jacks after the performance tonight. We sat down in our box and waited for the final act as the clowns and dogs began to thin out. When the final clown was chased out by the final dog, the lights in the arena went dark. It was so dark you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. About 20 feet up either side of the arena, two spotlights shone on platforms, one red and one blue, of course. The audience turned their attention upwards and then back down again as the Jacks entered the arena from opposite sides, but at the same time for this act. Their costumes included headgear and they held whips in each of their hands. The Jack of Hearts snapped one whip then the other. They hissed and snapped into their full glory, glowing with a red fire. They extinguished as they retracted back into the grips he held in his hands. The Jack of Spades repeated the performance exactly and snapped his blue whips into action. The ceiling was a viewing screen where images could be projected from behind to dazzle the audience that looked up directly into it. Currently it was a lightning storm with amazing streaks of lightning of different colors. The Jack of Spades snapped his whips and seemed to run up the walls in a circular manner, turning almost horizontal with his feet against the wall as he moved. His whip seemed to propel him forward each time he snapped them in sequence, and he was moving higher each time. The centrifugal force seemed to be keeping his feet grounded on the walls as he ran. The Jack of Spades seemed to get faster and faster as he passed by, and the lightning cracked blue and white behind him. We kept looking up as he flew past until he reached his platform and took one knee and bent his head. The audience went totally wild. There were about 1,000 people in attendance, but there was capacity. The lightning started to flash red, and the Jack of Hearts jumped into action. It was his turn to reach his platform and he was not to be outdone by his brother. The crowd cheered as the music and visuals began to wind him up to a frenzy. Now the audience knew what to expect, like me. I knew my neck would hurt the next day, but I still had to keep looking up. And we kept looking up as the Jack of Hearts flew past, the red and white lightning flashed, and I thought I was getting a migraine. Finally, he reached his platform and took one knee and then bent his head to strike the same pose as his brother. The audience went wild again. Two boxes appeared on the ceiling, one in red and one in blue. They both indicated 25. I was never sure what that number meant, but to the audience it indicated how fast they were going when they reached their platforms. The two Jacks jumped off the platforms at the same time and began moving around the top in what seemed like a chase, but who was chasing whom? As they flew past above us, we saw the Jack of Hearts followed by the Jack of Spades. The pace picked up on each lap as they flew past, snapping their whips to propel themselves around the arena. The indicators began to climb from 25 to 30 to 35. The crowd's volume and excitement climbed as the numbers climbed, and I found myself totally caught up and cheering him on to go faster and faster. When the red indicator hit 50, there was a bright flash of red fire and sparks which exploded down to just above the audience's upturned faces as they watched with amazement. Immediately after, the blue indicator hit 50 and an explosion of water produced a massive downpour of rain that evaporated just inches above the crowd's gaping faces, looking up with mouths open like baby birds waiting to be fed. There was immediate silence. The music stopped, the lights came up, and the Jacks were nowhere to be seen. They had simply disappeared. The audience let out an audible gasp and then a cheer rose up that nearly shattered my eardrums. Thankfully I was sitting down because I would have collapsed for sure. Cheesy looked at me and said, "Are they the best circus?" And I responded, "Anywhere." I learned later the switches in the handles of the whips allowed the Jacks to control the various effects they needed to complete the act. The light show and fire effects were controlled with a squeeze of the handle, and an electromagnetic clamp in the tip of the whip was used to snap on and off their marks around the top of the tent. The marks were made from rare earth elements and had some remarkable magnetic properties I would learn about later. The masks contained optics that allowed the Jacks to see the marks, and so much more than the crowd was aware of. It even blocked out the lightning projection from the screen, so they had an unobstructed view of everything in infrared. I knew the entire ceiling was used as a rear projection screen, creating images designed to distract the viewer and add to the ambience, but I didn't know then that it had an escape hatch and could rotate without the audience's knowledge. Both Jacks went through the same escape hatch, and that was why there was a small delay between the two explosions. Even though Cheesy explained how many of the movements were achieved, I could not help feeling that the Jacks were defying the laws of physics, or at least had some magic on their side. Cheesy and I were still dressed in our gear from cycling, so we needed to acquire better clothes and get cleaned up if we were going to party with the one-eyed Jacks. The boys arranged a room for us, and Cheesy and I went down to the clothing store in the lobby and got kitted out for Y-party. Since the boys were so well known in the region, they decided to have a party in the room, and the room next door as well. The doors between the rooms were open, creating a huge space with everything that was needed for a massive party, including a stage with instruments set up. It wasn't long before carts began to arrive with enough food and drink for a Roman orgy. Seeing the guests as they arrived, it was obvious from their dress and jewelry these were the Riviera Jet Set crowd. The many men looked like versions of Errol Flynn from his swashbuckling movies, while the younger ones favored Pierce Brosnan. The women hanging off their arms could all have been Bond girls. The Sell-Traded family owned the casino and the circus. Casino management was not the strength of the family, so they hired Cheesy's father, Count Laszlo, to manage the casino for them. Security and surveillance were as important to the Sell-Tradeds as they were to the Count, but for different reasons. Cheesy grew up with Marius and Marion Sell-Traded, who were close to the same age as him, perhaps slightly older. Trying to keep up with their athletic skills was always a huge challenge, but the Riviera had lots of opportunities for young men to display all types of skills. Their penchant for getting into near-catastrophic situations was only excelled by the desire to go again. Everyone seemed to have a story that involved one or more of the three of them in certain peril, only to miraculously escape unscathed. Marius Sell-Traded was known as the Jack of Hearts and Marion Sell-Traded was known as the Jack of Spades. I couldn't figure out whether they chose those handles because they fit their personas or if they just gave the illusion of having those personae to fit the roles. To say it was simply red versus blue or good versus evil or even two sides of the same coin would be too obvious to be real, but it sold the act. Marius was outwardly a friendly, gregarious person who always dressed in red. He had a lighter complexion than his brother and brown hair. Marion was more of an imp or scamp, and the fact that he dressed in black certainly added to that. His hair was brown, but he dyed it black to fit the role. He was charming with a glimmer of intrigue in his eye. The fanbase he attracted was also a little darker than Marius or their one-eyed Jack fans in general. Cheesy seemed to favor Marion as more of a soulmate than Marius, but that's not to say he would have traded the friendship of one for the other. People came and went at the party, but at one point or another it included circus people. Local television performers, entertainers, casino big-wigs, soccer players, and even some royalty from a half-dozen different municipalities I had never heard of and spouting titles I could only imagine were important to someone. Others at the party included friends of the Sell-Tradeds from their home countries somewhere on the borders with Romania, Transylvania, and Serbia. I didn't appreciate the impact and long tradition of the circus in European and Iron Curtain countries before I met this crowd of people. As the crowd thinned out, I found myself sitting with Cheesy and the Sell-Tradeds along with some of their friends and relatives from their home in Moldavia. For my sake, and a couple others, everyone was speaking English. I was entranced by the story that was unfolding about the history of the circus and the Sell-Traded family as well. The Sell-Traded circus had been plying its trade for more than 800 years across Asia and parts of Europe. Marius claimed the family built a reputation for animal training and performing on the wire. Their father Tavarius and his brother Ivan were the stars of the last generation in the post-war era when the Iron Curtain still existed, and the world was divided between red and blue. The circus traveled by train to all the capitals of the Soviet world and occasionally to European cities like Berlin and even Paris on the blue side of the wall. They had trains that carried their performers, stage gear, animals, and anything else they needed to live 365 days a year on the road. Only rarely did they return to their home in Moldavia for a visit or perhaps an illness. The crowd had thinned out greatly, leaving the four of us at one table and a small group talking quietly around another table across the room. I asked Marius how did the circus get to be so big in the Soviet world. Marius replied, the circus had its origins somewhere in the 14th century when our ancestor Cesare Sell-Traded brought the Sell-Traded clan together. Apparently, he was famous friends with Dragosh, the first voivode of Moldavia, who reigned in the middle of the 14th century. The family began the circus and performed in all the major cities in Moldavia. He went on to say, the early circus trained animals and performed as acrobats, establishing themselves as first-class entertainers. Marion added, it was decades later that an invader named Bogdan expelled Dragosh's grandson who was in charge at the time. You might think that was unfortunate for the Sell-Tradeds, but it seems the family made a new friend that day. Marius said Alan Sell-Traded created the first permanent circus in Moldavia, and during that time of boom he cemented the family fortunes for centuries to come. The family grew in size, and from that circus they began traveling to the outlying countries during times of peace and prosperity. They established powerful connections that would serve them well during times of fragile peace. I asked Marion, "How do you know so much detail about your family?" "Because I knew nothing of mine and didn't really care that I didn't." Marion signaled to one of the people at the other table who rose and came over. He was greeted as Uncle Sandu, even by Cheesy. Sandu Sel-Tradit was the family historian and told me, "The family history is well documented and maintained in our library at home in Moldavia," and adding that, "Our history goes back to the time of Ivan the Great, who became the first ruler of Moscow to adopt the title of Tsar." Marius told me that as a child he loved to hear stories from the family books. He recounted a particular story that his father would tell him. It was about one of Ivan's sons who was almost killed by assassins but rescued by circus people. The circus provided the perfect cover for him to evade the assassins for almost a year before he and the Sel-Tradits eliminated the assassins and returned him home safely. Uncle Sandu added. Thankfully that was Ivan the Great and not Ivan the Terrible, because he would have probably been the assassin. Uncle Sandu verified that the story is an actual event recorded in the history of the Sel-Tradits, which is in the form of a diary. Ivan the Great tripled his territory over his 40-year reign and built the Sel-Tradit fortunes, including opening new lands for the circus to travel to. Ivan loved to seize lands, even if they were his nephew's or his brother's lands, they were seized. After one special performance of the circus, Ivan was so amazed, he gave Darian Sel-Tradit the land where the family home still stands today. Speaking in another language, Sandu spoke to the Jacks, and I'm sure he was asking how much he should be revealing to me. I think they cleared me because he continued with more stories. The Khan Ahmed of the Golden Horde tried in vain to get tribute from Ivan the Great. They fought major battles without a finish and continued to disagree with each other. Petra Sel-Tradit was able to get Menli I Giri, Khan of the Crimean Khanate, to become Ivan's ally against the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. The complete details of the negotiations are contained in the diary and includes the acquisition of some great grimoires for the Sel-Tradits. Uncle Sandu told us. The Arab world had a staggering array of knowledge acquired over the centuries from Greece and both Upper and Lower Egypt. For book collectors it was a great connection. Of particular interest to Uncle Sandu were some entries made in 1488 where the Sel-Tradits helped Ivan find people who could forge cannons or work gold and silver. Ivan required master builders in an era where those skills were incredibly hard to acquire. Mate Sel-Tradit developed a friendship with Matthias Corvinus, who was a man who could provide many of those things. Uncle Sandu continued, and I asked, who was Corvinus? Uncle Sandu replied, I can tell you Corvinus was not a man to be trifled with because he commanded the Black Army of Hungary. Through a series of marriages, a connection was made. During that time, Corvinus built the Bibliotheca Corviniana, and many documents, grimoires, and books in the Sel-Tradit library date from that period, including the Clavicle of Solomon. These are important books covering smelting practices, alloys, alchemy, and even the occult. The Sel-Tradits never missed an opportunity to acquire grimoires that provided unique knowledge because over the centuries, the first to possess skills were the ones to reap the biggest benefit from those skills. Marian added, the Romanovs were also big fans of the Sel-Tradit circus because it was wholesome family entertainment, and they would bring the circus to St. Petersburg or Moscow for festivals and even have private performances. Command royal performances. There was one particular entry about Ivan V, who ruled with Peter the Great. He went on to say, it seems young Ivan was senile, paralyzed and for all intents and purposes blind. Poor Ivan died before he was 30, Uncle Sandu added. The Sel-Tradit diary entry includes formulas for potions and herb preparations that could have caused each of the symptoms and provided details regarding exactly how he likely ingested them. Needless to say, the reign of Peter the Great was a stabilizing effect on the Sel-Tradit pendulums of health and wealth. Uncle Sandu continued, Peter had them search for documents for the new St. Petersburg library. Working for Peter, Cyprian Sel-Tradit acquired some of the most important grimoires in history on the topics of the occult, including the Malleus Maleficarum. Dacian Sel-Tradit was key in extracting important information that began the training of the growing Sel-Tradit clan. Apparently, every male Sel-Tradit tried to procreate as much as possible to reach a seventh son. Even if they didn't reach 7 sons, they would have built loyal family staff for their circus requirements. That was medieval Europe. Marius asked Uncle Sandu, whose wedding feast had dwarfs jumping out of enormous pies and dancing on the tables. Uncle Sandu said he couldn't remember whose wedding it was, but he remembered it was in St. Petersburg and someone was killed with poison in the drinks. Uncle Sandu added, there were lots of illnesses in the next few generations like kidney disease and blood disorders. Some of the entries even record exchanges with Rasputin, the famous monk, who was looking for a solution to hemophilia B. Cheesy asked, how did they survive Stalin? And Marius told us, it was my grandfather's role in the family. Danut Sel-Tradit was my father's father and Mate Sel-Tradit was Danut's cousin. They were in charge of the family, and it was their job to ride out the revolution and Joseph Stalin. Fortunately, Stalin loved the circus and would attend the Moscow touring show quite regularly over his lifetime. The diary entries during this period are more about moving people, objects and documents through the Iron Curtain, a great trick for a magician, but the audience never applauded. Tverrius, my father, and Ivan, his brother, took over after Stalin's death and during Khrushchev's time in power. They have entries for all the leaders like Brezhnev, Chernenko, and some interesting ones on Boris Yeltsin. When the wall came down, the Seltradid family invested in the Riviera through Gordon's dad, but still have deep roots throughout the Soviet world. The Jacks era of Soviet leaders was now Vladimir Putin, but the Soviet world was a much smaller part of the bigger world. Belarus and the Ukraine may have done well, but many of the other countries' pendulums were pushed past their pivots. Cheesy asked, is Tverrius a seventh son of his father? To which Uncle Sandu replied, Tverrius was a seventh son, but Danut, his father, was not a seventh son. That made me realize what Cheesy was asking, which of the Jacks is the seventh? Quote, I learned that being the seventh son was an important distinction in their culture where 12 or more children were common. Sometimes it took several wives to reach 7 sons, but apparently that didn't pose much of an issue for their forefathers. Gaining a seventh son of a seventh son elevated the family to a position of great power in their culture during those times. It was believed that the power of the seventh son was incredible and could exponentially improve whatever powers they already possessed. Uncle Sandu told us that the exact birth times are a family secret that he could not divulge. It was typical for a Seltradid son to train for the circus and specialize in a specific elemental power. If they were good enough, they may be allowed to progress through the library of magic tombs, owned by the Seltradids, to learn the powerful knowledge they contained. Seltradid daughters also trained in the mystical skills of divination, spells, and potions. According to Cheesy, the Seltradid circus acquired many old magic grimoires which they kept in their library in Moldavia. As a child, he'd been to Moldavia on several occasions, and the libraries were massive, with many of the books being purchased in Prague during the 1500s and 1600s. Marius told Cheesy their family possessed several of the most important books on elemental magic ever found. The Seltradid library was a private library without equal. Marian and Marius had trained since they were young to be proficient in all the basic elemental skills. They were able to gain this knowledge from books in their library. Family connections provided training as well. The boys came to learn many of the spells, incantations, and gestures that they used in their acts to misdirect and distract their audience as well as hit all their marks. Obviously, Marius excelled in the elemental power of fire and Marian showed promise with water and lightning. They were both encouraged to progress as far as the library and family knowledge could take them. Their father, Tverrius, tutored them just as his brother Ivan tutored his children. Magic was important for both women and men in the Seltradid family, who used it in so many activities on a daily basis. Some of the books had a more mystical aura to them and were usually advanced in skills for their day. These types of books could be traced back to people we know from history, such as the alchemist Edward Kelly, John Dee, or Roger Bacon, among others. Emperor Rudolph II purchased books from the very same vendors for his collection, which was known throughout the world. People believed in alchemy then just as they believe in chemistry today. You could find a physician, surgeon, midwife, monk, or priest who could supply you with herbs, potions, or charms to drive out sickness or demons. Uncle Sandu told us, the Aberdeen bestiary from around 1200 AD contains creatures that very few people in Europe had ever seen, and the Malleus Maleficarum published in 1487 was the handbook for witches known as the Hammer of the Witches. Emperors and kings believed the power to change the world could be contained within grimoires, books, manuscripts, diaries, or in fact any documents. Did one of these documents contain the plans for Archimedes' laser beam, Krishna's flying machine from the Mahabharata, or even the anti-gravity device used to build the pyramids? Many of the books from this era were written in code and required the proper cipher pages to accompany the book, or it was useless. In fact, some of the books Emperor Rudolph II purchased were reputed to be forgeries or fakes. In truth, it was probably not that difficult to pass a forgery off on Rudy Jr., who simply collected books to build the biggest library in the world and not to collect the knowledge contained within them. The Seltradids collected knowledge, and that made all the difference in the world. All of the documents in their library were authentic and their vendors remained healthy. Marius told us each book had spells that could be recited and spoken, but a spell would not work unless the caster had the appropriate level of skill within them. In most cases, these skills had to be learned through the knowledge contained in basic tombs as well as the secrets their family disclosed to them. When they were children, Marius and Marian were required to do exercises to expand their minds, exercise their vocal transmissions, and reach physical awareness before being able to effectively use even basic skills and spells. Before the Jacks were called away to say their goodbyes, Cheesy recalled a story from his trip to Moldavia. He was sitting in the library one night reading a book and Maria's sister Darla and her cat were just leaving. Cheesy said, "She winked at me." Marius asked, "Darla or the cat?" Cheesy went on to say he didn't think much of it because he knew Darla liked him, so he just kept on reading his book. A couple of minutes later, the cat came back into the library and jumped up on the table in front of him. He said, "I looked the cat in the eye, it winked at me and then its eye popped out." Marius said, he jumped up and screamed. Cheesy added that when he turned to look at the cat as he was walking away, the cat had just left a poop on the desk. Marius and Marian were doubled over with laughter and said Cheesy screamed like a little girl. Darla was just as mischievous as Cheesy and was developing enchanting powers as well as looks. That night left me intrigued with the idea of a world still hidden to most. It had a spiritual feel with a connection to the body and mind. We finished off the trip uneventfully by spending lots of time on the beach before returning to school for the final year that we would all spend together. I had hoped to meet Cheesy's family, but for some reason we didn't get around to that. It was imperative that we had enough memorable events in our last year to hold us through our transitions to new alien environments. Ian, Cheesy, Dick and I had to plan an event each that would leave our mark on the school. It had to occur in the final week and everyone in the school had to be aware of it as it was happening. A global event, as Cheesy defined it. Ian had the advantage of soliciting his brother Richard, who brought with him his minions of righteousness, a group of unsavory individuals that were loyal to Richard only because he had something on each one of them. The school honored their students and their heritage by displaying the country flag of every student currently in attendance as well as many other important flags to honor alumni. The idea involved replacing all the flags in the school with another flag. No matter how hard he tried, Ian could not do something mean or cruel. His idea was a flag that would make people laugh and he had to fend off all of Lord Rat Bastard's ideas and make him promise to stick to the plan. After months of consideration, he finally made his decision and placed his order online. Each day or two a package would arrive for him, or Richard, and they had to hide their growing inventory. This was a big order with more than 30 very large flags to replace. Ian didn't care about the cost but wanted to make sure none of the original flags were damaged and could be fully restored. I remember waking that morning and hearing a huge commotion going on in the hall. Opening my door just a crack, I could see people running down the hall towards the grand hall and giving a shout out to their friends as they went. I threw on my housecoat and joined the lemmings. When I entered the grand hall and looked up around the ceiling, my mouth dropped, and I started clapping. I knew right off that this was Ian's prank because every flag had an image I recognized as coming from an album cover that Ian also had a shirt of and listened to constantly. It was a reggae album cover that pictured the world cut in half at the equator and the northern hemisphere was a giant pig consuming the southern hemisphere. A statement. They found the real flags under the trampolines in the gym and had them replaced by the end of the day. The next to put their plan into action was Cheesy. To execute his plan, he was able to recruit from the rich privileged kids he had included on all those excursions we had taken over the last 4 years. They themselves were not a lot of help, but their security staff proved invaluable. Of particular interest was little Prince Albert, who had accumulated a rather sizable debt with Cheesy. Prince Albert was a little roly-poly chap about 4 feet tall and had 4 full-time security people assigned to him now. They proved invaluable redirecting people around corridors and herding them through to the reception going on in the main auditorium. The school had a great deal of artwork distributed throughout the common area. Many of the paintings were of alumni while others were images of benefactors and prior headmasters and headmistresses. Cheesy's plan was to replace all the pictures with his own pictures. Cardboard inserts were ordered that could be pressed into the frame in seconds, and he had planned a route that would avoid all student and parent traffic thanks to Prince Albert's people. I myself was having a chat with other students at the reception when I began to hear a rumble in the hall. Some of the students began running back into the reception and pulling their friends out. The noise got louder, and I realized it was hysterical laughing. The first thing I saw when I left the reception area was the large picture in the reception hallway. Normally it was a painting of our current headmistress Miss Davis Smythe, but instead it was a very busty image of Wonder Woman in an action pose. She did, of course, bear a strong resemblance to our headmistress. Cheesy used this opportunity to mock a few of the staff that had rubbed him the wrong way over the past year. Mr. Halpern, assistant headmaster, was the Joker, and the gym teacher Mr. Colburn, who had more chins than a Chinese phone book, was the Hulk. Both were easily recognizable as the teachers they spawned from. Chef Pierre was Pepe Le Pew, sitting on a toilet smoking a cigarette. That one was snapped up and copied to make shirts from. I had one myself. For his prank, Dick called upon a friend from Los Angeles, who worked in the costume design department of a film studio. Dick had her design an anatomically correct rubber bodysuit of a man and another of a woman that he could strap over top of the statues that lined each side of the gardens. He ordered enough to cover all 12 of the life-sized statues. The gardens could be seen from all important venues such as the dining hall and the upstairs library. Many of the dormitories had a view of the area, albeit an obscured view by stadium standards. Dick decided to execute it in the dark so no one would notice. However, to do it in the morning would leave him vulnerable to being discovered. In such a covert operation as this, Dick decided to take out the lights and do a stealth attack at night with night vision equipment. When the lights were turned back on, there would be lots of people around. The rubber suits could be slapped on the statues in seconds, and he knew each was a perfect fit. They had straps backed by Velcro, and on the actual attack each would have a tube of superglue squirted on it to hinder the removal efforts and extend the length of the prank. With 12 statues in the garden, 6 on each side, he would need 6 accomplices to cover 2 statues each in the time the lights were out. He decided to handle the lights himself so that he could get back into the crowd and observe the results while creating an alibi. It was about 9:45 in the evening and the sun had disappeared behind the skyline. I was in the library returning books I found in my room that belonged to the school. It was a rush to get there before it closed for the last time, at least for me. Suddenly the lights went out and what started as panic turned to whining and complaining. I was near a chair at the window, so I just sat down and glanced out the window while letting the complainers drift away. I thought I saw something in the moonlight, but dismissed it as a dog or some other small creature. When the lights came back on about 3 or 4 minutes later, I glanced out the window to see if the dog was still around. As I scanned the garden, I couldn't see anything out of the ordinary, but had the distinct feeling that something wasn't right. Then it hit me, and I saw it. One of the statues looked abnormally fat, but when I looked closer, they were huge boobs. The statues were brilliant because the bodysuits were almost identical in color to the stone in the statues. Very few people had caught on yet, but I could see some activity in the garden. People were looking at them in obvious disgust and disapproval while others were dragging their friends down to run the gauntlet. If these were supposed to be gods, then it was evident that the gods were well endowed. I saw one young fellow running about with a stick. As he smacked the giant willies, they swung back and forth, sending him and his friends into fits of convulsive laughter. At half a meter long and thicker than the business end of a baseball bat, according to Dick, they tended to wobble back and forth many times. Finally, the bell went off and an announcement came directing all students to return to their rooms and draw their blinds. This was met with hysterical laughter, and it took almost an hour for security to herd everyone back to their rooms. By this time the bodysuits had been cut off the statues anyway, so it made no sense, but their rage demanded it. I saved my prank for last for several reasons. Firstly, the others would be wondering whether or not I could pull something off, especially in league with their amazing pranks. Secondly, I thought I could top them all and go out on a high note. As the time drew near, the pace of everything was heating up. Graduation was just a day away. Unfortunately for Miss Davis-Smythe, she became my target. She was not my target because I disliked her or had any revenge motives, but just because she provided me with the most spectacle for my buck. Miss Davis-Smythe was the headmistress of our school. She was chosen for her post not for her academic credentials but rather her family connections. Again, this did not make her my target but offered me the opportunity to use her as my foil. Miss Davis-Smythe was methodical in her preparation of speeches for big events, and there was no bigger event on the horizon than the graduation dinner. Several other factors made her the perfect foil. English was her second language, and she could not see a thing without her glasses. She always prepared her speech with very specific wording to make herself sound as intelligent as possible and therefore got into the habit of reading it verbatim while standing at the podium. Once her eyes looked down at the paper she would begin reading and not look up again until she uttered the final word. I was sure she was not even listening to herself, but just in a trance-like state. The hunt for her digital copy began. I could not solicit the help of any of the others because that would give my plan away. After digging through the school's network, I finally found her digital copy of the planned address. The goal was to let her get started and, in her trance, before I started introducing my changes. Figuring Miss Davis-Smythe would read her speech before printing, I had to replace the hard copy after printing but before dinner. This gave me a perfect window because during that time I was scheduled to be in her office as a student liaison. The switch went off without a hitch. The hall was decorated, the tables were set, and the guests had filed in for the elegant meal that was about to be consumed. Only the graduating class and whichever of their relatives decided to attend were invited to this event. The staff was displayed at the head table like the Last Supper. Miss Davis-Smythe was cast in the role of Jesus while Mr. Halpern, who was never far from Miss Davis-Smythe, sat at her right hand. The meal was consumed, and the guests were beginning to become agitated by the trivial conversation they had been subjected to over the last hour when Mr. Halpern approached the podium and tapped the microphone. After welcoming everyone, except the cooks and dishwashers, and licking as many boots as he could in the time he had, he began his introduction of the headmistress. It was a work of literary genius equaling the likes of Rudyard Kipling. I was beginning to suffer pangs of regret for what was about to happen as Mr. Halpern showered Miss Davis Smythe with inflated skills and achievements, lifting them to a stratospheric level few Nobel laureates ever reach. The crash was going to create a sonic boom. Miss Davis Smythe stood at the podium and adjusted her outfit, then wet her lips and pulled up the chain on her glasses as she slipped them onto her nose. Immediately her face changed as she squinted and shook her head slowly from side to side. It seemed that someone had applied a thin coating of Vaseline to her lenses. I can confirm the brand. After struggling with different solutions, she eventually cleaned her lenses, with the assistance of Mr. Halpern. She cleared her throat and opened the folder on the pedestal. Graduating class, honored parents and esteemed staff, welcome to this year's graduation dinner. We are here tonight to review the sad and disappointing year of these undeserving parasites and idiots you call your children. Immediately a huge gasp went out from the audience. The headmistress looked up stunned by the event. Seconds passed before parents jumped out of their seats and started hurling abuse at Miss Davis Smythe, the staff and even some of the students. One parent shouted, "I told you you were a parasite." Quote, "It took Miss Davis Smythe a few seconds to grasp what had just happened, and it made her weak in the knees. I thought she was going down, but Mr. Halpern was up and out of his chair in a flash to run to her aid." Unable to continue, Mr. Halpern passed her off to an assistant that led her back to her chair. He then returned to the podium to take charge and looked over the speech. Scanning the document, he felt that it was just a clerical error, and he could continue on. He successfully navigated through several pages of the script and was feeling confident as he approached the end. You could hear the confidence in his voice increasing as he spoke and gaining force with every achievement made this year. Then the second to last line came out of his mouth, "Let's stand to salute this year's crop of losers and failures." People looked at each other in disbelief before the second wave of hostility took hold. It was turned into a tsunami as it slammed against the stage, and both Mr. Halpern and Miss Davis Smythe had to vacate the area as quickly as possible. I glanced at Ian, Cheesy and Dick, and they all knew exactly what was going on. Cheesy and Dick gave me knowing signs that looked like approval, but Ian was less enthralled with the prank. I think he could see the fallout coming. I was beginning to develop a pit in my stomach about my prank and what could happen, but I knew getting caught was not an option. The board of directors would have to do something about this year's pranks. There had never been such a series of events at this school in their storied history. They were sure to get pressure from their clientele, who would be upset with the exposure to life their protégés experienced this year. It didn't do the alumni any favors either. A friend, still at school, wrote me later that Miss Davis Smythe and Mr. Halpern were given retirement packages by the board of directors of the school. They were married in Zurich and now run a small hotel resort on Lake Geneva. I'm sure they had many important guests in the years that followed. Would they have ended up retired separately if not for these events? Was this a good thing that resulted from a bad beginning? Who knows? I do know it made me feel horrible about myself regardless of the results, and I think at that point I decided to include something from that experience in my epiphany, whatever that would be. Do no harm to others. Not like a doctor does no harm, but something different, like a helpful do no harm while doing some good. Well, it still needed work, but I had the start of an idea. My graduation present to myself was that I managed to get an invite to Ian's estate in Kenya this summer, and the even better news was that Lord Rat Bastard wouldn't be there. Apparently, he was the victim of a practical joke executed by a couple of devious twins from our sister academy near our alma mater. Richard was observed stark naked on the school roof in full view of all in the dining hall as he tried to sneak past the skylight. The chant of "Little Dick" could be felt rocking the hall and reverberating throughout the school. Richard claimed it was a religious ceremony he was researching for a paper that was totally misunderstood. 2 nuns were required to assist him, and he was simply changing into the appropriate robe. Of course, the nuns could never be found, but I heard their habits were hanging in a closet in an academy near our own. When asked to produce the robe, he claimed it had blown off the roof in the wind. Richard spent a week pretending to look for it to no avail. Even his minions helped him look for it with no success. Pulling pranks on the boys in our school was a sporting event with an annual championship at our sister academy. I had heard of the twins who played the part of the nuns before, but they were just in 3rd year. They were known as the Toxic Twins because of their names, something we could identify with. Let me introduce Heidi and Holly Toxic, aka the Toxic Twins. Their parents were in show business in the United States, so who knows what their real names would have been. Their father, a comedian known as the Poison Mouth with the Vile Tongue, highly toxic. He was on all the late-night shows. Their mother was a solo artist of some minor distinction who was always pictured with her nose in the air and a poodle under her arm. The real connection to the money was through the father, who had several other offspring from an assortment of liaisons of various lengths. Heidi and Holly, however, were known to be his special girls, his toxic twins. Lord Ratbastard claimed they were usually called Heidi and the Hoe. Richard had a personal dislike for Holly due to the role she played in his entrapment, but claimed it was due to her known promiscuity. At that point he usually thumped on the table with his fist and screwed up his face in that unclergy way of his. Perhaps he will be working on that face at the monastery where he's spending his summer. It was time for us all to say farewell to each other and embark on our separate journeys. Ian was off to McMaster University in Hamilton, Canada to study medicine. His plan was to accelerate his learning so that he could advance as quickly and as far as possible in the next few years. This was a great location for him because it was a Commonwealth country with a great education system, healthcare, and was relatively safe. The school also had a hospital so he could shave time off his experience commitments. Not far away was Upper Canada College, a prep school frequented by royals and deemed a safe haven. Many of his cousins had attended that school and several currently did. Cheesy had decided to go to MIT at Cambridge in the United States to study computer science. He figured with his logical brain he could develop AI that could counteract any offense and then break down any defense. I thought at the time it was funny that this would be his position, defense before offense. Cheesy seemed more the type that figured his offense was unbeatable, so why bother with a defense? The wild call of Cambridge, USA reached out to him, and he was looking forward to bunking in the dormitory and roughing it a bit. A little American-style culture was called for since he had spent all his life in Europe. Adventure was on the horizon for Cheesy. Dick had just turned 17, so as soon as graduation was over, he was off to enter West Point. He met all the requirements, some of which I thought were slightly archaic for the age. The cadet must be unmarried, not pregnant, and not under obligation to support any children. If avoiding the draft were only that easy. He had above average marks and scored 1200 plus on the SAT, so the academic requirements were not much of a concern. I doubt very much that any other cadet was in as good physical shape as Dick. I myself wanted to explore genomes and the genetics of microorganisms, plants, and animals. It was the structure and function of all cells that not only determined life in the past, but also the present and will again in the future. Discovering how advances in molecular and cellular biology could be applied to things like gene therapy and genetic testing could open up so many possibilities. I thought perhaps I could develop crops to feed the hungry or rid the world of pests to make it safer for all. I heard about CRISPR, which allowed DNA manipulation, but to reach that level was going to be a journey. Although Harvard and MIT were the best schools in the world for molecular biology, I didn't want to live in the United States, so I chose the University of Oxford in the United Kingdom, north of London, and had no problems being accepted. This did, however, require a call to Carl, a fellow who worked for my uncle David and managed my trust money for me. Carl was an honest fellow that I trusted, and he financed whatever it was that I needed financed over the years. In this case, I gave him the details of the university and he agreed to take care of it. He also suggested that I stay in residence for the first year before finding other accommodations. That seemed like an acceptable idea to me since I knew nothing about the day-to-day running of a household, and I wanted to focus on school anyway. It was not the adventure I was looking for, so I left that task to Cheesy. When I look at the pendulums of the world, for the Soviet Union had swung so far in one direction it could never reach equilibrium again. There were not enough people who cared to push back to provide resistance to the crumbling political structure. While some of the citizens managed to get off the pendulum when it was flying high, many were left to finally release their hold as they were flung off the other side where governments failed, became corrupted, or let their country's infrastructure decay. History has shown that communism requires a revolution to gain its initial control and to establish its parameters. The freedom fighters of any glorious revolution are generally just victorious terrorists. Although there were many fathers of the Soviet Revolution like Lenin and Marx, it was unfortunately Stalin who picked up the ball and ran with implementing it. Until all the terrorists' freedom fighters are culled from the system and true believers of socialism are put in charge, there will never be an equilibrium with that version of communism. Those who could influence the pendulum of the Soviet Union didn't see any equilibrium in its future and abandoned it. It's far easier to create a new society where the pendulum can be reset with a strong equilibrium, albeit a subset of the larger. Perhaps it will take the conversion of a highly socialistic society believing they are taking a step toward enlightenment to create the perfect society for all. They may willingly change the democratic socialist structure to become the enlightened society. How long would a society like that have to last for us to call it successful? 1,000 years. Perhaps the new China can undo the atrocities of Mao Zedong, or the new Cuba post-embargo will vindicate their political structures. Those are not pendulums I can impact. Cheesy, Ian, Dick and I agreed to meet every summer for our vacations, then we left Ridgeway for the last time and went to follow our own paths to different destinations around the world. Chapter 3: Spring of the African Mosquito. It was a great summer last year. A summer that everyone who was there will remember forever. When people reach a certain age, they love to recant tales of the epic journey they made after high school. Those who didn't make that trip like to live vicariously through the escapades of others' tales. For us, this was a trip that cemented the bond we had between us for the last 4 years, created some new ones and promised to have lots of tales to regale any progeny that may rear their heads in the future. Months of preparation went into our summer in Kenya, from getting shots and prescriptions to learning to recognize the myriad of things that could take your life away or leave you in a world of hurt. You don't encounter too many death adders or fat-tailed scorpions in Switzerland or Scotland, so I thought it best to familiarize myself with their habits and appearance before my first picnic in hell. Joining me on the expedition were Cheesy and Dick, whom I met up with at Jomo Kenyatta International Airport in Nairobi. We were through customs and just having a drink when Ian showed up. He had arranged for his friend Martin to fly us to a landing strip near Bangale, just 20 kilometers from the estate, and was listening for our flights to arrive. Ian led us to where we could board the small plane that was going to take us on. It's one thing to fly on an international jet, but quite another to experience the turbulent flight you get on a small 6-seater. Whatever discomfort or jitters we felt, it was an amazing flight because we were only a few hundred feet above the terrain, buildings, people, and animals below, and we could see them quite clearly. Martin told us he also had hot air balloons for his business that he used on safaris. When you approach in silence, you get much closer to the animals. He said. Safaris represented big money in this part of the world and a big part of Martin's business. Everyone committed to a balloon flight at least once during that trip. Sir Malcolm was to meet us at Martin's airstrip and take us on to Windhaven, according to Ian. Ian warned everyone that Sir Malcolm was a bit of a character, but that didn't prepare us for what we were about to experience when we landed. As we approached the landing strip, we could see a large entourage of vehicles lined up in front of the tiny building that Martin kept his plane in. We touched down on a dried riverbed and Martin taxied the plane up to the building and shut down the engine. Everyone disembarked from the plane and started unloading the gear. Men came from everywhere to help and they took the bags and scurried around the building to the waiting vehicles. Then I saw him standing with his hands folded on top of his cane as he leaned forward on it. Ian's favorite uncle, Sir Malcolm Havelock, was a figure right out of a Kipling novel. The shaggy white hair cascading down to his mutton chops and ending in a massive moustache projecting out from his face. Sir Malcolm was dressed all in white, wore a pith helmet and carried a walking stick that he liked to brandish about when making a point or directing someone. How much more Kipling-esque could you get? Ian gave us some of Sir Malcolm's history before we arrived. Sir Malcolm wasn't really an uncle by blood, but that was where he fit into Ian's family structure. Born to Lord Andrew and Lady Amanda Havelock in India prior to partition, he spent his young life growing up in northern India during a time of great change. As a young privileged British citizen, he served as an officer in the military and was introduced to Lord Mountbatten, the last Viceroy of India. The Lord was a personal friend of his father Lord Andrew, as well as a co-member of the House of Lords. Ian told us that Sir Malcolm was serving with the Queen's entourage on the day she shot her first tiger. It was accompanied by a rolling of the eyes in disapproval, not doubt. Sir Malcolm stayed on in India as a diplomat after most British left, but spent his time tracking tigers and leopards that frequented the forests near his home in India. Ian told us, Sir Malcolm was ashamed of how Lord Mountbatten had abandoned the Indian people, throwing them into the chaos that followed partition and resulting in the deaths of nearly 3 million. My father told me Lord Andrew would tell Sir Malcolm stories of that time in India that would leave him upset for weeks, but he would never repeat those stories to me. Eventually Sir Malcolm decided he couldn't stay in India any longer, and Ian believed it was for personal reasons rather than political as he claimed. He came to Africa to manage Ian's family estate at Windhaven rather than return to his own estate in England. Sir Malcolm had been to Africa with Ian's father on several occasions and liked Kenya. Ian wouldn't tell us his actual age, but did say many people in his family DNA lived to get their letter from the Queen. I was sure Sir Malcolm hadn't seen 80 in a while, but he was still spry and totally lucid. The hustle and bustle were deafening, and the smells were caustic, so it was good to get out of Martin's building. Sir Malcolm started barking out orders and waving his stick about with no real concern whether someone already occupied that space or not. Locals jumped from everywhere to pick up bags, avoid the stick and clear away to the front door. As we approached the exterior of the building, a huge white Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost convertible sat parked directly in front of the entrance. This was Sir Malcolm's mode of transportation while off the estate. The car was brought from India, where cars of this type were critical icons of the important British diplomats as well as the Indian Raj. The doors were swung open, and Ian and Sir Malcolm took the back seat. Cheesy and I got into the next set of seats in front of them, and Dick had to ride up front with the driver. Sir Malcolm did not drive off the estate, and perhaps an image of his persona was beginning to form before I knew it. As we pulled out from the airport, a half-dozen vehicles began a frenzied flow to follow us. I found out later there were also a couple of cars ahead of us to prevent locals from throwing rocks at Sir Malcolm's car. It turned out that Sir Malcolm employed a man full-time to fix rock dents in his car. Indian personas didn't translate well to African culture, it seemed. Sir Malcolm had always been bigger than life in India and commanded the respect that went with the image. He cared deeply for the Indian people, but Africans of all tribes despised the colonial image. We were heading to the estate they called Windhaven, which was near the Tanner River and named for the monsoon winds that made it bearable this time of year. The weather was very dry and hot, but the speed of the car kept us cool as we rolled down the bumpy dirt road enjoying the scenery. Trying to spot predator-wary animals that had not heard our approach from kilometers away was somewhat difficult. Then I realized they were probably already scared off by the lead cars before we even got within a kilometer. The dust cloud projected behind the cars continued to widen as it hid the sun behind us. Cheesy said, "There are more than 20 national parks and a ton of protected areas that we could explore." Ian interjected, "I've got some great places to take you to, including some unique places on the estate that very few other people have ever seen. The estate is not far from the Tanner River Primate Reserve. We should spend some time there." Ian believed that to know Africa you must know the people, or at least try to understand them. That's not an easy feat when you consider how many tribes there were in Africa. The 7 major tribes in Kenya are just a smattering of the tribes in Africa that have been interlinked for thousands of years. Tribal law and culture may have different perspectives on the creation of life and their personal connection with the land, but some of those perspectives are far too modern and far too economic for the pendulum to find equilibrium. Ian told us, poaching has been significantly reduced in Kenya in the last couple decades, and the elephant population is actually on the rise. But we still must be diligent and prevent opportunities to poach. The amount of money involved is several annual incomes in this part of the world. 40 years ago, the government set aside land to protect the swampy forests of the lower Tanner River to protect 2 endangered primates. The area was on the lower Tanner River, but as it came to pass, according to Kenyan law, the reserve was not registered properly, and it lost all official protection as well as its national reserve status and funding. Perhaps the Tanner River mangabe and the Tanner River red colobus can find a use for the parking lot that paved over their paradise. Finally, we arrived at Windhaven, and the sigh I let out probably set all the wind chimes on the estate swinging. The sight of Windhaven surprised me because in my mind I was expecting the typical English estate that Ian had taken me to in other years when I was lucky enough to get an invitation. Those estates which I hadn't visited, but he told me about in England and Scotland, included a grand manor house with a massive stable and acres of pristine forest. Windhaven was different at first glance, with many single-story bungalows spread out in a circular fashion and all of it surrounded by a small wall. Ian said his father had a house that you couldn't see from here that was quite nice, but it was still only 1 story high. I couldn't wait to have the tour of the whole estate, but only after getting a drink and trying in vain to dust the fine soil from every exposed orifice. As I did, Ian told me, Windhaven is 20 kilometers in one direction and 5 kilometers in the other basically. With over 100 square kilometers and no fences, it offers great grazing for all kinds of large animals. We're located south of the Kora National Park. Make sure your camera is always charged because you're going to see some sights. Quote. The young fellow Jeffrey, who helped Ian and I move our stuff into the bungalow, was obviously proud of Kenya and in particular the Tanner River area that ran from Mount Kenya to the Indian Ocean. The camp had abundant power because, as we were informed by Jeffrey, Kenya's hydro needs were supplied by a series of dams along the Tanner River that supplied the national grid system and was distributed to all Kenyans. The way he said it may have seemed an overkill to me, at the time, but many countries in Africa had their pendulums swinging past their pivots and Kenya was one of the most stable pendulums on the continent at that point in time. Luckily, we missed the hottest months of the year, which occur during the northeast monsoon winds when temperatures reach 35 degrees Celsius. Our arrival coincided with the southeast monsoon winds of May and would last until we left in early August. With all the wind chimes hanging in the trees and dangling off buildings chiming at the same time, as the wind rushed through them, I understood why it was called Windhaven. In our bungalow main room, there was a desk with a bookshelf above it. On the shelf was a book entitled IUCN Red Data Book. Ian informed us, that is an important book listing all of the endangered species and represents a complete barometer of wildlife. As usual, his agenda was not totally tourist, but he made it clear that he knew Dick, Cheesy and I were here to see things we'd never seen before. Before we could get out and have a look around, Jeffrey came to get us to the administration hut where his father was giving a talk on the animals we must watch out for while we are in this area and some of the other areas we may visit. Kim, Jeffrey's father, was waiting for us at the administration hut on our arrival. Cheesy and Dick were already there engaged in a conversation with Kim. Kim told us that wherever we are in Kenya, any of these animals could be present, so we should recognize them and know what to do when encountering one. Although there is a small wall around the compound at Windhaven, and we try to keep the gate closed, there are opportunities for snakes and other animals to get in. He said. The first snake video he showed was the African rock python. He said, this snake is a very aggressive snake. Although it's not venomous, it will still bite you and then wrap its coils around you to constrict you to death. The hug of death, perhaps. He went on to say, if you are bitten by this snake, you should get the site looked at to avoid infection. The mouth of this snake contains a lot of nasty things that can infect your skin, especially in this environment. At Windhaven we have Dr. Sue and Dr. Ben, who are both quite capable of looking after us in the event of a calamity. You'll meet them later and be introduced to the projects they're working on. The next video was a bad boy going by the name of the Black Mamba who was more aggressive than the Hulk and faster than the Flash. Black Mambas are not actually black at all but brown or olive-skinned. If you play the role of dentist and look him in the mouth you will know immediately why he's called a Black Mamba. Kim told us. He went on to say, if you challenge this snake, it may chase you and you will not outrun it if you are not expecting it. The Black Mamba are the longest venomous snake in Africa, reaching as long as 2.5 meters. That's like being chased by a venomous garden hose, Cheesy quipped. The Black Mamba can also stand up like a cobra, although he doesn't fan his neck out. If he bites you high enough on your body, you will have no protection. Generally, people only wear snake boots, Kim said. The green mamba is not as feared as the black mamba, but they can be seen here as well. Jeffrey added. If he bites you, the venom is predominantly neurotoxic. It may become apparent to you within 10 minutes as it attacks your nervous system. To which Dick asked, have they seen this snake near Windhaven? Kim replied, I only had to remove 3 last year, and he looked at Jeffrey who nodded in agreement. The next snake Kim showed us was the boomslang, whom he said was a tree dweller. The males of this species are the peacocks, with a variety of color shades from solid bright green to rust red or a combination of black and yellow. The ladies are dull olive brown or gray. The juveniles are spectacular with their bright emerald eyes, white throat and meter and their half-long bodies. He told us. Kim added, the fangs of this snake are smaller and he has to work his venom in, so it is unlikely this snake will kill you. Its fangs are located at the back of its head and its venom is hemotoxic. That means it affects the body's natural blood clotting mechanism, resulting in the bleeding of the internal organs. That can sometimes take 24 hours before the symptoms are felt or seen, but then the person bleeds to death from every orifice. A quick glance around the room showed me by looks on faces I hadn't seen very often that Kim had just made his point for the entire presentation. Kim went on to show us one of his favorite snakes, the gaboon viper, the largest viper in Africa. He said, this snake can reach almost 2 meters and weigh more than 20 kgs. Dick asked, why is this snake your favorite, Kim? To which he replied, this is the most beautiful snake that Ngai ever created. It has a large triangular head that tapers into a narrow neck, and on its face are a pair of horns between their raised nostrils. He has a distinctive brown stripe on his pale head, but the pattern of the scales on his body and his ability to camouflage into the habitat he lives in is unsurpassed. Kim went on to say this snake was the fastest striking snake with an incredibly long reach. In fact, much further than you may think. Normally a shy snake may not strike at you at all if you leave it alone. They are largely nocturnal, so if you stumble across them in the day, they're probably sleeping. The gaboon viper's cytotoxic venom itself is not considered particularly toxic, but there's lots of it. A bite from the gaboon viper will cause rapid and conspicuous swelling, intense pain, severe shock, and blistering around the wound. You'll feel uncoordinated, spend a lot of time on the toilet waiting for your tongue and eyelids to swell. With all that swelling it makes it difficult to have convulsions, so you generally just go unconscious. He told us. A few mouths in the crowd hit the floor. Everyone took a breather at that point and had a cup of coffee before Kim continued with another headliner, the puff adder. That snake earns its place as Africa's deadliest snake because it's responsible for the most human fatalities. Puff adders were quite common, and Kim said, you can be certain that by the time you go home, if you haven't seen one of them, they have seen all of you. These snakes have a solid chunky build with a wide girth tapering down to a short fat tail. At around a meter, they aren't as big as some of the others he showed us. Color patterns vary depending on where they live, but that shouldn't stop you from recognizing them. Kim said. The puff adder has large fangs and venom powerful enough to kill a full-grown man with a single bite. The venom is cytotoxic and one of the most toxic of any vipers. If you get bit by this snake, it could produce severe local and systemic symptoms. Kim informed us. Ian added, if you decide to walk outside the wall at night, you must wear the proper footgear and keep your wits about you. People tend to step on this ambush predator and get bitten. Don't sit on this guy. Kim introduced the next snake, the night adder. This one varies from light brown with pink hues to light grey with diamond-shaped darker markings on the back and tail. These are little guys about a half meter. Think of them as the smaller sibling of Puff. This is my wife Wamuyu and my daughter Wham. Wamuyu and Wham joined us for the discussion. Wamuyu told us, I know most, if not all, of the animals in Kenya and I have collected specimens for the various research projects conducted at Windhaven over the years. She admitted a passion for plant species. Wham, her daughter, helped out at Windhaven when she was not in school. She was an avid naturalist and building a book of sightings of all species including where she witnessed them, their sex and any additional information deemed important. She was still in school but had plenty of time for her special activities. Wrinkles was the next snake Kim cautioned us about. It can spray its venom up 2.5 meters by flinging action in the head and upper body. You'll recognize this snake by its short, pointed head and large black eyes under a cobra hood. The venom of the wrinkles is neurotoxic and partially cytotoxic. You may not get bitten by wrinkles, but this snake will aim its venom at your face with great accuracy. If you're not wearing glasses, it gets in your eyes and temporarily blinds you. Even if you have an open wound, it can absorb the venom and cause great pain. We've not seen one of these this year, though I don't think. Jeffrey added. Jeffrey said, I review all of the camera discs and so does my mom and sister. We've not seen any wrinkles. The last snake that Kim wanted to show us was the vine snake, a timid snake that's only going to attack if provoked. The venom is hemotoxic, so it disables the clotting process of your blood, and you bleed from everywhere. No anti-venom exists for a bite by the vine snake, and Kim stopped there. Wamuyu told us that the administration building stocks a lot of venom supplies which Dr. Sue or Dr. Ben can administer to get a therapy started. A bite still means a trip to the local hospital and may also mean many days of agony. Just when I thought the presentation was finished and I went to stand up, Jeffrey put his hand on my shoulder and said, wait, there's much more to come. And he was so right. Kim said, there are 3 species of scorpion in this area, the Parabuthus pallidus, the Hotantota trilineatus, and the Europlectes fischeri. A few scorpions, such as the Parabuthus, squirt venom as far as a meter, just as a warning, possibly injuring their target in the eyes. Only 25 species have venom that is deadly to humans. Those species belong to the family Buthidae, including Lyrus quinquestriatus, Hotantota spp. Unfortunately, I can't remember if they had common names, but I think one of these armored bandits is the fat-tailed scorpion that I feared. Wham informed us, the venom of scorpions from the family Buthidae tends to be the most toxic. Wamuyu added, these venom fractions include compounds such as acetylcholinesterase, hyaluronidase, serotonin, phospholipase, and other specific neurotoxins. Typically, those neurotoxins result in the opening of ion channels at the neuromuscular junction. The body produces serotonin naturally when you're happy, but too much of good things can result in issues. It was obvious that Wamuyu was more than just a research field assistant. Kim told us, all the species were looking at her in the family Buthidae. The overall encounter rate for scorpions in this area is 5.6 scorpions per hour, asleep or awake. A gasp went out from the foreigners upon hearing those statistics. Realizing scorpions were inside the wall and I could find them in my bed sent a shiver up my spine. Odonturus dentatus, known as the Kenyan deathstalker or giant orange deathstalker, is only 5 centimeters long and lives under rocks, logs and other ground items. Watch where you put your hands when you're outside of the Windhaven wall. Wamuyu told us. Jeffrey chirped in, you should always shake out your shoes and boots when putting them on and never go outside barefoot. Pull back the covers on your bed and flip over your pillow. Make it a habit. Ask me later tonight and I will show you a trick I can do with scorpions. Kim moved on to the category of spiders, and I could have had a stroke. I thought, holy crap, what am I doing here? Wamuyu took over the talk from this point and told Kim to get a big Muratina. This is the funnel web spider who likes to hide in your shoes and waits for you to step into them. She said. Although the bite will not kill you, it requires a lot of immobilization. If you get bitten on the finger, we must pressure bandage your entire arm and restrict movement with a splint. She said, then added, I often get called to come and do this for older people. Wamuyu went on to say, the sac spider requires special attention too because you don't cut the area of the bite or it can lead to spreading the venom or infection. I use antibacterial cream to ensure no infection takes place. Anything more and they must seek medical attention." And she laughed. The next spider introduced was the button spider or widow spider. There was a black and brown version around, and although the venom of the brown was 4 times less toxic than that of a black, you don't want to let either get you, she suggested. Symptoms include pain, sweating, nausea, and shortness of breath. Come and see Dr. Sue or Dr. Ben to get medical attention should you be bitten. She added. Cheesy stated, I hope I can recognize the bugger that gets me because I'm not going to bring a sample. An artist's rendering is going to have to do. Quote. Do your best, Cheesy, it may save your life, not to put too fine a point on it. Ian replied. Wamuyu went on to show us the violin spider or recluse spider. These spiders are small but pack a wallop. They are highly venomous and destroy your tissue, causing a very specific kind of skin necrosis known as lexicalism that happens in 2/3 of cases. It's the only proven type of necrotic bite in humans. We had a spider doctor here about 20 years ago, and I learned a lot about spiders from him, but this is not a spider we encounter often. We thanked them for the detailed instructions and took the handbook they gave us of the animals we had just looked at. It told us when to worry about them as well as what to do if the bastards got us. Each had a very nice picture, and I thought these should be made into wanted posters. During the time he was at Windhaven, Ian needed to check in with the various research projects going on in the labs and touch base with the people in charge of the projects. Some of these people he had known since he was a child, and now, he was about to determine their financing future. His father had asked him to report back after the trip and discuss what direction they wanted to go for the future. There were many important projects that needed doing in Africa, and Ian found it frustrating choosing just a select few. I was looking forward to sharing a room with Ian because all through Ridgeway he had Richard as his roommate, and now I had a better chance to get into his psyche. Later in the bungalow, Cheesy and Dick had made a list of things they wanted to see, but unfortunately this was not the right time of year to witness the most spectacular annual events like the wildebeest migration between August and October. It was agreed that the balloon trip with Martin was a must. Early explorers in Africa were really sailors dropped off on the shore of the dark continent. It was not a role for the faint at heart. They created many early maps of Africa as well as diaries of their trips. Many of these contained details on unique species of plant and animal, but many of the directions were based on sextant measures that required sea level. In an area such as this, 100 or so feet above sea level could throw off distance measurements by a considerable amount. It was agreed by all to visit the Masai Mara National Reserve and meet the Masai tribe as well as see some lions. Cheesy wanted to include Lake Nakuru, a soda lake in the Rift Valley, and Meru National Park. He said Jeffrey told him it was bursting with forest, swamps, and grasslands so we could see a wide variety of animals. Ian told us, it's an absolute must we go to Mount Kenya because it's the spiritual heart of the Kikuyu. He cautioned us that the list we made may need to be refined. Africa runs at a slower pace, especially if it rains. Reaching everywhere Cheesy and Dick wanted to go could be difficult. The best part of the nights while at Windhaven were the campfires where Sir Malcolm recanted his amazing tales. I'm absolutely sure they weren't tall tales, even though they had elements that were hard to imagine. Although he didn't drink during the day, he would deposit 1 bottle of Gordon's dry gin in the bin and crack open a fresh one between tales. To be fair, he did pass the bottle around and others poured from it into their own glasses before he took the rest for himself. As he sat down on the stump next to the fire, he would take a long draw from the bottle, wipe his lips on his sleeve and lean forward. He would look each of us in the eye as he began to weave his tale just to make sure we were all paying attention. Nobody wanted a smack with the stick on their shin. Sir Malcolm loved to tell stories about tiger hunts from his time in India and Nepal, especially if they included Jim Corbett, the great tiger hunter. Corbett was a family friend that Sir Malcolm knew very well growing up. Lord Andrew and Jim Corbett were great friends. Corbett knew Sir Malcolm from the time he was a child and took a particular interest in his early development. Although Corbett was past his best tiger hunting years, he loved to regale people with stories of bravery and courage that were unequaled by his peers. Wherever Corbett went, Sir Malcolm was sure to follow until Corbett died in the spring of 1955. Of particular interest to me was the story of the Champawat tiger. She was a Bengal tigress responsible for an estimated 436 deaths in Nepal and the Kumaon area of India. Jim Corbett shot and killed her in 1907 after what can only be called an epic hunt and a more epic confrontation. Sir Malcolm liked to set the scene of the night of that final hunt. They had been tracking the man-eater for many months and recently begun to bring Corbett in when they were close. The tiger killed over 200 victims in Nepal and then travelled over the Indian border and began her campaign of terror again. On this particular night, the tiger killed a young girl in a village near to the town of Champawat and left a trail of blood. Corbett was quick to arrive in the village and picked up the trail immediately. After nearly getting ambushed by the tiger while investigating the remains of its victim, he managed to scare the tigress off with 2 shots from his rifle. Corbett had to abandon the hunt for the night due to the weather and perhaps to regain his composure after such a close call. That was the domain of the tiger, and this was certainly no amateur man-eater with over 400 victims. She was the world champion. As Sir Malcolm tells it, Corbett decided to use villagers to organize a beat the next day around noon. He explained that a beat was where hundreds of locals beat drums or trees or the ground to push animals in the direction they want them to follow. This beat followed the Champa River Gorge with the help of about 300 villagers from Champawat, where Corbett eventually confronted the tigress. His first shots hit her in the chest and shoulder respectively. Those did not stop her. As she regained her composure and was rushing toward Corbett, he took another man's rifle when he ran out of bullets. Firing the acquired gun from the hip, the bullet hit the big cat in the foot, causing her to collapse just 6 meters from him. A post-mortem on the tigress showed she was between 10 and 12 years old. The upper and lower canine teeth on the right side of her mouth were broken, the upper one in half, the lower one right down to the bone. Corbett said this injury was the result of an old gunshot and probably prevented her from hunting her natural prey. Humans are easy prey for tigers. After bringing down the Champawat tiger, Jim Corbett acquired a reputation as the leading hunter of man-eaters. That ability served him well at a time when deforestation and diminishing prey were driving more and more tigers and leopards to hunt humans for food. It was during his waning career and into retirement that he became closer with Lord Andrew and Lady Amanda Havelock. Lord Havelock was a conservationist who was dedicated to protecting the tiger, and Jim Corbett no longer hunted tigers but understood them better than anyone. Sir Malcolm regaled us with many other stories, and they didn't all involve Jim Corbett or even tiger hunting. Some nights he told stories of India like Varanasi, the city of dead where people went to Viking-style funerals on the Ganges, or New Delhi with its red fort, temples, and shrines. He usually could get through 2 or 3 of these before retiring to his bungalow for the evening. The path to Sir Malcolm's bungalow was obvious to anyone with ears when he was on his way to bed. You could usually identify where he was by the volume of his voice, as he sang the same military song every night on his way to find his mattress. Geoffrey took us outside the wall one night and asked us how many scorpions we thought were within 20 yards of where we were standing. Remembering the statistics Wamuyu had quoted us, I answered, 10. He had been carrying what looked like a light in one hand and a flashlight in the other. As he shone the flashlight around, we could see the odd scorpion scoot away under a rock or bush. Then Geoffrey turned on the black light and we were amazed at what we saw. Scorpions glow a vibrant blue-green when exposed to certain wavelength ranges of ultraviolet light, such as that produced by black light. It's caused by fluorescent chemicals like beta-carboline in the cuticle of the scorpion. The little armored glow-in-the-dark minions of death scurried around almost faster than we could count them. 27. Shouted Cheesy. An ultraviolet lamp had long been a standard tool for nocturnal field surveys of these critters. We were told by Dr. Ben, who had come out with us, fluorescence occurs as a result of sclerotization, formed by cross-linking members of particular classes of protein molecules, a biochemical process. Wham added, to them it's like tanning under a fluorescent sunlamp. The older ones are brighter, so they've received a better tan. Dr. Sue, who had also come out with us, added, it amounts to a form of tanning. Scorpions must shed their exoskeleton in order to grow or assume a new stage of development. Each time they do that, it increases in intensity. This fluorescence may have a role in the scorpion's ability to detect light. Geoffrey brought out a couple of lights and we spent an hour chasing glow-in-the-dark scorpions and looking for different colors and the brightest ones. Thank goodness we didn't run into any nocturnal snakes. We were so naive. On occasion Ian's local childhood friends would come by at night and join the bonfire with us. There was one young lady who was there every night. She worked on the estate and her name was Wajiru, but everyone called her Jay. Ian said her tribal affiliation was Kikuyu and she lived on Windhaven with her family by the permission of his father. Kim is Jay's father, and her mother is Wamuyu. Geoffrey and Wham are her brother and sister, Ian told us. Ian's grandfather had to repurchase Windhaven in 1965 from the new Kenyan government that resulted from the Mau Mau uprising against colonial occupation. The capture of the rebel leader signaled the ultimate defeat of the Mau Mau and set the stage for Kenyan independence in December 1963. Colonial occupation probably had an impact on the locals' opinion of Sir Malcolm. Cheesy finally got Jay to talk to us one night around the fire when it was just the 5 of us. She gave us a little insight into her tribal culture. According to her, the Kikuyu represent about 15% of the population of Kenya and are the biggest ethnic group with their own set of cultures and traditions. The Kikuyu were linked to the larger group known as Bantu through language, but she dismissed the connection because the Kikuyu had their own creation story and beliefs which made him genetically different from the other tribes clustered under Bantu. Jay went on to say that spiritually the Kikuyu believe in an omnipotent creator god by the name of Ngai. She told us, "We continue to feel the spiritual presence of our ancestors who always remain in the energy of the earth. As the story goes, Ngai created humanity, Adam being known as Gikuyu in this version and Eve went by the name of Mumbi. Together, Gikuyu and Mumbi had 9 beautiful daughters. The 9 beautiful daughters needed 9 handsome significant others, so Ngai held a ceremony under a sacred sycamore tree. 9 handsome gentlemen showed up and each daughter married the man who was the same height as her. These 9 daughters founded the 9 Kikuyu tribes. Gikuyu and Mumbi had a 10th daughter named Wirigia, who had a child out of wedlock and went on to create the Akamaba nation. Today all clans and families emanate from them in perpetuity through patriarchy. Ngai also created Mount Kenya as a resting place he could use when he was on one of his inspection tours of the earthly realm. He visited Earth from time to time to inspect it, bestow blessings, or mete out some form of punishment. Ngai truly is omnipotent. In Indian Hindu mythology 3 gods are required to accomplish this task: Brahma the creator, Shiva the shit disturber and Krishna the Dr. Phil of the group. Being a god, Ngai wasn't always present, but when he does come to Kenya, Ngai stays at the Mount Kenya summit, malaria-free. Jay said her name Wanjiru was the name of one of the 9 daughters of Mumbi and was the mother of the Anjiru, her clan. When Cheesy asked what Wanjiru was the god of, Jay replied, medicine, and everyone laughed and turned to look at Ian. I'm sure it wasn't the glow of the fire that put the blush on his face, but Jay would never have given herself away in such a manner. I did notice later when we got up to leave the fire, she was very tall and close to Ian's height. From that night on she enlightened us with cultural tidbits, and we began to get a taste for tribal life and how it fit with Africa just as Ian had said. Jay's people were known as the children of the Big Sycamore and arrived on the northern side of Mount Kenya around the 3rd century. They are proud of the fact that they have never been subdued by another nation. According to Jay, even before the arrival of the British in Kenya, Arabs were involved in slave trading and caravans passed at the southern edges of their nation. Slavery, as an institution, did not exist amongst her people. They didn't raid their neighbors to capture slaves for profit and any Arabs venturing into Kikuyu lands met with instant death. Ngai required the occasional goat sacrifice ritual in times of drought, epidemic or to promote a successful planting or harvest. Jay told us many life stages such as birth, marriage and death required some type of spiritual intervention. All prayers were given facing Mount Kenya and all sacrifices to Ngai were performed under a sycamore tree. A fig tree could be used if a sycamore wasn't available, but the olive tree was a sacred tree for women and would never be used for such a sacrifice. Other traditions and superstitions popped up from day to day, like the time in the courtyard when Dick was passing by while whistling a tune and Jay stopped him from whistling because the Kikuyu believe that whistling calls out malicious spirits. Another time Cheesy was telling us about his father having another set of twins and Jay said the Kikuyu people believed it was bad luck to speak about the coming birth of a child. Evil spirits would hear about the child and take it away. Jay came with us on some of our side trips on the estate and when thunder began to rumble, she said it was the movement of Ngai and that when he fires his lightning weapon it will clear the way for him moving from one sacred place to another. Ngai was either coming to Earth or returning home when the lightning cracked open the sky. Cheesy, Dick and I accompanied Ian one evening to have a meal with Jay and her family at their home. There was a fence around the house which allowed us to eat al fresco with a big fire in the background. Her father Kim, short for Kamotho, and her mother Wamuyu, greeted us and welcomed us to their home. Jay explained that Wamuyu was the name of another of Mumbi's daughters and her sisters were named after them as well. Jay introduced her sisters Wambui, they called her Wam, Waisira whom they called Sarah and Wangoi, the baby they called Baby Goo. Her brother Jeffrey greeted us when we arrived as well. It was a different meal than I had ever experienced. I didn't consider myself a fussy eater, but I had to ask what each of the items were before I ate them. We were each given a bowl and a spoon made by a craftsman of their tribe from a specific type of wood. The meal included traditional dishes of githeri, which was a maize and beans combination, mukamo, a mashed green peas and potatoes dish, and kimitu, which seemed to be more mashed beans and potatoes. Then there was irio, a bit of mashed dry beans, corn, and potatoes again, but the last item was the real charmer called mutura. Now mutura is a sausage made using goat intestines along with meat and blood for filling. I drew the line there and couldn't stomach the fermented porridge made from corn flour and millet either. Jeffrey laughed at our reaction to almost everything and then brought out beef and goat that had been roasted over the fire and was absolutely delicious. After the meal we sat around the fire and Jeffrey told us stories of Mugo wa Kabiru, the seer who had the power of prophecy and powerful medicine, and Kururiwa Gakure, the great chief who was a famous medicine man and warrior. Jeffrey said, Gakure traded ivory with the Arabs and led the Kikuyu warriors to battle after giving him a potion that was believed to make them invincible. That got Dick's attention and he wanted to learn more about Gakure. Wham and Sarah showed us a fly whisk made from a cow tail fitted with a wooden handle that was usually carried by elders as a status symbol. The type of wood always seemed to be important in these objects, or even the charms and necklaces I had noticed on the locals. Jeffrey continued, the Kikuyu make shields for dancing, and he showed us one and went on to say, they're called indome and carved from a single piece of wood with a hole for the arm instead of a hand grip. The warrior wears the shield on the upper left arm. This type of shield is used by boys prior to their initiation as junior warriors. Each year the boys choose a design which they later use for their war shields if they achieve warrior status. Shields of this type are family heirlooms but can be repainted any time. Kim plied us with locally brewed beer called Muratina, but the wine we brought from camp didn't go amiss. Sarah entertained us with her fiddle, or at least the Kikuyu version of a fiddle. This fiddle, called the wandindi, was played using a sisal string bow called the muthaj. The instrument played a sound that reminded me of the wind blowing through the tall grass. Whether it was the sisal used in the bow or the instrument itself, the wind was everywhere at Windhaven, it seemed. When the children had said their good nights, Ian asked Kim about the poaching situation over the last few years. Kim told us in Kenya about 20 years ago over 250 elephants and 50 rhinos were poached annually, but with the Kenya Wildlife Service and global efforts to address poaching and wildlife trafficking, the problem has been significantly reduced. Corruption of officials that allow poaching to happen for their own benefit is probably the biggest problem left, but the volume of poaching is currently low by traditional standards. The ivory from the elephant tusk can be replaced by the ivory from mammoth tusks, which are actually more abundant these days as they wash up on the banks of rivers in the Soviet Union. As the permafrost melts, it releases all kinds of dinosaur bones. Mammoth ivory is easily seen as different from other ivory and is not illegal to sell. The rhino is a different story because you cannot find a substitute in Chinese medicine for the rhino horn. There have been several rhinos poached in Kenya but none on the estate. In fact, there has not been an elephant or rhino killed on the estate since Ian's father repurchased it in 1965. Prior to that, Kim said it was a daily life-threatening struggle to fight the poachers. Elephants and rhinos play a critical role in maintaining the biodiversity of the savanna and forest ecosystems, but they will probably never reach the levels that could be supported because of the number of people who require that same real estate. An estate like Windhaven that actively discourages poaching is an important link in creating safe habitats for large terrestrial animals beyond what the government is doing. Sir Malcolm was on his way to bed when we returned from our dinner. Cheesy asked, Sir Malcolm, have you ever hunted elephants? Sir Malcolm replied that he would only hunt something that would hunt him. He didn't feel the elephant was a threat to you unless you confront them or get between them and their offspring. An elephant will charge you, but in Sir Malcolm's opinion, that's your own stupidity. Tigers, on the other hand, will hunt and stalk you even if you've never laid eyes on them before or challenged them in any way. When you look into their eyes in that final moment before the kill, you see the primal look of an animal that is going to kill you and eat you. The elephant's eye does not convey that same message, he said, and then continued after a moment, but I know not everybody feels that way. On one trip to Africa, I met Walter Bell, the famous elephant hunter. Walter told me that the bull elephant was the most exhilarating animal to kill. He used a small-bore rifle and aimed for the brain instead of the heart. In fact, he would take his shot from behind the animal on a diagonal. They called that the Bell shot, but Sir Malcolm said, I called it the Bell shit. Walter Bell killed more than 1,000 elephants all across Africa, and Sir Malcolm was not a big fan of his. The tigers Sir Malcolm hunted were all man-eaters, Ian told me later. I was not sure why Sir Malcolm tracked tigers in India. He had killed tigers, but I think he had a much deeper connection to the tigers than I understood. Finally, Sir Malcolm put up his hands and headed towards his bungalow, leaving us with, elephant hunting is for noblemen. Sandev Gupta was also staying on the estate while we were there. Sandev worked for Sir Malcolm in India and would travel to Africa a couple times a year to update Sir Malcolm on his Indian holdings. Although Sandev was 20 years our senior, he was a pleasure to be around. He had an infectious Jewish vibe that he attributed to his Hindu religious beliefs and being connected to the earth and the animals around him. Cheesy called him Sandy and said he could see the good in everything but was the least naive person he had ever met. Sandy was sharp, in a mystical sort of way, that caused you to reflect on what he said to fully understand the meaning of what he was telling you. The analogy Cheesy used was, it feels like somebody picked your pocket, but your wallet is still there. Dick was interested in all forms of physical fitness and Sandy was a yoga master. That was enough of a connection to make them constant companions. They would be the first ones up in the morning, and Ian and I often found them in one of their yoga poses in the yard while we were on our way to consume a massive breakfast. Sir Malcolm's holdings in India were significant and included a great deal of land, businesses, and buildings. He had inherited his parents' estate as well as the estate of Jim Corbett. Although Sir Malcolm could technically be called Lord Malcolm, he refused to take the title. As Sandy tells it, rumour was that Sir Malcolm was actually the illegitimate son of Lady Amanda Havelock and Jim Corbett, and he felt sure Sir Malcolm believed it as true. It surprised me one morning while walking past Sir Malcolm's bungalow to see him sitting cross-legged in the lotus position. His eyes were closed, and he didn't move as I went past without disturbing him. Sandy informed me Sir Malcolm was a yoga master as well and practiced it like a religion, because in India you must be a yoga master before you can be anything else. Cheesy, Dick and I made the trip to the Masai Mara National Reserve with Jeffrey as our guide. We were able to meet some Masai people, but it didn't seem the same as meeting Jay and her people. This seemed so commercial and false, almost like a Disney park. When we saw lions, they were so far away and so many locals were around that it may as well have been a zoo or safari drive. I don't think I imagined petting any lions, but I did want to feel that they were free. It's not the freedom they had centuries ago, but it isn't for the Maasai either. Unfortunately, there would have been much better ways to invest the time we spent on that excursion. We did get to see some wildlife through the tall grass and across the savannah, such as impalas, cheetahs, wildebeest, zebras, giraffes, hyenas, and baboons. There were elephants everywhere, but we didn't get too close. Cheesy hoped our trips to Lake Nakuru and the primate reserve would be less commercial. Jeffrey confirmed that those areas were more remote, and we will see different animals on those trips than we did on this trip. I think it was good to get this side trip out of the way first because it really was a disappointment. The day after we returned, Ian took us on a tour of the labs to introduce us to the doctors who were in charge of the various research projects. Entering the lab building, Ian explained there were 3 different projects they had commissioned at Windhaven. We had already met Dr. Sue and Dr. Ben on our scorpion hunt and at the nighttime fires, but we were unaware of the projects they were working on. The first project was under the supervision of Dr. Emily Kenyatta, the granddaughter of Jomo Kenyatta, the first president of Kenya. Dr. Emily told us her research project was related to the beliefs of the Kikuyu. In particular, she was interested in the ether and the movement of their ancestors through it. That was the cornerstone of Kikuyu philosophy or religion. I refer to it as vital force, she told us. The Kikuyu believe the universe is composed of interacting and interconnected forces that can manifest themselves in physical things we see and even those things we don't see. Identifying vital force is the first step in Dr. Emily's plan. She went on to explain, the Kikuyu believe all forces in the universe come from Ngai, who has the vital divine force of creation within himself. We already knew the creation story from Jay. Ngai's vital force is exponentially greater than that contained in other objects like humans, animals and trees, and it allows him to pass through realms. Until we can measure the vital force in anything, including people, animals, or minerals, we cannot validate these assumptions. She added, then went on to say, the Kikuyu feel humans have the highest quantity of this vital force, so that indicates the force must be measurable and quantifiable. Once I have identified the vital force within anything, it can be compared to all other objects, both animate and inanimate, to make a hierarchy leading up to Ngai. The Kikuyu also believe that human vital force can be made stronger. Dr. Emily told us, again, once we find the vital force, it should be transferable from one object to another object based on their hierarchy. The level of vital force in an object follows a hierarchy from Ngai, whose force is divine, then down to humans, then animals in some order, onto plants, and then even inanimate objects. It's believed there is a specific point within each object where most of that force is concentrated. To be able to measure levels of vital force should allow us to pinpoint that place in the object that has the most vital force. That may allow for extraction. The Kikuyu believe that the first humans had a stronger vital force because they got their vital force directly from Ngai. Dr. Emily said, if that assumption is true, then we should be able to measure a decline in vital force in generations of people over time. We even considered a DNA study to see what has changed in the Kikuyu DNA over time, but the cost was far too extensive. Ian piped in that Dr. Emily needs to identify the vital force to really open up the funding and get this project in full swing. Dr. Emily stated, it's also believed leaders can reinforce another human's vital force. So she said to Ian, I need your father to share more of his vital force with me. And we laughed. Sandy noted, that concept is not so different from the Hindu concept of Atman as the basis for reincarnation. I thought to myself, did the Kikuyu have a way to recognize who would be an effective leader by measuring their vital force? A democratic vote doesn't always produce a leader with excess vital force. Could the Kikuyu somehow measure vital force and select the best or purest of heart person to be leader? Or even measure when a leader has fallen from grace and should be expelled? Dr. Emily envisioned many aspects to this project and many avenues to follow. Her ideas were on hold so other parts of the project could go forward. It was simply a case of prioritization. For instance, she would like to pursue the Kikuyu belief that the vital force of a dead ancestor can come back to life through the birth of a new child. Even though they attribute it to the naming of the child, other forces may be at work through the ether utilizing the vital force to impact reincarnation. They certainly wouldn't be the first religion to believe in reincarnation. Dr. Emily told us, Kikuyu believe humans can gain vital force from lower forces through animal or plant sacrifice. If they were to bypass the process of sacrifice under a sycamore or fig tree, it would be an abomination and lead to a curse. Ngai may require that vital force for himself to clear a path to Earth on one of his inspections. Another Kikuyu myth tells of a human who can manipulate vital force by being very skilled, but it doesn't indicate what those skills are, how to measure them or how you train to improve them. Dr. Emily then continued, some humans can manipulate things to their advantage or to their detriment by identifying the point of concentration of vital force in an object. By invoking higher forces to assist them, they can increase the skill. Higher forces than humans could only be Ngai. An omnipotent God is always good to have on your side. Finally, she said, Kikuyus use an animal to symbolize the level of their vital force compared to others, but how do they know what animal shows you are the best? Which animal, next to humans, has the most vital force? This could create the hierarchy of animals I am looking for. We wished her well and asked if we could drop by from time to time while at Windhaven to see how her research is going. Dr. Emily gave a hearty approval and we left her to her work. The tour continued on to the lab located in the next bungalow where we found two doctors working on related issues. Ian informed us that there are a lot of infections that can be transmitted by mosquito bites, including yellow fever, Zika virus, West Nile virus, Ross River fever or Rift Valley fever. The two most dangerous and prevalent infections for this area are malaria and dengue fever. About 3.5 million cases of malaria were recorded last year and it's responsible for over 10,000 deaths every year in Kenya alone. The CDC has worked closely with the Kenya Ministry of Health to fight malaria, but it's a daunting task with a 5% mortality rate for severe malaria. The key to solving the problem lies with the little demon that spreads it by being a vector species, the mosquito. Ian told us. Dr. Sue Gibson is working on the malaria issue through a focus on the mosquito species that are the source, and in particular, she is examining the mosquito's saliva before and after it ingests the malaria pathogen. It's nice to meet you. Ian's right, there are many worthy causes in Africa. I cried the first time I saw a Zika baby. It's important to find a way to stop something so horrible, Dr. Sue told us. Dr. Ben Dawson is working on dengue fever, and he too is focused on the mosquitoes as the source. Hi, you can just call me Ben, if you like. The mosquito is harmless until she ingests pathogens from a host. Then she becomes fully loaded for the next person that gets her saliva injected into them. Dr. Sue added, 80 to 90% of fatal cases in Kenya are from the Plasmodium falciparum species of mosquito. Plasmodium falciparum is a unicellular protozoan parasite of malaria disease for humans, the deadliest species that causes malaria in humans. The Anopheles mosquito picks up malaria's most dangerous form, falciparum malaria. Children under 5 years of age are most affected, accounting for 67% of the total deaths. Dick asked how the mosquito infected humans and Dr. Ben told us, upon becoming infected, the mosquito's gut prepares a zygote which is a fertilized egg cell. In the embryonic development of humans and other animals, the zygote stage is brief followed by cleavage, when the single cell becomes subdivided into smaller cells. He went on to say, until meiosis, a type of cell division that reduces the number of chromosomes in the parent cell by half and produces 4 reproductive cells or gamete cells, it must stay there. These cells are called diploid and this process is required to produce egg and sperm cells for sexual reproduction. My epiphany bell went off and I wondered if this was a key step in a gene drive that I wanted to understand. At this point you either create sterile males or you pass the sterility on to all future generations and decimate all the little demons of this species only. Wouldn't other mosquitoes take up the slack as far as feeding the food chain? With 3,500 species of mosquitoes, who would think just one wouldn't matter, but how wrong I was. My bell shut off and I continued to listen to Dr. Ben, who added, meiosis begins with a parent cell that is diploid, meaning it has 2 copies of each chromosome, inside the sporoblast. A conveniently named place to produce spores. Over 3,000 haploid daughter cells called sporozoites, which have only one complete chromosome set, appear on the surface of the mother cell. Dr. Ben said, Immature sporozoites break through the oocyst wall into the hemolymph, which is a fluid, like blood in vertebrates. It circulates in the interior of the arthropod. Ian said, maybe we could give the infected mosquitoes some dialysis and clean their hemolymph. The medical people chuckled, and Dr. Sue replied, okay, but you're going to have to needle them. Cheesy, Dick and I suddenly realized how much we had just learned about this science in the few minutes we had been exposed. This place was addictive to inquiring minds. No wonder Ian loved it here so much. I felt they could actually change the world. Dr. Ben went on to say eventually the sporozoites migrate to the mosquito salivary glands where they undergo further development and become infective to humans. I thought to myself, that's one hell of a journey nature has inexplicably planned to set the human pendulum of health swinging, at least here in Africa. The Plasmodium falciparum species of mosquito are the bad girls of the line that should be targeted first in any gene drive. I would like to take a swing at their pendulum myself. Dr. Ben said, to reduce the number of incidents of all forms of malaria or dengue fever today, it's important to look at their life stages and human contact. The mosquito's life cycle consists of the egg, larva, pupa, and adult stages. Eggs are laid on the water surface, then hatch into larvae and feed on algae and organic material until they reach the adult stage. In many environments, they are an important food source for animals, such as dragonfly nymphs. Dragonflies and mosquitoes rock each other's pendulums of survival. The adult females of mosquitoes have a tube-like proboscis that can pierce the skin of a person and feed on their blood. They need the protein and iron in the blood to produce eggs to start the cycle over again. He continued. Dr. Sue jumped in and said, the mosquito's saliva is transferred to the host during the bite and can cause an itchy rash, but that's just a smokescreen. Dr. Ben's medical school analysis was bang on, but in simpler terms, the mosquitoes ingest pathogens when biting something and their body converts the pathogens so that it can infect humans. Then they create a new batch of juiced-up saliva. Each mosquito becomes the Enola Gay, carry the package and drop the bomb. Dick would appreciate that analogy, unfortunately. Dick asked, how many types of mosquitoes are there? And Dr. Ben told him over 3,500 species of mosquitoes have already been described and divided into 2 subfamilies, which in turn comprised some 43 genera. To answer Cheesy's follow-up question about genera, he said it was a principal taxonomic category that ranks above species but below family. Ian asked, Dr. Sue, sometimes things like RNA need to traffic between the nucleus and the cytoplasm. I understand there are pores in the nuclear membrane to allow molecules to go in and out of the nucleus. Is this how the mosquito passes the pathogen protein? To which she replied, it used to be thought that the nuclear membrane only allowed molecules to go out, but now it's realized that there is an active process also for bringing molecules into the nucleus. So, the quick answer is, yes. Welcome to the Calicidae family. For someone who grew up alone in boarding schools, I have been getting quite an education on what families are, whether they're people or animals. The 2 main subfamilies of this blood mafia are the Anophelinae and Calicinae families. The distinction is of great practical importance because the 2 subfamilies tend to differ in their significance as vectors of different classes of diseases, including the ones the good doctors are looking at. Vector species are a primary cause of the spread of a disease. Arboviral diseases such as yellow fever and dengue fever tend to be transmitted by Calicine species from the Calicinae family. Identifying the species involved is critical because only a few can carry the diseases that Dr. Sue or I are looking for. We each have a list of the targeted species important to our projects. We work as a team if we can to get our samples and data. Jay helps us out distributing mosquito nets and sprays when she picks up the sticky tapes with the samples so we can identify which species are around the area. Dr. Ben said. He went on to say, some of the species of mosquitoes that are adapted to breeding in plant reservoirs are dangerous disease vectors. They might just as well occupy anything from a hollow tree trunk to a cupped leaf or an artificial water container or even a casual puddle. These breeding places are the home of some of the most serious disease vector species such as Aedes that transmit dengue and yellow fever. They're of particular interest to me. There are also some studies on this species for human lymphatic filariasis, in which a worm lives in the human lymph system. We learned the Aedes polynesiensis mosquito can be detected and monitored by ovi-traps. When Cheesy asked what an ovi-trap was, Dr. Sue pulled one out. It was a black, cylindrical container that gets filled with water. It's an ideal location for a female Aedes aegypti to lay eggs, which she does on the cardboard paddles. The eggs fall through the mesh into the water where the larvae hatch and develop into pupas. She said it was okay though because the adult mosquitoes emerge but are trapped beneath the mesh and unable to escape from the ovi-trap. I guess reducing the number of eggs that can hatch from this species is the point of the overall plan because no other species can do what they do. Sticky traps are desirable for optimal monitoring of species abundance and diversity, we were told. Dick asked Dr. Sue who the bad girls of malaria were, and she replied she is currently looking at the Anopheles gambii complex that consists of at least 7 morphologically indistinguishable species of mosquitoes in the genus Anopheles. This complex, or grouping, was recognized 60 years ago and includes the most important vectors of malaria in sub-Saharan Africa. She went on to say of particular interest to her was the most dangerous malaria parasite, Plasmodium falciparum. Dick told her, "I'll put out a wanted dead poster on this gal for you, Dr. Sue." She smiled and said, "If it were only that easy." She continued to say it's one of the most efficient malaria vectors known. The Ngambii mosquito in particular, a bad girl who can carry 2 bombs in her hold and additionally transmits Wisheria bancrofti, which causes elephantiasis. Dr. Sue pulled out a chart and Dr. Ben spread it on the table. Dr. Ben told us, the complex of Ngambii consists of 8 of the worst mosquitoes that you will ever meet in any dark alley of your dreams. Even Cthulhu dreams of these girls. You'll recognize their names by the common moniker of Anopheles, but they each have a second name. Anopheles arabiensis, Anopheles bombay, Anopheles mellus, Anopheles meris, Anopheles quadriannulatus, Anopheles gambii sensu stricto, Anopheles calazi, Anopheles amharicus. And the news continued to get grimmer because the Anopheles gambii is currently in a state of diverging into 2 different species. It's undergoing speciation into the M. opti and S. savanna molecular forms or strains of the same mosquito species. They may have improved on the basic model and become a stronger vector or show more resistance. That was the type of biology I was interested in, but I could see many years of study lay between now and then. Dr. Sue added, mosquitoes are hard to track down because some breed in freshwater, some in saltwater and some in both, while at the same time when they become adults some feed on blood from humans while others must have blood meal from animals. You really have to know which ones you are looking for. Mosquitoes that breed and feed in remote wetlands and salt marshes may well remain uninfected if they don't happen to encounter the infections or have humans to bite. Dr. Ben added that these areas were an opportunity to get control samples of unaffected mosquitoes from targeted species for benchmark blood and saliva samples useful in DNA research. He told us, there is a risk because these areas are very remote and extremely difficult to get to. Wamuyu and Jay are a big help there too. Dr. Sue informed us that for the mosquito to obtain a blood meal, it must circumvent the vertebrate's defense by reducing vascular constriction, blood clotting, platelet aggregation. Even angiogenesis, the formation of new blood cells and immunity systems, all with just a minor inflammation, and that's thanks to their saliva. What a weapon, Dick thought. Do you know what's in it? Ian asked. Her response was that mosquito saliva contained at least 1 anti-clotting, 1 antiplatelet, and 1 vasodilatory substance, as well as enzymes that aid in sugar feeding, and antimicrobial agents to control bacterial growth in the sugar meal. The composition of mosquito saliva is relatively simple, as it usually contains fewer than 20 dominant proteins. 20 years before that time, scientists were unable to say what the source was of more than half of the molecules found in mosquito saliva. Dr. Sue went on to say promising applications of components of mosquito saliva are in the development of anti-clotting drugs, clotting inhibitors and capillary dilators, which are all useful in the fight against cardiovascular disease. Ian asked, how do we fight such a massive force of tiny creatures that can attack us in our sleep? The problem affects everyone around us, so what can we do today to help people avoid this disease? Quote, Dr. Ben took over by saying, that's a big problem with many facets, and if the object was to try and make sure no one got bit tonight, then I would say we must eliminate breeding places, use window screens, and mosquito nets. Biological controls like fungi and nematodes, predators like fish, dragonfly nymphs and adults, some species of lizard and gecko are all partially effective. We can also use sticky traps and sprays to kill them if they do get to breed. But that still won't be enough. Dick noted, that's a lot of different strategies, and yet they all still end in millions of malaria cases every year. Dr. Ben then told him, some people in the scientific community have suggested the introduction of large numbers of sterile males or some other genetic method like cytoplasmic incompatibility that results in sperm and eggs being unable to form viable offspring. Or chromosomal translocations, moving pieces to other chromosomes, or sex distortion to cause sex ration distortions to disrupt the population, and gene replacement. Gene replacement therapy is a technique of recognizing a faulty gene, applying a piece of DNA in its correct form, though a viral vector, or carrier molecule, to the gene. That overrides the identified faulty gene with the corrected copy. My favorite of all to control these disease-carrying bad girls of the insect world may be to eradicate him totally. At that moment I think I had my epiphany. Gene drives, is that like playing God or just saving millions of lives? Is that doing good without doing bad to something else? We shall see, I thought, not knowing how right I was. Cheesy asked Dr. Sue how malaria affected humans. She said, malaria comes with fever and influenza-like symptoms, such as chills, headache, myalgias, and malaise. In severe cases, seizures, mental confusion, kidney failure, acute respiratory distress syndrome, coma, and death may occur. The answer showed me what a look of concern looks like on Cheesy's face, so Dr. Sue asked about the shots we had taken before coming to Africa and the medications we brought with us. She assured Cheesy that he could come to her for a blood test any time and she would cure him. Malaria symptoms can develop as early as 7 days after being bitten by an infectious mosquito in a malaria endemic area and as late as several months or more after exposure. Dr. Sue said, suspected or confirmed malaria, especially P. falciparum, is a medical emergency requiring urgent intervention. Blood smear microscopy remains the most important method for malaria diagnosis. A microscope can provide immediate information about the presence of parasites, allow quantification of the density of the infection, and allow determination of the species of the malaria parasite, all of which are necessary for providing the most appropriate treatment. Malaria could be fatal even when treated, which is why it's always preferable to prevent malaria cases rather than rely on treating infections after they occur. It was interesting to learn that land lying at altitudes above 1,600 meters such as Nairobi and Mount Kenya and surrounding areas are malaria-free. Ngai has found himself a malaria-free spot when he comes to Earth. The normal treatment is generally a course of tovaquone proguanil, but when that's not appropriate due to contraindicators, the alternative, artemether-lumefantrine, is used. However, it has contraindicators as well. Dr. Ben went on to tell us, sustainable malaria prevention consists of a combination of mosquito avoidance measures and chemoprophylaxis. Because of the nocturnal feeding habits of the Anopheles mosquitoes, which carry malaria and bite primarily between dusk and dawn, mosquito nets are essential. Ian said, people should avoid mosquitoes if they can by remaining in well-screened areas, sleeping under insecticide-treated mosquito nets, use an effective insecticide spray and wear clothes that cover most of their body. Of course, a lot of that will never happen for many who don't have the resources to acquire those things. I asked Dr. Ben about the difference with dengue fever, which also spread by mosquitoes. There are 4 closely related but antigenically different serotypes of the virus that can cause dengue. Dengue fever is just the first level because dengue has a wide spectrum of infection outcomes from asymptomatic to symptomatic. Symptomatic illness can vary from dengue fever to the more serious dengue hemorrhagic fever. Dengue hemorrhagic fever is a more severe form, seen only in a small proportion of those infected. Dengue shock syndrome is a dangerous complication of a dengue infection and is associated with high mortality. Severe dengue occurs as a result of a secondary infection with a different virus serotype. Increased vascular permeability, together with myocardial dysfunction and dehydration, contribute to the development of shock ending in multi-organ failure. He told us. We thanked them for taking the time to explain their projects to us, and I asked if we could touch base with them over our visit, and they were happy for the interest. I told Dr. Ben it was hard to believe you could extract blood or saliva from something so small. He replied, I eat lots of carrots. The last bungalow in this group was the administration hut located next to the parking area where we had received our initiation. Jay, Jeffrey, and their family worked and conducted estate business in this building along with Kim's poaching office. Wamuyu, Jay's mother, took us on excursions around the estate in her role as field assistant. She had an amazing understanding of the environment and how it suited both animals and plants throughout the annual changes. Cheesy finally had the courage to call her Big Wham and waited to see what her response was. She broke out in hysterical laughter and said it was perfect, except it better not be because she likes to eat too many sweets. Jeffrey had a few computers on his desk and a table next to it. This was the camp file server and Wi-Fi setup. I looked at Cheesy and could see this needed his touch. We could see a ramp-up was coming and Cheesy knew they were going to need some improvement and direction. Jeffrey told us this was where he managed the remote camera locations they used. It was their first line of defense against poaching. Kim or Jeffrey traveled out to each of the camera sites and picked up a disk they brought back for everyone to look through. Big Wham told us, Kim says he needs better information quicker and to find out the next morning something happened in the dark would be too late. She added that she reviews every image to look for species that they're waiting to arrive this year or getting ready to leave. Wham spends a great deal of her time helping with this task so she can add to her book. This work has helped her build the best book in her school out of all grades. Cheesy told her he would send her a tablet so she could take it with her in the field and capture video and images right into her book and edit it on site. Even record and add sound. Cheesy also offered to spend time with Jeffrey to improve systems and suggested some new hardware and software updates. He told Jeffrey in front of Ian, maybe we can slip a hand in Ian's pocket when he isn't looking. and Ian replied, "It's Sir Malcolm's pocket you best reach into. He controls the spending of the Windhaven budget." Over the next few weeks, we integrated into life at Windhaven, which revolved around the lab requirements and the collection of specimens or maintenance of observation areas. Cheesy spent time with Jeffrey improving the computer system, and Dig went with Wham to pick up camera discs and worked on a project with Dr. Sue. We took a trip around Windhaven, visiting the 5 campsites that were used when personnel went out in the field on the estate. Occasionally, Ian's father had visitors that used these camps for a few weeks at a time when they visited Africa on photo expeditions. Ian, Jay, Cheesy, Sandy and I spent a week with Sir Malcolm traveling the estate. Big Wham decided to come with us to collect samples for Dr. Sue that she had promised weeks ago. Sir Malcolm brought his 2 young helpers Hamish and Angus to set up and take down the camps. They also provided firewood and helped keep the camp scorpion-free. Hamish and Angus stuck out from the rest of the crew like sore thumbs. Although they were Kikuyu, they had shocking red hair and very pale skin, which made them look like they were coated in flour. It's not unusual to see people with their hair dyed red, but this color was natural and quite different. In addition, the boys had blue eyes because they were the offspring of a good friend of Sir Malcolm's and a local Kikuyu lady. Major Magnus McLaughlin had served with Sir Malcolm in India and often came to visit him in Africa. Of course, Magnus was from Scotland originally and had bright red hair to go with his bigger-than-life persona, according to Sandy. Even the elephants turned and ran when they heard him coming. The boys have his laugh. Our first camp was on the western side of the estate. Dry riverbeds seemed to be everywhere. Sir Malcolm told us that after the rains the rivers flow into the Tana River but eventually dry up. He's installed solar water pumps along the route to pump whatever water is available underground into the riverbed. They only form small ponds that dry up eventually, but they extended the season for animals as long as the water holds. He told us. You can see the difference in habitat inside and outside of the riverbed. Big Wham told us, the sycamore fig, known locally as the Magumo tree, is valued for its strength and vitality by the Kikuyu. They say it's the only pathway for communication with Ngai. Quote, "The sycamore is a monoecious plant where both male and female flowers exist on separate twigs on the same plant. Paleobotanists believe this tree family has existed on the Earth for more than 100 million years, with individual trees living up to 500 years. This large deciduous tree commonly grows more than 30 meters, and in this area of the world that is not a simple feat." Big Wham showed us a sycamore fig. The unique pollination system requires a symbiotic relationship with a wasp species known as the fig wasp. The female wasps enter the opening of the fruit to lay their eggs while at the same time pollinating the internal flowers. When the eggs hatch inside the fruit and the wasps have gone through pupation, the mature males and females will mate. The males, which are unable to survive outside of the fig for very long, will dig a tunnel for the females to emerge. The females, with pollen from the flowers sticking to their bodies, fly to another tree to repeat the cycle. She told us. The wood of the sycamore is soft, unsuitable for most purposes except for a necklace. Wham made Cheesy a necklace from sanded and varnished round pieces of sycamore on a sisal chain that was stunningly beautiful. Cheesy had a soft spot for Wham and the enthusiasm she attacked her interests with. The olive tree held a special place in Kikuyu culture for women. Big Wham told us, the cuspidata is one of the subspecies of the brown olive, or iron tree. The local name is Matheru. She is a drought and wind-resistant evergreen which lives up to 100 years. Aren't those the attributes that a good woman should emulate in your culture? She asked, and Cheesy replied, only the best. The camps could be set up or taken down and packed away very quickly. All components were stored on site in small, locked sheds, so we didn't have to transport anything but food from camp to camp. It was possible to occupy all 5 camps at the same time when necessary. We traveled east from our camp following a dried riverbed along the way. This trip was being made on foot, so our opportunity to meet wildlife up close and personal was greatly enhanced. Sir Malcolm was a wealth of information about the local wildlife, and for a man of his age, he was unbelievably spry. I learned that he had a passion for spiders and was able to show us several spider species that were highly venomous or simply amazingly different in some way from the others. As a group, we spotted at least a dozen snakes, especially death adders. Traveling east, we met with rising elevation and the wind seemed to pick up. This camp was on a ridge high above the scrub brush below. Further to the east we could see savanna grasslands and some larger sycamore or acacia trees. This was an amazing night for surveying the area below with infrared binoculars. Actually, the bright light of the full moon exposed many of the larger creatures we could see as shadows moving through the brush. The next day we headed south towards Nairobi, which was several hundred kilometers from there. There were rocky outcrops in this area, and each time we passed one of any significance in size, Sir Malcolm and the two boys would look through it for signs of spiders. I'm not sure if they were looking for a specific spider or just spiders in general, but they were very diligent. Angus was collecting samples and plotting GPS data on his map. Our next camp was west of our current location. During that trek, our bodies needed to create extra energy, so we each had to carry high-energy snacks we could eat for a boost. It sounds like a small thing, but in that heat, it was absolutely necessary. Along the trip, we could hear Jay teaching Ian to speak Kikuyu, and then eventually they would both be speaking Kikuyu. She would say to Ian, "Yuka haha," and Cheesy would elbow me and say, "Come here." Cheesy was actually listening for the phrase, "Ningwendete," because Wham told him it meant, "I love you." Either the phrase never came up or he just wasn't within earshot, it's impossible to say. I think Cheesy knew more Kikuyu than Ian. The final camp was almost at the center of Windhaven and at the highest elevation. The trees were dripping with wind chimes that played a constant melody that changed with the direction of the wind. That night, Dr. Ben and Dr. Sue came out to meet us at the camp and stay for the campfire. Dr. Ben shared some of his knowledge on spider venom with us. Peptides are the main component of spider venom. Peptides are short strings of 2 to 50 amino acids. Amino acids are used to build proteins, but proteins contain more acids. Peptides may be easier for the body to absorb, being smaller and simpler. Spider venom is 25% polypeptides by weight, with some individual venoms harboring up to 1,000 different peptides. Some contain linear, cytolytic peptides that have necrotic effects. Cheesy asked, "What are linear cytolytic peptides, Dr. Ben?" To which he replied, "In the venom of spiders, linear peptides represent a group of membrane-active substances that contribute considerably to the killing power of spider venom. They work with the neurotoxic components of the venom as well as aiding in the external digestion of the spider's prey. It's disulfide-containing peptides that are the major players in spider venoms and more selective in terms of their targets." "Okay, disulfide-containing peptides, Dr. Ben, what are they?" I asked this time, taking my turn to look stupid. Disulfide-rich peptides are a class of bioactive peptides that's widely found in nature, in bacteria, fungi, plants, and animal venom toxins. Bioactive peptides are organic substances formed by amino acids joined by covalent bonds known as peptide bonds. "That's two amino acids bonding?" I asked, and he replied, "Yes." Finally, the higher molecular weight components of venom include enzymes and larger proteins. Dr. Ben continued, "Enzymes have a role in external digestion of the spider's prey once it's been envenomated. Spiders have a variety of enzymes in their venom as well. High molecular weight proteins are fairly uncommon as toxic components of venom, with a notable exception, widow spiders, including the black widow spider herself. Her venom contains toxins called latrotoxins, which are neurotoxins which produce uncontrolled nerve depolarization, increasing intracellular calcium and stimulating uncontrolled exocytosis and release of neurotransmitters." Sandy asked, "Can you give us a simpler version of that, Dr. Ben?" And he said, "Neurotransmitters are chemical messengers in the body. Their job is to transmit signals from nerve cells to target cells. The target cells can be anywhere in the body." Cheesy interjected, "And the brain redirects them to the exact cell. Don't the Chinese study those connections? Isn't that what acupuncture is based on?" Dr. Ben finished with, "The process of finding the target is known as exocytosis and can release neurotransmitter in less than a millisecond. What travels faster than that?" Ian asked Dr. Sue, "How about scorpion venom, Dr. Sue?" And she replied, "Not quite. But the different constituents of crude scorpion venom include water, mucosa, oligopeptides, nucleotides, amino acids, ions, neurotransmitters, salts, low molecular weight peptides, metals, mucoproteins, mucopolysaccharides, hyaluronidase, phospholipase, serotonin, histamine, biogenic amines, and many more unidentified substances." Cheesy asked, "How would you identify the unidentified substances?" The various elements and their abundance can be determined using inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometry by ionization of the venom using inductively coupled plasma generated by argon gas and a radio frequency generator, followed by separation and quantification using a triple-quadruple mass spectrometer. "Glad I asked," Cheesy replied, and we all laughed. Someday I would be able to ask better questions or not have to ask them at all. But that sure wasn't that day. After recuperating back at Windhaven for a couple days from our trip around the estate, we set out on our next big adventure to the primate reserve for a week-long camping excursion. The reserve was only about 2.5 hours away, or 200 kilometers on the A3 road, where we connected with the B8 road to reach the primate reserve. Once we left the B8 it was four-wheel drive territory. The reserve was about halfway between Windhaven and Mombasa, and we were anticipating interesting things would be seen along the way and once we got there. Jeffrey, Big Wham and Wham accompanied Dick in one vehicle while Cheesy and I teamed up with a couple of Jeffrey's friends hired to help out with the camp and keep an eye open for intruders. We started out from Windhaven and drove through scrub brush accented by a few fig trees above the burning sand. The odd sycamore stretched its majestic canopy to the clouds. Dick referred to this area as a 3S zone: sand, scorpions, and snakes. We borrowed camping gear from Windhaven, where they liked to be mobile for field trips collecting samples or staking out poaching sites with their neighbors. Our gear was packed into a couple of Land Rovers from the estate, and we had enough supplies for a 10-day journey. The drive was not far, but progress was slow, especially off the numbered roads. We hit a flurry of signs where the A3 and B8 met, which directed us towards the coast, dropping slightly in elevation. Over the next couple of 100 kilometers, we descended elevation as gently as the river flowed. We passed the Nanagui Dam and the town of Buratana. A short trip off the highway and we were able to take a look at the National Institute of Biology research farm. They specialize in microorganisms and genetically modified organisms, but there was no activity at the site. The economy relies on agriculture, which contributes 30% to Kenya's GDP and employs more than 40% of the total population and 70% of the rural population. China has been instrumental working with Kenya on these types of projects. The road was well paved in most parts with small buildings where people lived and plied their livelihood. We stopped occasionally to stretch our legs and purchase the odd piece of fruit, drink, or souvenir. New apostolic churches seemed to populate the road we traveled. It was a popular religion in this area, and I wondered if it conflicted with Kikuyu beliefs. Jeffrey said, there are other tribes in this area such as the Pokomo, who are a farming community, and bordering him are the Orma pastoralist. There are also a number of people who are not tribal, so they attend the churches that you see along this road. We continued on the B8 until we turned off the main road and headed towards the river. The forest was closing in on us and the scrub had given way to the influence of the river. This was a totally different country all of a sudden, and I was beginning to feel claustrophobic. When I pointed out lots of water reservoirs, I learned they were for rice and not to manage floods as I had thought. Then I reconsidered and thought, if the land floods, plant rice, like the saying, if the world gives you lemons, make lemonade. Too many people are trying to fit the square into the circle. It was a huge advantage to have Jeffrey, Wham and Big Wham treating us to a fountain of information, and we were able to find some of the most stunning sights and rarest animals which tourists just don't see. The lush river forest patches reminded me of the Jungle Book type of African forests that I was expecting when I left home. The Tana River cuts through dry woodland and open savanna as well. Jeffrey said we could have boated the river, but from here it would be an upstream struggle with several rapids and dams between this point and Windhaven. I wish we had thought of taking a boat here. We still would have had to portage, but that would have been an awesome adventure. Everything looked brown to me, whether it was the ground or the chocolate milk water of the Tana River. With over 250 bird species and at least 50 species of mammals, Big Wham was in her glory. As a field assistant she knew every bird and animal in the forest, but she pointed out some rare creatures she had not seen in quite some time. The white-winged opalus is extremely rare, as are the African open-billed stork, martial eagle, bathawk, African pygmy falcon, African barred owlet, scaly babbler, black-bellied glossy starling, and golden pipit, none of which we came across unfortunately. Ian said, there are a lot of endangered or rare species today that used to be common in this area. We crossed the river to the eastern side of the reserve where Big Wham signaled elephants long before we were within sight of them. The African elephants there are the big tuskers, unlike the Indian elephants. Some of the elephants Wham pointed out had massive tusks almost reaching the ground when they were standing upright. They rolled in the sandy beach areas and strolled through the shallow river. Elephant babies seemed to be everywhere, and it was easy to spend a couple of hours just watching them wander by like they were elephants on parade. Big Wham spotted tree hyraxes and even a white-tailed mongoose for us. The black-fronted duiker, leopard and bongo all eluded her, but in all fairness the terrain was unsuitable for them. Big Wham scorned us. It sounds like we're bringing downtown Nairobi with us. I think we were making way too much noise to hope to stumble onto a leopard. Jeffrey found lots of giraffes, including a protected giraffe. When we saw a zebra herd, he said they were Grevy's zebra. As we moved closer to the river the terrain changed and there were buffalo, crocodiles, and hippos. We set up our camp far from the river in an elevated place to avoid nocturnal visits from hippos moving about on land. We were just 50 meters above sea level in this area of Kenya. The buffalo could also be aggressive, Wham warned us. The Tana River meandered back and forth, creating a narrow band of vegetation running to the coast. Wham had heard there was a small group of endangered Hirola antelope spotted in the reserve, and she said it would be such a coup for her book if she could see one. Her wishes were to no avail on that trip. The area was home to the Pocomo people who farmed the banks of the river, mainly using the oxbows to grow rice immediately adjacent to the water, and maize further back from the river. The people we met were the lower Pocomos, who live along the lower part of the Tana up to the delta. They believed the World Bank took this land away from them. The Pocomo tribe located on the lower Tana represent at least half of the tribe. I learned of this primate reserve because of the story of the two endangered monkeys. The World Bank was all for saving the primates, but the Pocomo viewed things differently than the World Bank. They felt that their ancestral land was being taken away from them and being given to the monkeys, so they took it back while they still could. I realized this tied into the Mangabe story, and that's why the World Bank subsequently pulled the funding of the projects in this area. It wasn't to put up a parking lot, but to put in rice fields. The more interactions we had with people, the more it became evident that the people we were running into on this trip were not quite as friendly as the Kikuyu we were familiar with. Big Wham told us there were disputes and disagreements between neighbors in this area, which makes people distrustful. Big Wham furrowed her brow and then said, ethnic clashes have flared up between the Pocomo farming community and the Orma people who are herders, so they're always looking for fresh grazing and require water access for their animals. I realized that it was not only the monkeys that were sending the Pocomo pendulums into a state of flux. Big Wham continued, the conflict led to a series of reprisal killings and attacks that left more than 150 people dead. My mouth dropped when she said 150 people were dead. I thought she would say 3 or 4 people were injured. We walked in silence for the next while. I feel like I'm always hearing about the animals we haven't seen, but people tend to forget the abundance we have seen and in such healthy groups. The elephants were obviously flourishing according to the locals. We didn't see any black rhinos during this trip because almost all of the population is on the other side of Kenya in Laikipia County. Wham was looking for specific species for her school record book. On this trip, Wham was able to add the rainbow skink to her reptiles and the black-headed lapwing to her bird category. The black-headed lapwing was a female, and Wham said she had to be able to find both a male and female of each species. They can look quite different, you know. She informed me. Wham's dedication to her collection was admirable. She even went out at night and was overjoyed when she came back to tell us she had found a Kenya coast galago that only comes out at night and is not found further inland where the land rises. A small-eared greater galago was also added to the list. She was so excited that she could now take pictures with her cell phone and save them to her book. It wasn't a matter of having proof for anyone, but more a question of the joy she had in collecting and being able to see them whenever she wanted. This was far better than the sports cards Dick collected when he was her age. Only the prospect of returning to Windhaven made our leaving the primate reserve bearable. It was a great trip with some wonderful tour guides that showed us stunning sights we replayed over and over in our minds on the trip back to Windhaven. We woke one morning shortly after getting back to camp with some extra excitement in the air. Today was the day we were going on Martin's balloon trip, so everyone scurried around to eat breakfast and get ready. Our trip to the airstrip was not as glorious as the first trip when we took the Silver Ghost. Ian had talked to Martin, who informed him the winds were just right and there was not a cloud in the sky. Martin prepared the 3 balloons Ian rented, and they were all wired for sound to allow communication between them. Martin had an operator in the balloons well versed with spotting the native wildlife. Cheesy, Jeffrey and I were in one balloon while Ian, Jay and Big Wham were in another. The final bucket contained Dick, Dr. Sue, and Sandy. We lifted off in the early morning sun and rose majestically into the wind. The occasional burst from the burner was the only sound punctuating the silence. The land unfolded below us as we rose higher and higher into the wind. The wind seemed to get stronger as we rose and changed direction from time to time. The direction of our flight path was wherever the wind wanted to guide us, and it was going to show us what it wanted us to see. Our altitude varied from treetop height to 100 meters above the landscape. The powerful whisper burners of the balloon would be kicked on when we got too low and disturbed the natural sounds rising from below. Towards the end of the flight, we were approaching the Windhaven estate. Ian said, I recognized this area. My father and Sir Malcolm used to spend time in this area capturing spider species for a doctor who was in one of the labs at the time. The land was becoming rockier and less sandy. Ian looked intently at the ground below, which was rockier than the surrounding area. Suddenly, I heard him over the intercom say, do you see that cave entrance down there? It's just past the clump of trees over towards the large mound of stone. Everyone scanned the landscape below, but the wind was blowing harder now, making us drift faster. Martin had to take us up because we had drifted too low. Unfortunately, nobody else saw the cave. Dotted between the scrub terrain, Big Wham spotted the heads of giraffes foraging from the top of trees, and even some elephants moving about their daily business. It was a wonderful experience that lasted over 2 hours until Cheesy asked, "How do we get back against the wind?" Martin replied that he had a ground crew following us who would take us back to the hangar and then pack up the balloons. Upon our return, we thanked Martin for the experience and headed back to Windhaven to plan our trip to Mount Kenya. Everyone was looking forward to the trip, and Cheesy said, "Perhaps Ngai will cast some lightning and pay us a visit." To that Dr. Emily replied, "I hope to be there when he does come." The next week was spent at Windhaven with everyone contributing to the various labs and doing what we could to further their efforts. Cheesy created some software solutions for Dr. Ben and Jeffrey. For Dr. Ben, he created software that would allow him to track the data from the fly traps by species and season. Next year allowed some tracking of infections if you can get data like the GPS location of each incident and whatever data you require. To which Dr. Ben replied, "This is going to help us a lot, Cheesy. Tracking the annual cycle should help develop a plan for prevention. In this world, lives can be saved." For Jeffrey and Big Wham, he created some internet software including a Windhaven homepage so they could publish their findings, images, and projects. Cheesy said, "People will eventually be linked with live access to the cameras. We could have 24/7 monitoring for poaching. That would make Kim happy. But we will have to get some new cameras and equipment before I can make that happen." Dick was spending a great deal of time with Dr. Sue and nobody bothered to ask what they were working on. It seemed unnecessary. I spent time with Sandy and Sir Malcolm making trips out to various locations on the estate to check infrastructure like well pumps and watering troughs. Sandy was a good worker and I worked hard to keep pace as we were heckled by Sir Malcolm, who regaled the abilities of the previous century British man versus us. It was an exciting morning the day we packed up the Land Rovers again, put together our touring party, and departed for Mount Kenya. Sir Malcolm and Kim stayed behind at Windhaven with Baby Goo. Jeffrey had been to Mount Kenya many times and climbed each route at least once. He suggested we take the Chogoria route and informed us, the Chogoria route has the most breathtaking ascent to the summit. The walk beside the gorge's valley is truly spectacular. Then he added, "At least that's what the internet will tell you, and that normally this route takes 7 days, but we can do better than that because everyone here is fit. The extra time can be spent at the summit or perhaps even making a side trip to the Giant's billiard table. That would be optimistic and based on the weather cooperating. And of course, Ngai as well." From Windhaven it was less than a 6-hour journey by Land Rover. We took the A3 road again, but this time in the opposite direction than on our trip to the Primate Reserve. This will be the route we will have to take when we return to Jomo Kenyatta Airport to depart, if we go by vehicle. Until we hit the B7 in this direction at Chuka, there were only a few butcher shops and supermarkets scattered along the route. We made our way through small towns to where the road took us to Embu, the largest town in the area. Big Wham told us, Embu served as the provincial capital of the former Eastern Province and currently serves as the headquarters of the Eastern region in Kenya. It's also the county headquarters of the Embu tribe. Winding through the beautiful countryside, we continued on the B6 to Ina and then on to Renyenjes. When the letters in the road names change from B to C or D, so does the quality of the road itself. We parked the Land Rovers and set up camp near the town of Chogoria. While we ate dinner, Jeffrey gave a talk on what to expect over the next few days on the Chogoria route. This route approaches from the east. We will start here at the gate near the village of Chogoria and then pass through another national park gate further up. We had to pay fees to make the journey as well as site costs for our overnight stays. I wondered if this applied to all Kenyans as well. I didn't think Jeffrey and his family should have been charged because it was a spiritual trip for the Kikuyu. Big Wham told us, "I haven't been up this route before, but I have heard it described as the most beautiful route on Mount Kenya. It's quite a bit longer unless we use the 4x4s to cut out the lower part. We'll miss a lot of animals at this altitude, but we've seen many of them at Windhaven." Jeffrey added, "Yes, that's true. I think we should pack up this camp and use the Land Rovers to get to Meru Bandas at 3,000 meters. Let's wait to pick a route because both tracks reconverge near the head of a spectacular amphitheater of cliffs known as the Temple. I thought the names of the geological features were very graphic and added to the mystique." Jeffrey told us, in the bottom of the gorge is Lake Michelson and at the west end, a large notch in the mountain where the Nithi River enters the lake. Cheesy asked how high we would be at that point and Jeffrey said it was about 4,300 meters. Jeffrey went on to say, "We begin to ascend from here as the path continues to rise up to Simba Tarn where it splits to head either north to Shipton's camp or south to an area where we plan to camp." Then he finished with, "We can follow the path around the mountain to observe it from all sides looking both up and down because the vistas are equally spectacular. They call the route, Round the Peaks." You will see the summits, glaciers and even some unique vegetation that only grows at this high altitude. And I thought, Ngai even has some special herbs and flowers in his malaria-free earthly abode. I asked Dr. Su, where do you see real change is going to occur in DNA and human cells? She replied, the cell cycle is about DNA replication, division, regeneration, and death. There are 4 distinct phases, G1, S, G2, and M that the cell must go through. In G the cells grow for 95% of the cycle. The proliferation of cells is instigated by progenitors and all cells start out in an identical form but can become anything. What a dream if you're a cell. But how do they know what the destiny is? And she quickly replied, oh, that's not destiny, they're told what to be. Cell signaling like induction can influence cells to be the type of cell they need to become. This allows cells of the same type to get together to form tissues, organs, and even complete bodily systems. I said, there must be a blueprint that someone or something is following. Well, if there is, she said, then the S phase is all about DNA replication, damage and repair. The M phase or mitosis is where the cell division portion of the cycle occurs. Mitosis is composed of many stages including prophase, metaphase, anaphase, telophase, and cytokinesis. But at this point all the DNA modifications are in place. The ultimate result of mitosis is the formation of 2 identical daughter cells, of course. We refreshed our drinks and pulled up beside the fire as Big Wham got ready to give us some background on Mount Kenya's flora and fauna. The rocks that form Mount Kenya are basalts, rhomb porphyrites, phonolites, kenites and trachytes. Kenite was first reported 100 years ago following a study of the geology of Mount Kenya. She said. Then she got to the flora found on Mount Kenya, which was her favorite area. Big Wham informed us, the plants vary from what you've seen because of the altitude. The plants are more specialized, with adaptations to strong sunlight with ultraviolet, lower mean temperatures and freezing night temperatures. This is an Afro-alpine zone, so plants have adapted or evolved to deal with the different environments. One adaptation is known as the giant rosette. We should look for giant senecio, giant lobelia or giant thistle. I love this plant because it uses bud leaves to protect its buds from freezing at night. She continued. Jeffrey jumped in and interjected, the majority of animals are lower down on the slopes where there is more vegetation, and the climate is less extreme. We would have seen monkeys, antelopes, tree hyraxes, porcupines and even larger animals like elephants and buffalo in the forest below. The Mount Kenya hyrax and common duiker are able to live at this altitude and some smaller mammals like the groove-toothed rat. He added. Big Wham went on to say. Several bird species live in the Afro-alpine zone, including sunbirds, alpine chats, starlings and even raptors like the auger buzzard, lammergeier and Verreaux's eagles. Then she added, birds are important at this altitude as pollinators because you don't have insects that can do it. Good point, I thought. The sights we saw along the journey were inspiring and we set up camp in some beautiful areas like Meru Bandas at 2,900 meters. At Roadhead we took the branch to Muji Hill and Lake Ellis where the vistas were simply stunning. I don't know if it was the electricity in the air or just too much sun, but the hairs on my head would tingle at the sight. The temple lured us in for an extra day so Cheesy and Dick could do some rock climbing. Jeffrey asked if he could join in, so the 3 of them set off up the cliff while the rest enjoyed the thrill of imagining we were in their place. Fortunately, that's as far as it went, and I was able to keep my feet on the ground. Later we found out that Dick had a camera in his helmet and we watched the entire climb. I still got vertigo even from the video. I stood mesmerized by the majesty of the sight as I looked down from the rim at Lake Michelson. The panoramic view as I scanned the cliff walls down one side and up the other side of the Nithi River was etched in my brain as I closed my eyes to save it. We went through Simba Tarn, then north to Shipton's campsite where we stayed our final day. Everyone was exhausted as we sat around the camp on the final night reflecting on the images we had etched in our minds over the past week and touching up our various wounds and injuries. As the evening fell, the clouds began to roll in and the wind picked up considerably. The leaves on the trees turned inside out as they do when an impending storm begins to rear its ugly side. A few drops of rain began to fall before we heard the thunder. I felt everyone was counting thousands just as I was to determine how far away it was. When the lightning finally cracked, I heard people yell, 5, and 6. I'm not sure who was right because I was too busy watching the sky crackle and flash as it electrified the area all down the valley. The hair on my arms was standing on end when Dr. Emily said, he's coming. We all waited as we watched the spectacular light show his entrance was making, but he never showed that night. Dr. Emily said, Ngai needs some encouragement to show himself, or we need some help to be able to see him. In the morning we packed up the camp and travelled back to where we had left the Land Rovers to begin our journey back to Windhaven. The ride home was always quieter than the trip there. All the last few days prior to departure, we gravitated to the labs that intrigued us the most. Cheesy spent a few days with Geoffrey and Sir Malcolm going over the camera setups, computers, and internet access, while Dick spent his time with Dr. Sue. To think he was getting a lesson in mosquito biology would be naive of me. The 10 years between them didn't seem to make a difference. Ian, Jay, Dr. Ben, and I talked about how he was planning to go forward with his sampling and building a profile of each of the malaria types and their structure. His project appealed to me, but at this stage much of what he was telling me was very complex and gave me a great thrust of motivation to begin my new educational journey. On the last night I found myself alone by the fire, as it seemed everyone else was otherwise occupied. I leaned back and looked up at the full moon in the crystal clear African sky. There were so many stars everywhere I almost felt in touch with them. I could count the craters on the visible side of the moon and only wondered what I can see on the other side. A shooting star flashed across the sky and brought my attention down to earth. The wind began to rustle, and the chimes began to chime. The wind picked up, and I thought for just a moment that I could hear voices in the wind as it rushed through the trees, and the chimes spoke to me. I went to sleep that night with the chimes singing me to sleep. The camp was already bustling when I dragged my bags to the loading area, with everyone else leaving that day. Dick, Cheesy and I were departing from Jomo Kenyatta Airport within a few hours of each other, so we were again honoured by Sir Malcolm's procession to Martin's airstrip. As we all loaded into the car for the trip, there were many subtle tears in the crowd and a few crestfallen looks in the car. Eyes began to look at the ground and faces pulled hands toward them. These were tears of suffering, but not the kind of suffering we'd learned about on this trip. Cheesy, Dick and I said goodbye at the airport, and I left Africa to go directly to the University of Oxford, check into my dorm and prepare to settle into the routine of school for the next 8 or 9 months. Oxford was a unique and historic institution, the oldest university in the English-speaking world. The roots of the school developed rapidly under Henry II, who banned English students from attending the University of Paris. My roommate was a Tasmanian fellow by the name of Errol Ashton. He was studying DNA to help find a solution for the endangered Tasmanian devil population in his country. It seemed the devils had developed something known as DFT, or devil facial tumors, which was a form of cancer that could be spread orally. It was unthinkable to me that cancer could spread that way, and it hit the heart of devil culture with a direct strike. Errol told me, devils always fight over their food and are absolutely vicious mates. Whenever they get the chance, they bite the other bugger in the face. He added that this leads to lots of cuts and scrapes, especially on their faces. They get infected by the disease. After a while the poor buggers can't eat and just die. Legs up, mate. According to Errol, 7 of the 8 DNA strains of the devil are infected and 1 is immune. If no solution is found, the populations in the wild will be a thing of the past. The government does have a site that holds animals with all 8 strains on a lifeboat reserve. That's great if they're planning a zoo. Errol grew up in Tasmania with his mother Mary in the capital Hobart. Mary worked at 2 jobs to help send Errol through school, and he worked hard to justify her efforts. During the day she was an accounting clerk at the local cannery, and then she would pick up a couple shifts a week at one of Hobart's taverns. Her brother Artis Armitage, a manager at the cannery, helped him out with some financial support, lived with them, and was an important part of their immediate family. Again, I was learning about families and what they meant to other people. It was still a foreign concept to me. It took all this effort to give Errol just enough money to pay tuition in this residence. What he had left for food for the month wouldn't have covered a single meal for roly-poly Prince Albert. I'm sure his humility and sense of fairness are why I liked Errol so much. He had a great work ethic, was not short on intelligence, always did his share of work, and knew how to live in close quarters with another person. Errol had a job at a local restaurant where he could also get food to feed himself and help stretch his money further. Our dormitory environment proved to be loud, smelly, and more than a bit unsavory after dark. The room was really small, the food available was crappy, and it rained constantly. It was not all chips and rice, as they were fond of saying in this area of the UK. When the situation became unbearable, I decided to buy a house that I could live in for the next 3 or 4 years and then sell. The amount of money I was paying for tuition at Oxford was far less than what I paid at Ridgeway. Errol knew what it took to run a house, from problems with air conditioners, appliances, or even painting and renovating. I knew none of that, having lived at boarding schools for all my life, so I made a deal with Errol. He agreed to teach me how to run a house in exchange for his board. This was a bonus for him because we got a refund on the dorm fees. Besides, Errol was part of my journey now, at least the learning journey. Errol and I found a house not too far from the school at a price I could afford. I had to contact Carl to get him to finance the house and do the paperwork. Carl got great terms and agreed with the buy-sell plan for my time at Oxford. There never seemed to be a problem with money. Ian was loving Canada and the city he was in. Even though he's working at an accelerated pace, he's found lots of time for cycling, his new passion. There are more than 100 kilometers of trails through the forest with only a couple of roads crossing him occasionally. The university is on the west side of Hamilton, close to the beautiful little town of Dundas in the middle of a conservation area. He says it's like being at home on one of his estates. Cheesy found lots of excitement on the eastern seaboard of the United States with trips to Atlantic City and some of the local casinos during his weekends and sojourns from school. The curriculum was to his liking, and he was excelling at all academic courses. According to him, it's only because the bumpkins and idiots posing as students can't keep up. One thing the nerds were good at was hacking the internet, and this appealed to Cheesy. To ingratiate himself to them, he rented a house for a week and ran parties with everything a starving nerd could desire. In return, they promised to teach him all of the tricks, traps, and secrets of the hacking world they possessed at the time. Dick was just Dick. West Point was now his life, and the US military situation around the world his focus. Although he was still a cadet, he was looking forward to becoming an officer and commanding other men. Step 1 was to dominate in the training, whether it was physical or mental. He was going to graduate on top. He was starting to identify his competition in each and every event like it was the decathlon. In a way it was because he only had one shot at this period in his life. This summer Dick arranged a trip to Southern California for us, traveling in twin 10-meter rolling buildings called RVs. Dick's family was in the process of setting up a business to take water from the ocean and put it into a lake in the desert. It was, of course, all hush-hush, and we were getting ground floor information. The Salton Sea was a salty lake in the desert 250 feet below sea level, and in 5 years it will be the hottest real estate on the planet outside of Dubai. The same pendulum can look very different to people who have different perspectives. Since Brunelleschi depicted the baptistry in Florence, people have known about perspective. The Americans saw themselves as the saviors of the world in the 20th century, but the rest of the world saw the pendulum of world opinion of the Americans be skewed negatively off equilibrium. Although it's been 100 years since the Civil War to end slavery, the battle for equality raged on through Rosa Parks, Dr. King, and so many more fighting for integration and basic human rights. But the pendulum continued to get pushed back from the draft and the Vietnam War that exponentially skewed numbers of black participants to white, and corresponding injuries to deaths. Access to education and jobs was seen to be a problem of opportunities, so affirmative action tried to force the pendulum back, but that simply discriminated against different people and resulted in higher resistance. Affirmative action continues today, with different groups of recipients receiving benefits and other groups being denied opportunities. It's never recognized as affirmative action except by those who are being discriminated against. American icons deemed heroes like Harry S. Truman cast a vastly different shadow depending on your perspective. His first act as president was to pardon William K. Hale, convicted for the attempted genocide of the Osage natives in Oklahoma. Was there Osage money in Harry's campaign chest? That should have set some pendulums in motion. Who in this world can appreciate nuclear bombs being dropped on cities of civilians, not once but twice? 4 years later, what Harry S. did became a war crime. Perhaps Americans didn't want other countries doing to them what they did to Japan. Or Lyndon B. Johnson, who escalated the Vietnam War, skewed the pendulum of draftee selection, and even covered up the Townsville Mutiny in Australia when black troops mutinied against abusive white officers. The only mutiny in US history. How about your perspective on Douglas MacArthur? He extracted billions of dollars in gold from the Japanese to fund the CIA under Harry S. Truman. The Japanese interrogations at the end of World War II were not open to the world as Nuremberg was. Perhaps that's why people can identify dozens of German supervillains, but only a few Hollywood versions of Japanese supervillains. Some pendulums continue to be in flux and require more perspectives like Dr. King's to provide pushback if it's ever to reach equilibrium again. Chapter 4: Spring of Hope for the Salton Sea. As always on our summer trips, the arriving person simply dials a number, and someone picks them up. It's a great system, especially for me, because I just pick up the phone and wait. Today I had to wait about an hour for Cheesy to arrive from New York before making the call, so I grabbed a few American dollars out of an ATM and bought a coffee in Danish. The sun was shining brightly on a beautiful San Diego day, so I was enticed outside by a bench with a view. Having finished my Danish and still enjoying my coffee, I was basking in the sun when a scruffily dressed man in a suit that had had more owners than the Los Angeles Rams approached me for a handout. Considering the suit and the smell, I searched around my pockets and pulled out a few American coins I had received in change. I was able to drop them in his hand without touching him. With funds in hand, I thought he would be anxious to invest them in whatever his pleasure was. Giving him money might not have been the best thing to do, but it was too late to change my mind. Buoyed by his success, he sat down on the bench beside me, stretched out his legs and arms and settled in to try to extend his winning streak. Doyle Brunson began his run of me. He asked me, "Where in the world you from, Sonny?" I try not to be rude to anyone, so I replied what my nationality was rather than where I currently lived. He seemed to be aroused when I replied, "Canadian, not Canada." I didn't know what else to say because I had never really lived in a place that I called home. The conversation turned to the condition of his back, and he began to relate a story to me about how he hurt his back, what he does to get relief and how he needs surgery to fix it. I asked him, "Are you afraid of the surgery?" And he replied, "That kind of surgery costs more money than I'll ever see. There ain't nothing to be afraid of if it ain't happening." I could see his dilemma because in this part of the world you had to pay for surgery like that whether it's life-threatening or not. Even if you have coverage, there are usually co-payments that are ridiculously large themselves. He didn't look like he was gainfully employed. Upon conveying my sympathy for him and to him, he suggested, "If you're really sorry, you can help. You're Canadian, ain't you?" I said, "I don't follow," to which he replied, "You give me your health card so I can go up to Canada and get the surgery for free. How about that? It won't cost you a red cent. I'll mail the card back to you as soon as I get better." Although his plight was sad, there really was nothing I could do for him because he was not getting my health card. I gave him all of the American money I had, which was not very much, and wished him well on his quest for better health. It was hard not to chuckle at such a ridiculous suggestion or his ingenuity. I'm not really sure if he was in ill health or if he just wanted a hospital hotel for a brief respite from his exciting life. Cheesy had arrived by this time and made it through customs. He found me outside on my bench. This time it was Dick that made the plans, so he answered the call when we phoned him. By the time the taxi came, my vagrant friend had also acquired a sandwich, a bag of pretzels and at least 2 more donations, including one from Cheesy. Cheesy and I had asked if Marius and Marian could come along with us on this trip. Dick said, "I don't have any objection, Ian can't come due to family commitments, and we have tons of room. The 4 of you take one of the RVs and the boys and I will take the other one and squeeze Sandy in with us. We're going to be in a convoy anyway." We met up with Dick and his buddies outside a San Diego storage yard where the RVs were parked. Dick introduced us to 3 of his West Point cadet buddies, Lance, Rick, and Rowdy. The Cell-Traded brothers, Marius and Marian, were already there, and it seemed like the party was underway by the time we arrived. Sandy came out of the RV and waved, "Hi," to everyone. Dick had asked him if he wanted to come, and Sir Malcolm told him to come on this trip rather than go to Windhaven to update him, so Sandy eagerly jumped on a plane. Lance Alberton hailed from Colorado, where both of his parents were politicians. Dick told us he had Lance on all of his sports teams, especially the full-contact sports, because he was a rock and over 6 feet 4 inches. Lance wasn't particularly agile, nor did he have great manual dexterity, but he could scale a cliff like a monkey scaling a tree. They met at West Point. Rick Dawson was one of Dick's only friends from childhood. They grew up in the same area of town and their fathers were politicians. Rick's father was not as successful as Dick's, so he stayed at home to attend school, and Dick went to Scotland. When Dick came home from school for a break, it was Rick he called first. Rowdy Masterton was named after a TV character from the 50s by the name of Rowdy Yates, played by Clint Eastwood. Apparently, his mother was a big fan of a show called Rawhide. Rowdy's hobby was archaeology. He liked rock climbing and looking for ancient artifacts, especially in the southwest, because he believed that's where the most evidence should be. Glaciers didn't reach down this far, or at least scrape back all of the evidence when they left. Think about all of the ancient sites in the world, and they're mainly around the equator. I added, archaeologists are always looking for evidence of people on the coast, but they fail to realize that 10,000 years ago the coast isn't where it is today. The oceans were hundreds of feet lower, so the coastline was much further out to sea. You could walk from London to Paris in those days if they existed then. If you asked your fellow caveman for directions, he might say, "Been there. Cross Doggerland. Head north to the river. Turn right. Can't miss it. Tell them Grog sent you." I get points. We spent the rest of the day familiarizing ourselves with the vehicles and getting to know each other. Cheesy was going to drive our vehicle, so he got a thorough lesson from Dick on its operation, while the rest of us got our stuff stashed away. The sleeping arrangements were made and food Dick had brought for us was stashed away. There will be lots of places for us to get food on this trip, he told us. This is California. We settled down around a blazing fire to have a few American beers and listen to Dick's outline of the plan for the next few weeks. The place we're going to on this trip is a lake known as the Salton Sea. Lake wouldn't do it justice, and that's why they call it the sea. It's a shallow sea at about 13 meters deep at the moment, landlocked with no outflow and no permanent source of inflow other than highly fertilized runoff from the Imperial Valley. That type of lake is known as a terminal lake. Terminal lakes have a buildup of salts, and in fact they reach very high concentration. The entire area is on the San Andreas Fault as part of a geological feature known as the Salton Trough. Dick told us as he flipped through a presentation he had made on his laptop. The Salton Trough stretches all the way from the Salton Sea to the Gulf of California in Mexico. The total trip is just over 200 kilometers. Before the trough gets to the Salton Sea, it runs into another of these types of lakes called Laguna Salada. The Laguna Salada only fills from rainwater and then evaporates. It's still in the trough but on the Mexican side of the border near a town called Mexicali. If you visit Mexicali, you might not notice Laguna Salada because it's a dry lake until nature fills it. Cheesy asked, "Why are these lakes so unusual?" And Dick replied, "The Salton Sea is 250 feet below sea level at its deepest and is at the other end of the trough from the Gulf. The Laguna Salada is only 50 and lies in between. It's in the Sonora Desert, and all this area is like a big trench that runs between the higher elevations. In fact, it runs from the ocean on the Gulf of California to the Salton Sea." Lance furrowed his brow and said, "Is the Salton Sea just slow in evaporating? Or is there that much more water?" Dick answered, "No, over millions of years, the Colorado River flowed into the Imperial Valley and deposited alluvium soil, making fertile farmland, raising the terrain, and meandering its main river delta as silt piled up on its way to the Gulf of California." He added, "Remind me to tell you the story of how the Grand Canyon formed. It's quite interesting, but suffice it to say the Colorado River carries a lot of soil with it." He went on to add, "For thousands of years, the river has alternately flowed into and out of the valley, creating a freshwater lake. Eventually the lake becomes salty or evaporates, totally leaving a dry desert. This area is at the whim of the river flows and the balance between inflow and evaporative processes. If left to its own devices, the Colorado River would eventually continue on to the Gulf of California." Rowdy said, "I checked out this area when you told me where we were going, and apparently there are hundreds of archaeological sites found around the Salton Sea. People lived there during times of boom, building long-term settlements that could have lasted 100 years or more depending on the condition of the sea. When you look around the world, the Mexicans have the Maya and Aztec ruins. South America has Sacsayhuaman, Chan Chan, Tiahuanaco, Machu Picchu, India has Mohenjo-Daro, Dwarka, Turkey has Göbekli Tepe, and North America has Diddley Squat." He went on to say, "We just don't have any ancient sites in North America except rumors of the mound builders. What was going on here while the rest of the world was developing? I don't think it was vacant and just waiting for new tenants." Everyone agreed with him and tossed in all kinds of ancient sites around the world going back to the last ice advance. Dick wanted to get back on topic, so he interjected, "At the start of the 1900s, an irrigation canal was dug from the Colorado River to the old Alamo River channel to provide water to the Imperial Valley for farming. A buildup of silt plugged the headgates, so cuts were made in the bank of the Colorado River to increase water flow. In the spring, the floods broke through those cuts and the river flowed into the Salton Basin. It took 2 years and a massive railway disaster before repairs were completed by both the government and the railroad. The Salton Sea rose from the dry bed to make a massively huge body of water they had to call a sea. It was filled with fresh water and fish from the last 2 years of the total flow of the Colorado River. The formerly dry lake bed was 20 by 50 kilometers or 1,000 square kilometers in size. It would have dried up eventually, but farmers in the Imperial Valley used too much water in irrigation and they let the excess fertilized water flow into the lake. Lance jumped in, "I'm from Colorado and it pisses me off that 100% of the water from the Colorado is siphoned off by the states who claim ownership along the way. I think they call it water apportionment. By the time the river gets to this point, it's the big demand of cities like San Diego and Los Angeles, who can't quench their thirst and have to squeeze out the last drop." Rick commented, "It's just a river, why couldn't they stop it? It's not even that big by the time it reaches this point, like Lance said." Dick continued, "The Southern Pacific Railroad tried to stop the flooding by dumping earth into the canal's headgates area, but they were too slow. The river eroded deeper and deeper, cutting into the dry desert sand of the Imperial Valley. A waterfall formed as a result of the erosion, and it began cutting rapidly upstream along the path of the Alamo Canal. The waterfall was initially 5 meters high, but as it raced along the canal it grew in depth to 20 meters high. Holy Christ, that's amazing. The power of nature, eh?" I gasped. Dick went on to say, They feared the waterfall would continue to recede upstream to the true main path of the Colorado, where it could become 30 to 90 meters high. That would be impossible to stop. The basin filled, and the town of Sultan, a Southern Pacific Railroad siding, and the Torres Martinez Native American Land Reserve were all submerged. Part of the tribe's reservation exists at the northern end of the lake. Palm Springs or Palm Desert, not bad addresses. Rick added. Marius quipped, "That's quite a story, Dick, but just a history lesson to this point." To which Dick replied, "Oh, it gets better, my Moldavian friend, way better. After we finish here, we'll watch some videos on YouTube that will knock your socks off." In the 1950s and 60s, the area of the Salton Sea became a resort destination. Communities grew with hotels and vacation homes. Movie stars came to play here, championship fishing tournaments were held as well as water skiing and boat racing. It was the place to be seen. Quote, "Some of the biggest celebrities in American show business like Frank Sinatra, Bing Crosby, Jerry Lewis, the Beach Boys, and the Marx Brothers. They named the area the Salton Riviera, and it even rivaled nearby Palm Springs. The North Shore Beach and Yacht Club opened as the largest marina in Southern California. That's our kind of place, Marion." Marius shouted. Cheesy said, "It sounds like it's made for us. Another Riviera," and I had to agree. A developer by the name of Penn Phillips led a speculative boom in the late 1950s, buying and selling thousands of acres on the lake's western shores. That's where we're going because he abandoned Salton City without explanation in 1960. Phillips left behind houses, sewers, roads and even street signs. In 1976 and 1977, tropical storms destroyed marinas and resorts that were in economic decline. Environmental catastrophes, rising salinity and a receding shoreline pushed the tourism pendulum past its pivot. For years after that, the Imperial Valley farms kept pumping contaminated farm runoff into it, and that promoted an outbreak and spread of diseases. Die-offs of the avian populations occurred, and after the loss of several species of fish, on which the birds depended, 2 more pendulums flipped their pivots. Salinity rose so high that large fish kills occurred, filling the beaches with their rotting carcasses. I thought, that's going to put me off fish and chips when I get back to Oxford. The lake continued to shrink as local agriculture used water and pesticides more efficiently and less runoff flowed into the lake. Today, the center of all that activity in the 60s, Bombay Beach, doubles to about 500 people during the winter months. It's far too hot for people in the summer. Marius said, that must give the area a real apocalyptic feel. Utility poles and trailer debris rearing their ugly heads. Dick added, if the lake goes totally dry and the lake bed becomes exposed to wind patterns, they can send toxic dust clouds into the Los Angeles area. People in Los Angeles sometimes smell an odor coming from the Salton Sea and all of the dead fish. LA is not all that far away as the wind blows. Dick tried to get back on topic and said, getting back to the geology, the lake occupies the lowest elevations of the trough, known as the Salton Sink, and the lake surface is 70 meters below sea level at the deep end of the trough. The deepest point of the lake is only 1.5 meters less than the lowest point of Death Valley, which isn't far from the Salton Sea either. My dad and grandfather are putting together a plan to build a canal from the Gulf of California through the Laguna Salada into another canal that ends up in the Salton Sea. That's not a new concept. People have been suggesting this type of solution for years, but the cost and the border crossing have stymied the project. There just couldn't be a deal with Mexico as long as Arnold Stump was in power. After Stump, cooler heads will prevail and the opportunity to earn such a fortune will not go unnoticed by these politicians. They like to feather their own beds. After all, what politician is not motivated by self-interest and prone to hypocrisy? Grandfather knows he will get acceptance, and to be honest, there aren't many people who would have the balls to let him down. They know they will get acceptance whenever they want because they have the connections. Sandy added, if everyone knew about this plan, we would not be having this opportunity first and would be lucky to be able to buy a modest home here in 20 years. Inside information is not just for the stock market, although that's where you hear about it most. At least those who are caught. This is inside information. Dick replied, I don't like to think of it that way. I look at it as a speculative investment. I replied, it's only speculation if you're speculating. We aren't, are we? Cheesy interjected, is it speculation if you know the outcome of the horse race or sporting event? Things can always go wrong to make sure things fail. Is it a sure thing then? This threw everyone into confusion and a short discussion followed that eventually went nowhere. In the end, Cheesy was right, nothing is a sure thing. There's risk in everything. Dick got everyone's attention and said, let's assume for a minute that grandfather's people come though, and the Mexican politicians get the plan started with the canal that runs from the Gulf of California to the border. At the border we continue on through Trump's wall and bring the canal into the United States. That's when Dad and Grandfather used their California politicians and some federal politicians to reach the Salton Sea. There is a huge amount of back-scratching going on, but there is nothing illegal, only trillions of dollars of real estate. Dick let that settle in and then continued, the benefit to the Mexicans, beyond the sale of land and the construction fees they will earn, will be the ability to cultivate parts of the Sonoran Desert that have never been cultivated before. We'll be driving through the Imperial Valley later on this trip. It was a desert before it was reclaimed by irrigation, and you'll see what it can look like after irrigation. On the American side, they plan to create a berm around the outside of the Salton Sea so they can raise the depth and protect whatever is below sea level. It will provide protection for the Imperial Valley as well as open up another area for development behind the berm. The top of the berm will have a 40-foot wide pedestrian biking path that will circumnavigate the entire Salton Sea and bring massive tourism to the area, especially if it links up well with Palm Desert and Palm Springs. They're planning to call it the Sonny Bono Salton Sea Walkway to garner some support from local as well as state politicians. Sonny Bono was a previous mayor of Palm Springs, member of the U.S. House of Representatives, and had a special connection with the Salton Sea. There is a fund of more than $500 million to benefit the Salton Sea in his name. This deal is probably already bartered, I would think. There will be access to the pathway from the first row of properties that back onto the berm, and those are the ones I think we want. Then you have to cross Highway 111 for tons of desert real estate and further out into the desert on the eastern shore. Marion asked, do you know of any casinos close by? Or if California has gambling like Nevada, which is so close to here? And Dick replied, yeah, I think I saw one on the map my granddad showed me, but it looked like it was doing most of its business from the cemetery next door. It's on the western shore, I think. The cell-traded boys loved to hear that and started checking the web for more information. Let's get Carl and Ian on speakerphones to review the business deal, Dick said as he dialed Carl and set up the call on his laptop, then connected to Ian for us all to see. After the greetings, Carl said, as a group you're investing a fixed sum of American dollars for shares in a company that will acquire land in the Salton Sea area of California. It'll be an American incorporated private company. So if you want out, you will have to sell your shares to someone else at a price you negotiate. He answered a couple of minor confusions and then continued. Ian decided it's not proper for him to join the group, so he donated his funds to the Windhaven Labs plc, and that corporation invested in this project. I am happy to say Sir Malcolm decided to match Ian's offer, so the labs actually have 2 shares. The projects at Windhaven will benefit if a profit is made. Everyone who had been to Africa with Ian last summer sent up a rousing cheer and explained the deal to the others. DR's Ben, Sue and Emily should be excited by the news. Carl went on to say, the 3 of you each have a share, and Lance, Rick and Rowdy are sharing 1 share between them, Sandy has 1 and the Jacks have 2. The 10th share will be purchased by me. I will be joining you in this venture, as you are all aware. Cheesy asked, how much land do you think we can buy with our total investment? Carl replied, I've been looking at local real estate prices, commissions, etc. So I know the costs, but the bottom line is the actual sites you pick are going to be what affects the price. I'll be in contact with you gentlemen every day, so I'll let you know when you are running out of investment cash based on how effectively I can arrange terms with local agents. Consider this, if the land you're looking at is just raw desert, then you can buy an acre of it or buy a ticket to a regular season San Diego Chargers football game. Carl and Ian signed off and we sat around chatting with each other and finishing off another case of American beer. By the time the last of us drifted off to bed that night, a faint flicker of dawn was rising over the desert. Eventually we rolled out of bed mid-morning and migrated back around the fire pit with our various breakfast selections and extra-large coffees. Most of the guys spent some time this morning combing the internet for information about the area. Some information was just facts or trivia, while other information was more intriguing. The Laguna Salada is Spanish for salty lagoon, and it lies 10 meters below sea level in the Sonoran Desert of Baja California, which is Mexico. Someone said, it's also notorious for dust storms when it's dry. The thunderstorms in the summer whip up clouds. It only takes a big rainfall to fill the lagoon, which is approximately 60 kilometers long and 17 kilometers at its widest point. Cheesy pointed out, Dick said his dad was going to deepen it. For boat traffic to go through the canals and reach the sink is going to require considerable depth. I wonder how big of a boat they're planning to accommodate, and how wide is the canal going to be? Can you imagine cruise ships? Dick interjected, yeah, the plan is to lower it considerably because the surface of the sink is much lower. As long as we can empty the canal into the sink, that would be the upper limit of the Salton Sea, which should be below sea level by 20 or 30 meters, give or take a tide. We couldn't have boat traffic because the whole route's not level. I don't know the whole plan like Dad and Grandfather, and I'm not privy to everything. There are no locks planned as far as I know, but until the Salton Sea fills, the last step will be quite a drop. Hopefully not a waterfall. I don't know how long it's going to take to fill the sink. It could be a year. I asked Dick if the funding for his dad's canal project was in place, and he replied, my dad said he could fund it himself with less money than my sister's third wedding cost him. And everyone laughed. The lake is linked to the San Andreas Fault, and the East Pacific Rise as part of the Laguna Salada Fault. The lowest part is called a graben, and the Salton Sink is another graben. Rowdy said. There's a lot of geological action in this area. I hope it's stable enough. Cheesy added, did anyone else read the article about the water transfer agreement with San Diego? According to that article, there is 40% less water flowing into the Salton Sea now, and that will force it to lose as much as half its water. They say in 20 years its waters will be 5 times as salty as the Pacific Ocean, killing whatever fish still live there and scattering the birds that feed on them. I can't see how they can turn down your father's plan if for no other reason than to avoid this ecological disaster. That disaster would start a lot of pendulums swinging in California and probably all across the American South and Mexico. Rowdy added, we think of lakes as permanent landmarks, but farming, irrigation and our constant thirst threaten these resources around the world. Terminal lakes like the Salton Sea, with no natural drain, are particularly vulnerable to human greed and incompetence. There are several of these types of lakes around the world. Iran's Lake Urmia shrunk by almost 90% in 30 years, Africa's Lake Chad is 90% smaller today than it was 50 years ago, and Kazakhstan's Aral Sea has been practically wiped off the map. These were all disasters that affected those who could least afford to be affected. Great human hardship followed these types of events. Can we prevent that? Rick added, there are so many reasons to preserve these places for the human life they support, the avian flyways they connect to, the fish populations to feed humans, and the irrigated land to produce more food. If they aren't maintained, then windstorms will create caustic dust storms from the playa at the bottom of the lakes, and on such a huge scale they'll do more damage than Chernobyl. I like this plan, Dick. I'm all in. We all agreed and joined in with, let's get started. I thought to myself, do massive good, don't harm others in doing it. This must be part of my epiphany. Am I hurting anyone? We piled into our respective RVs once they were packed up and secure, then headed south to the Gulf of California. Dick thought our journey should follow the water, so we had best get to where the water was coming from to begin our journey. At Tecate, we crossed the Mexican border and could have taken either Highway 3 to the main route through Mexico or Highway 20 and hook up with Highway 5 to travel down the Baja Peninsula until we got a view of the Gulf of California. This route took us past Mexicali on the way, so we knew we would be able to view the Laguna Salada twice as we went to the coast and back. It took less than 2 hours to get to Mexicali, and as we drove south, we could look across at the Laguna Salada. As Dick had predicted, there was really nothing to see. Laguna Salada's cupboards were bare. The only difference between the trough and the rest of the desert was scrub brush and bushes, but, in the trough, it was barren. I guess it would return to the desert if it dried out and all the playa was blown away. A couple hours along Highway 5 gave us our first views of the Gulf of California. This water was going to flow from here to the Salton Sink. Rowdy stuck his head out the window and yelled, next time we're taking a boat. The area around the Gulf was desert, totally devoid of people and animals at that time of day due to the heat. I wondered why they didn't try to desalinate the water and irrigate this part of the desert right next to the Gulf. Maybe it's a cultural thing and they're fishermen this close to such an abundant supply. Maybe there was no money for any infrastructure. Perhaps I'll understand more about this part of the world as the journey goes on. This world is different from my world in so many ways. We reached San Felipe, a town on the Gulf of California in the Mexican state of Baja California. At that point we were 190 kilometers south of the United States border and in the greater municipality of Mexicali. It wasn't difficult to find a place to hook up the RVs within walking distance to the Gulf. San Felipe was a small town with less than 20,000 people, but could add another 5,000 when the Americans invade the area during spring break and Memorial Day. Dick told us, the Bay of San Felipe is only 3 meters above sea level. At low tide, the water can recede as much as 2 kilometers. They have one of the largest tidal bores in the world, partly because of the Colorado River Delta to the north. The 7-meter tides expose a kilometer of ocean floor. This is where the water from the Colorado River goes when it's not flooding the Salton Sea. Some of the opposing plans to my grandfather's canal were to redirect what's left of the Colorado rather than let it flow here, or pump ocean water over the mountains from Los Angeles. Cheesy added, the first European to arrive in Baja California was Hernán Cortés almost 500 years ago. Is that bad luck or what? Imagine watching his arrival as a horror movie and screaming, don't answer the door, turn out the light. You know what's coming, and that sent a shiver up my spine. We took a day to visit the Valley of the Giants. To get there we rented sand buggies and 4-wheelers. The giants are huge tree-sized cactuses known as saguaro. They're amazing saguaros trees which tower almost 18 meters and are said to live to over 150 years. Everyone had to get a picture standing next to one for perspective. Dick said we should take a day to try some deep-sea fishing in the Gulf because this type of fishing will be available when the Salton Sea floods. Commercial species in the Gulf include shrimp, sardine and giant squid, which creates an important sport fishing industry for billfish and tuna. There's an abundance of sea life in this area, including some of the biggest whales on the planet. Lance wanted to latch into one of the marlin family, striped marlin Tetrapterus audax, blue marlin Machaira nigricans, or black marlin Machaira indica. I don't care which one, but one of these marlins of a significant size will be stuffed and stuck on my den wall someday. Settle down, Hemingway, what other kind of fish can we catch here? Cheesy asked. I told them I had read on the internet, you can catch mahi-mahi coryphena hipparus, which are very tasty, or yellowfin tuna Thunus albicans, which make great tuna steaks. Other, less desirable species from my perspective were wahoo, Acanthocybium salandri, yellowtail, Seriola lalandi, amberjack, Seriola riveliana, and roosterfish, Nematosteus pectoralis. Rowdy added, if you want to sit in the boat and fish for bottom feeders, there are lots of snappers, groupers and triggerfish. When the time came to go on the expedition, Dick, Lance, Rowdy, Rick and Cheesy decided to go while Sandy, Rick and I remained and explored the local town. Lance didn't get his big marlin, but they did get some excellent tuna that we cooked on an open fire that night. Mexican beer was a perfect complement to the seafood buffet we had. The next day we headed back through Mexicali on our way to Highway 111 in the United States and crossed the border at Calexico. Once on the American side of the border, we picked up Highway 111 again, but it was called the Imperial Valley Pioneers Expressway by the locals. Squares and rectangles of crops as far as the eye could see were only broken by the occasional storage unit for rent or were RV parking areas. We passed through El Centro and eventually made our way to Brawley, where we pulled into a mall parking lot to stretch our legs. The population of Brawley was about 25,000 citizens who were needed to support the cattle and feed industry, so they hosted the annual cattle call rodeo. Lance told us. We all agreed to have a Jack in the Box burger because we'd been watching their commercials on the internet and having a great laugh, mostly at the Jack's expense. This was the first time I'd been inside one, and unfortunately, I didn't encounter a breakfast ferry or get to bungee jump with Jack. I did, however, get to have a sirloin steak melt with the one-eyed Jacks. Cheesy and I had thousands of promotional opportunities for the Jacks with the Jack in the Box Corporation. I would outline one of mine ending with the Jacks saving Jack in the Box's life while keeping the recipe safe, and then Cheesy would outline one where the three of them fight a supervillain trying to steal a child's meal. The Jacks took it in good stride and eventually bought into the scenarios and contributed a few of their own. In their stories, Jack in the Box usually gets his ass kicked before they save him. Going through Brawley showed us what desert looks like when you irrigate and plant crops. For most people this is a better use of land than being 3S, as Dick calls it, snakes, scorpions, and sand. A quick stop at the local Walmart to acquire items Dick needed for the RVs also garnered us a few groceries, some tarps, and beverages. Rick picked up a couple solar-powered fans. These are freaking awesome. You only need the fan when the sun is out. These don't even need batteries to store power. We continued on Highway 111 to Calipatria, just 20 miles north of El Centro, with a population of about 7,000 citizens, which included 4,000 inmates at the Calipatria State Prison. At W. Sinclair Road we took a short side trip to the Sonny Bono Bird Sanctuary just because we had been talking about Sonny the night before and his name was going to finance some of the new development. At the end of the road, just past a small building, we caught our first glimpse of the Salton Sea. It was visually quite nice from that perspective, but it had a peculiar odor that made us look like we were posing for Ian's family portrait. Nyland was the closest town to a place known as Slab City. After World War II, the Marine Corps Camp Dunlap training facility was torn down to the concrete slabs that were the floors of the huts. It was left abandoned by the government, and eventually homeless Vietnam vets gravitated to the area. The government didn't bother to remove them and in fact turned a blind eye. More people joined them over time from all parts of the United States and the community grew. It was called the last free place in America. And it just may be that if your view of freedom is not paying taxes or breaking laws you don't like, or having the opportunity to consume massive quantities of the drug of your choice. Are these things synonymous with freedom? I guess it depends on your perspective of freedom. Anyone can go and squat in Slab City. Throw a row of rocks around the area you want to claim, put your stuff inside and then defend your turf if your neighbors get pissed off at you and decide to burn you out. Creative areas have grown up within the community, such as East Jesus, Dark Side, Camp No Filter, the Bike Shop, the hostel, the range and so on, where like-minded people group together and offer each other some minimal level of security. Salvation Mountain, not part of Slab City, was visible on the road to Slab City. Call it a mountain covered in paint and decorated with Christian symbols and slogans and you would have nailed it. This was the work of one man until he died a decade prior to the time we visited, and is now survived by dedicated volunteers. We decided to come back and take a look at Slab City if we had the time or interest, but for now, we continued on Highway 111. We headed towards Bombay Beach on the eastern shore looking for our first choice pieces of real estate. Sandy was explaining the layout of the sea and where we might consider buying our properties. Firstly, we should look along the eastern shore in the Bombay Beach area because in the videos I watched of the 60s, this seemed to be the center of the Salton Sea entertainment world. I'm concerned about the elevation though. I think with the berm running all around the sea, we should look at some places on the western shore in Salton City where some infrastructure has been built, the casino area and the beach club area, although again the elevation may be an issue. Dick noted, the northern shore is primarily what's left of the reservation and is protected land, so we can ignore most of that. That's the area that leads to Palm Desert and Palm Springs, so Highway 111 may offer some good opportunities. The southern shore is in the Imperial Valley and the sunny Bono Bird Sanctuary. Sandy added, I'm looking forward to walking along the berm through the bird sanctuary on a bright sunny day. I had a dream last night that I was enjoying a meditation on the berm with the sun overhead, the bird sanctuary behind me and the vast Salton Sea blowing a salty breeze on my face. Dick, I could see you there too. And Dick replied immediately, I'll have me some of that. Traveling along the eastern shore, all of the area to the right of the road was desert stretching to a canal and beyond to the steep cliffs. There was about 6 kilometers of sloping land that elevated to craggy rock formations that jutted out from the ground like a wall. These types of areas are where Palm Springs and Palm Desert are built, deep into the canyons. I said to Lance, these craggy structures would make great rock climbing places if you lived here, eh? And he readily agreed. Walk out your back door and have those to climb. Awesome. Dick's 3 friends used the word awesome anytime and every time something was better than mediocre. I wondered what adjective they would use if they ever saw one of the One-Eyed Jack's performances. We passed the Nyland Marina Road which led down to the sea, but was mostly barren and available real estate. Cheesy made a left at Pope, the next turn which would take us down to the Bombay Beach area. Bombay Beach was a rectangle of streets at the edge of the sea. Currently our understanding was that this should be the hot spot on the Salton Sea, although others may consider the western shore the better opportunity and build there. We're getting the first look at the area and have to look at it like urban planners as well as urban entrepreneurs because we can't buy it all regardless of how inexpensive it was. The American investors may go to the western shore for the casino and beach club. When I mentioned that to Marius he said, you're right, so bring the casino over to Bombay or wherever we are. To which I replied, you've been doing your homework. He and Marion had called Uncle Sandu and had him look into gaming licenses in California and Nevada. In addition, Uncle Sandu was looking into the company that owns the casino. And yes, I did ask him if it could be moved if it were purchased. Quote, Marion said, we have to make the east side better than the west side if this is where we decide to invest. He said to invest, but I think he was almost going to say live there. Looking back toward the Imperial Valley, only barren desert was left to block our view. I began to consider larger cities that had already developed. They develop in a method that suits the people that live there and what the climate is best for. We have the advantage of knowing about the berm, but there are so many other factors. Marius informed us, what you need my friend is retrospect. How many times have you heard people say I wish I knew what I know now then? And we all replied, for sure, to which Cheesy added, déjà vu man. Marius said, the problem with retrospect is that when you are employing it, you must take a leap of faith and believe you have it. Sandy added, the tomorrow you worried about yesterday is today. A look was exchanged between the cell-tradeds and Sandy that both Cheesy and I noticed, but said nothing as Marius continued, yes, very much so. At any rate, if you could close your eyes and look down on the Salton Sea 50 years from now, what would it look like? Marion added, that's where it will go after everyone gets through pushing it in the direction they want it to go. The Salton Sea pendulum has already begun swinging just by our being here. Sandy noted, too far in the future and there may be nothing here to see. A wasted journey or a warning. And I added, this may be a coastline to the Pacific if Senior San Andres finds fault with what happens here. Cheesy asked, computers are about logic and my computer wants to know how you can avoid the principle of causality that says an effect cannot occur before its cause. Marius noted, since ancient times, precognition has been associated with trance and dream states, one voluntary, one involuntary. You know our sister Dala. She can use skills of prophecy, fortune-telling, second sight, and waking premonitions to entertain our circus clients. Cheesy said, sometimes instances of the future appear in your dreams. Perhaps Cthulhu has been talking to Ngai and sending us messages from our ancestors. I guess that's only for Kikuyu or perhaps just someone with enough vital force. I added, Aristotle believed most so-called prophetic dreams were mere coincidences. He said that if you were receiving messages in your dreams, it was more likely you were reaching forward rather than reaching back. I think he was just pissed off after a bad night at the roulette table. Marius recalled a book from home and recanted the story to us. I read a book from our library that was published by a missionary named Friar P. Boylat in the late 1800s, but I'm not sure where his travels took him. Boylat asked an unspoken question to an African witch doctor he mistrusted, and the witch doctor gave him the correct answer without ever having heard the question. I said, information passing backwards in time needs to be carried by physical particles going back in time. High-energy physics says that can't happen, to which Marius replied, do you still need a telephone wire to make a phone call? Another epiphany, I thought. Future sight travels on the ether or vital force. If you see the future, how could you change it? Would it spoil the journey? Precognition contradicts most neuroscience from electrophysiology to neuroimaging. New discoveries like quantum retrocausality might suggest a possible mechanism for recognition. I thought perhaps this would be something Drive Emily might be interested in. Marion added, our sisters Krista and Magna have trained to conjure up false memories of visions that occurred before the actual event, plant thoughts so that people think it was their idea or do a little after the fact matchmaking. If you plant the idea and wait long enough, they will make it a self-fulfilling prophecy. Sometimes it requires a smell to accompany the suggestion. The girls are also trained in hypnotic effects, so their idea can quickly become your idea. If you ever meet our sisters, I will have to teach you how to block hypnosis or they may have their way with you. Sandy said, sages from the past like Nostradamus benefit from self-fulfilling prophecies, because most of his predictions need some supporting nudges. A ruler born near Italy. Could be Napoleon, Ferdinand II, Hitler or no one, take your pick. Marius added, there are many cultures today and over the centuries around the world where people believed they or someone else had the gift of foresight. Shamans in the Amazon claim they can experience these journeys like the Aztecs, Mayans, Incas and even across continents to Africa and Asia. India probably has dozens of mystics and fakirs who claim they can. Remote thinking. Marion added, don't rule out potions and plant extracts because that's what they would be using. Possible transportation of your mind to another state. That's interesting because that mind could be placed in another vessel such as an animal. Cheesy added, like the time I fell down the stairs on a visit to Castle Seltradit to see you guys in Moldavia. And I said, tell us. Quote, I was coming out of the third-floor library on my way down the stairs, so I was reading a book as I went. Just as I got to the top of a 10-meter stone staircase the friggin' cat walked right in front of me. To which Marius and Marion both cheered, Mr. Whiskers. I did a front roll down 32 stone stairs, hitting the wall, the railing and every friggin' stair. When I hit the bottom, I simply stood up and still had my book in my hand. Not a bruise on me. At this point Marius and Marion were killing themselves laughing. Then Marius said, and who was there to dust you off? To which Cheesy replied, Darla. Marion said, that's the tumbling stair spell. It's a planted suggestion. She was probably planning that for weeks. She likes you, Gordon. We left it there for the time being and continued to consider our real estate choices. Of course, there are principles of urban development such as ribbon development with anchor stores, industrial parks with vertical marketing, car malls, malls of America, or even the big box store malls all located together. The retail aspect of people outfitting homes, working, eating, shopping, was mind-boggling. Those considerations will be for people with those skills and probably known to Grandfather Wadden. We're just working on our perceptions of the future Salton Sea world we want to see. Penn Phillips was only getting started on his grand design, so the area of Bombay Beach was relatively small when you look at the entire circumference of the lake and how much land is in the Salton Trough area. What were his ideas for the rest? Was he a visionary or just a big loser with too much money? I don't know why I thought of Roly-Poly Prince Albert at that moment. Sandy informed us, we're only at the end of the trough here, there is nothing but desert for miles all along where the canal is being planned from the Mexican border to here. The Mexican side has no development either and there may not be as many ready investors there as there are on the American side. Especially with the backing of Dick's father, grandfather and all his cronies, not to mention their business associates, relatives and other politicians and for that matter military. Even if this place doesn't go, it's almost a pyramid scheme of real estate with so many people ready to buy in when the news comes out. Thank goodness we're the first buyers the others will be buying from. It seems like all of Highway 111 was built at the 200-foot level, so the berm will always be to the left of it on the eastern shore. I have to switch between meters and feet, Fahrenheit and Celsius here in the US. That would leave all of the land between Highway 111 and the berm potential target real estate protected by the berm. Far too much real estate is available for us to buy even at desert distress prices, so picking the prime will be important. I talked to Carl on the phone, and we went over these strategies. His concerns were about where things would be built and the laws in the United States regarding construction, real estate, taxes and more. I think I would call Carl a worrywart, but that would probably stress him. I told him Uncle Sandhu was also looking into business opportunities for the cell traders and maybe he would be a valuable source of information. Bombay Beach is directly across the water from Sultan City and they're about halfway down each side of the sea. East side, west side. To call Sultan City a city is a bit futuristic even for Penn the developer. A huge development 50 times the size of Bombay Beach with streets laid out in groups and circular patterns is a huge white elephant. Carl advised me to only consider things above the 100-foot mark above lake level because anything less might have to be filled in to shore up the berm. That land would be expropriated by some level of American government for potentially less than cost. If the people are capitalists, then the government are probably super capitalists. Cheesy suggested. Turning left off Highway 111 onto Pope Street, we approach Bombay Beach for the first time. The streets were laid out in an 8x4 grid pattern with the front 2 rows twice the size of the last 2 rows. 5th Street had the vista view of the Sultan Sea and the streets counted backwards to where we came in. Horizontally, the streets were named Avenue A through to H and the outside street with the vista view was named Avenue of Palms. I thought it would be nice to see palm trees along this stretch someday, especially under streetlights. The corner of 5th Street and Avenue of Palms should be a prestigious address someday. Maybe we can sell Donald Trump a tower location. There is real estate between 5th Avenue and the sea, but it was empty and hopefully the berm will take that up. Just to be on the safe side, both sides of the street should be purchased at least for the units facing 5th Street. So, we started looking at the businesses that were there and phoning information to Carl. The Seaside Baptist Church was the only structure in the corner square. Moving back toward Pope, the next square had a government building for particulate research, then it's 2 or 3 more streets before you hit the Bombay Beach Opera Club, which was closed and abandoned. Other than that, some structures, sheds, RVs, and lots of desert. We thought we could buy the whole block and that's what we asked Carl to consider. He laughed and said he will see what he can do but was glad we were so excited by what we saw. As we drove through the streets weaving our way back to Pope and then Highway 111, everything seemed post-apocalyptic or even Mad Max. We drove along the eastern shore where Highway 111 runs at the 200-foot mark. At this point the locals, the few that there are, call it Grapefruit Boulevard. All the land to the west of Highway 111 down to the sea was available, but some will be taken in to form the berm. Grapefruit Boulevard stretches 12 km along the coast and the distance to the sea is just over a kilometer. It would make a terrific housing development if you could sit on it for 10 years. Or perhaps even a golf course or 3. Every property seemed to offer countless opportunities. At the end of the Grapefruit Boulevard was Salt Creek. The Salt Creek area was below the 200-foot mark, but above the 100-foot level, so it may be safe or at least salvageable. The same goes for the North Shore Airport. At less than 200 feet, the airport didn't look like it would represent too much of a loss. The other occupant of the North Shore was the reservation. We turned south along the western shore on Highway 86 until we reached the Desert Shores. Desert Shores was a grid about the same size as the Bombay Beach site, but it was residential and partially inhabited even then. In that area we focused only on the frontage to the sea at 100 or more feet. It seemed a bit confusing to be talking in feet, but in the United States, everything was based on the imperial system. This area is going to need the berm to be shored up on both sides. Holt Avenue, Cowell Avenue and Eddy Avenue were all the vista views, but if we could stand on the shore now, where is the shore when 7 times the water fills the sea? Salton Sea Beach Marina was located in this area, but it was risky getting closer to the shore because of the berm requirements and possibly some government usage in this area. Next on our road trip was the Red Earth Casino, which stood on a site by itself. The cell traders had to get out and look around, but the streets were unoccupied except for a convenience store. We didn't stay long because there was nothing to see and we continued on to Sultan City. The whole city was laid out with streets, sewers, lights and absolutely nobody in it. The massive size of the project took our breath away. All the streets were empty lots except in one of the satellite cities that ran off Treadwell where a small population of people lived, but it wasn't full by any stretch of the imagination. There's just too much real estate here to consider. From Salton City we headed south again to where the Imperial Valley was beginning to encroach on the sink. There's definitely an appetite for irrigated land in this part of the world because it just keeps growing like a giant caterpillar if you view it by satellite. We had circumnavigated the sea and decided to head back to Bombay Beach to find a vacant lot where we could set up camp. There was no one around to kick us out and it was unlikely anyone would care enough with a million other places they could go. Marius suggested, let's spend the night at the corner of 5th Street and Avenue of the Palms and enjoy the view that we will someday sell to Mr. Trump. We headed over with the RVs and parked them at right angles to provide a protected view of the sea. Scavenging for firewood, we set up our camp overlooking the Salton Sea from what was going to be the best address on the strip. To celebrate, the Jacks brought out some toys from the RV, 2 whips and a practice ball thrower from their act. It was a smaller version of the one I saw them use at the circus. Everyone sat around the fire in the pitch dark and watched Marius pull out his whip and walk to one side of the ball thrower. Marion took a position on the other side and said, "This unit only throws 2 colors and 1 size." He threw Cheesy a remote control and told him to set it to 10-second intervals and 5 minutes for 2 players. "You say go, Cheesy." The rest of us cheered him on or engaged in some goading and perhaps trash talk. Cheesy said, "Go," and pressed the button. The balls started popping out of the machine and were thrown about 5 meters in the air. Marius snapped his whip and took out the first one. Our American friends had never seen such a thing and were gobsmacked. When they recovered, they stood up and cheered with glee. A blue one came out and Marius snapped his whip to tie the score. Crack, pop, crack as one ball after another came out. As the score changed, everyone started cheering and hollering. With a minute left, Marius had a 2-point lead, so it was really exciting when they got to the last 10 seconds with only 1 point between them. I thought they were planning a tie, but Marius didn't miss any and unfortunately Marion was distracted by a moth which flew in his face. A cheer went up from the crowd as the event ended. If any of the Americans ever saw the Jacks in their environment, they would be amazed and would have to find another word for awesome. The Jacks passed their whips around and let Dick and Cheesy have a match with the winner to play Lance. The tournament lasted all night and if anyone was on the sea that night, they certainly knew we were there. What they might not have known was that we were going to stay and this place was not going to be the same. The sea actually looked nice with the desert moon shining down on it and being reflected back, but the smell was foul during the day but less at night. That was temporary, I hoped. In the morning, sitting around the fire with our coffee, Rick gave us a little more insight into the history of the area. For thousands of years, the river has alternately flowed into the valley, or diverted around it, creating either a saline lake called Lake Cowella, or a dry desert basin, respectively. The lake has dried up completely in the past as it did around 400 years ago. Hundreds of archaeological sites were found during these periods of drought. Perhaps every 400 years this area offered an amazing habitat for the humans of the day. Wave-cut shorelines at various elevations record a repeated cycle of filling and drying over hundreds of thousands of years. Lake Cowella, as the Salton Sink area was known, once covered over 2,000 square miles or 6 times the area of the Salton Sea. Marius said, there could be sites visible just 10 feet below the surface. The water is actually pretty clear. Cheesy told him, "I'm not going in there." Marion piped in, "Let's get some canoes." And he and Lance took a trip into the Walmart on bicycle and got him to deliver 4 fiberglass canoes and the required life jackets to our camp. The salesman thought they were nuts, but when Marius paid in cash and gave him a tip, he changed his mind and sent him out later the same day. Several of us took the canoes out on the sea and paddled about looking deep into the water but found nothing in the immediate area around our camp, but this was a big lake even though it seemed to be breathing its last breath. Of course, when it came time to turn around and return to camp, Marion and Cheesy could not help but make a race of it. Lance was able to keep up with them once he realized it was a race, but Cheesy and Marion had the drop on him because they had the idea first. As they got closer to shore, the group gathered to cheer him on, Marius, Sandy, Rick and Rowdy. Lance was gaining on him in the end, but Marius was able to beat Cheesy in the final stretch. There were 2 or 3 more races along the coast before sunset and the big barbecue we were having for dinner. Everyone was getting comfortable with the desert life and sitting around the fire at night under an unbelievable sky where so many things were moving about. Many times, the conversation came back to the Jacks. Cheesy informed us that if we wanted to buy a Jack in the Box franchise, it would cost us $50,000 for the franchise fee, and we would have to pay the corporation 5% of our gross sales and contribute another 5% of gross sales to an ongoing marketing fund. They should be paying the one-eyed Jacks the marketing money. I added, if you want to open one, you'll spend about $2.5 million to get up and running, according to Carl. Jack appealed to me with his ping-pong ball-like head, yellow clown cap, beautiful blue eyes, pointy black nose, and that red smile that warms the cockles of your heart. He's always dressed nicely in a well-pressed business suit. Ever since he confidently marched back into his office building to reclaim his rightful role as founder and CEO by activating a detonation device and exploding in a shower of smoke, wood, and paper. Jack's back. Cheesy was getting to be an aficionado on the genre and would say things like, "I love the junk in the box" ads. Some guy gets pissed off at Jack and yells at him, "Beat it, clown." So, Jack chases him down and finally tackles him to the ground, forces him to eat some food and makes him confess with a mouthful of food. Jack gets pissed because he gets grass stains on his business suit. He said there were great campaigns like the spicy crispy girls selling chicken, but our favorite was the meaty cheesy boys, a boy band selling the ultimate cheeseburger promoted by an ad campaign featuring an out-of-control advertising executive previously fired by Jack. Then there was one where a medical doctor made claims that fast food could cure baldness, help trim extra pounds, and remove wrinkles. Jack asks, "Where did you find this guy?" The ad exec proudly responded, "Our tobacco company." Cheesy had purchased a bag of 50 baseball-sized white balls of biodegradable material and drew various Jack faces on them. With some tomato cages and a pair of wire cutters, we found new Jack heads every day. They had an ad where a man washed up on a remote island with only a Jack-in-the-Box antenna ball as company. In Cheesy's version, the antenna ball fights Tom Hanks' ball Wilson and lets the air out of him. The final scene shows Tom Hanks wearing Jack on a rope around his neck, upside down like he's a trophy. But the news was not always good for Jack in the Box. In the beginning they suffered a crisis involving E. coli bacteria. 4 children died of hemolytic uremic syndrome and 600 other customers became sick after eating undercooked patties contaminated with fecal material. The chain quickly settled lawsuits but were nearly bankrupt and hemorrhaging customers to the other burger chains. That's a comeback twist worthy of M. Nightmare Shyamalan. The next day we decided to take a tour of Palm Desert and Desert Springs. The Jacks were working on plans with Uncle Sandu and Sandy wanted to stay and make a call to Sir Malcolm. The cell traders, Sandy and Rick, decided to stay in camp and take care of some business while the rest of us piled into one RV and left the other one at the campsite. Palm Springs and Palm Desert were nestled between the elbows of the mountains, so they offered all kinds of environments, terrains, and beautiful vistas to enjoy. Palm Desert had some of the swankiest country clubs, golf courses and exclusive shopping areas I had ever seen, but the boys were from the Riviera and were less impressed. The shops on El Paseo featured designer boutiques intermingled with restaurants and art galleries which Marius said reminded him of France. The Jacks interacted with any and all of the live entertainment they encountered in the warm desert sun plying their trade. Buskers were playing music, performing comedy skits, and dancing up and down stairways, escalators, and fountains. Cheesy asked, "Where are the mimes?" "There have to be mimes. What a place to retire to if you could afford it." Palm Springs was a little different as we found out. It was all about hot springs with hotels, golf courses and spas which were all connected or interconnected. The shopping on Palm Canyon Drive serviced the wealthy patrons with shops and boutiques and a big wet dash of bootlicking. The desert ends at hills and valleys where the vegetation makes it great for hiking, biking and horseback trails, but as usual, the beauty comes with a beast, the venomous rattlesnake. There are areas like this in the sink which are back from the sea. Some of the most prestigious addresses in Los Angeles are the hills as well. However, they're generally not the first to sell. Powering all of this personal pampering requires a lot of energy. Geothermal energy is no stranger to the Salton Sea, and through geothermal production you have the added ability to extract lithium and silica. Lithium is crucial in the development of rechargeable batteries used to power electronic devices including vehicles. Extracting lithium from geothermal brine in geothermal production is reputed to be eco-friendly. Silica can be added to so many products to make those products better. Geothermal fields generate electric power and in the process pump brine water from underground to surface ponds. Evaporation removes most of the water, quickly leaving silica waste as the residual product. Some types of geothermal production processes inject water into the ground like fracking for oil and can have significant impact on the underground geology in that area of the continent. Even though he was an oil man, Dig didn't have nice things to say about fracking. Dig got the great idea for us all to get bikes when we were in Palm Springs looking at all the trails. We decided to go back to the Walmart and buy a bunch of ready-built bikes. It only took an hour, and we were loading 9 bikes of varying description, color, size and quality into the RV. Lance and Rick decided to ride back to camp on 2 of the bikes. We tried to get the same helmets as a joke, but unfortunately, they didn't have that many of one type. Our camp was starting to look bigger and better every day. The RVs were now parked in more permanent locations blocking out the sun. We had a campfire with lots of seating, a food area, viewing areas to look out over the sea and a rock-built bicycle rack. Several tarps stretched out provided shade during the day and helped funnel the wind where we wanted it. Channeling the wind was Marius' idea, and he brilliantly arranged the tarps so they would keep a constant breeze blowing through the camp all day long. The rest of the area around us would be calm, and yet you could see Cheesy's hair blowing in the wind inside the camp. At night he would move one tarp and the whole wind movement within the camp would change. Sandy, Dick and Marion were sleeping outside at night in hammocks they had constructed. Cheesy told us, "The Jack in the Box Corporation is a lot like its own character, Jack." Listen to this. A state tax dispute shut the chain down for several days due to unpaid taxes. Then in another article they're accused of selling horse meat at their international locations, but they don't even have any international locations, they only operate in the United States. Somebody is after these guys. I added, Jack is really misunderstood. He's portrayed as a cunning, evil, lustful, and manipulative bastard. Misogynistic by nature, oppressive, arrogant, and exceedingly cruel. I thought if we need anyone to portray Jack in a movie, then Ian's brother Richard would be perfect. In his defense, Marion said, Jack is known to be a highly competitive and pugnacious fighter, especially when challenging the Tin Soldier in a violent struggle with that massive sword of his. Marius added, there's a Jack's secret menu for fans in the know. If you want a particular menu item made a certain way, all you have to do is ask, any time of day. Know the secret words and get the secret meal or whatever else may be in the box. Dick told us, there's more than 2,200 locations in the United States, but almost half are in California and half of the rest are in Texas. I love these places. Every day Carl called with more updates and closings on pieces of property. The count was 9 now and we had hardly put a dent in the fund. Sandy came to Dick, Cheesy and I with a plan. He knew that we were buying land for investment, but if he were to purchase a home for himself, he would want to have his house near the Sunny Bono Bird Sanctuary bordering the Imperial National Wildlife Refuge. He found a piece of property that bordered the sanctuary completely and extended out into the desert towards Bombay Beach, but about 6 kilometers down the eastern shore. We rode the bikes down the next day to get a look at the site he had chosen and saw some incredible birds and vistas over the wetlands, even with the sea in the state that it was in. If it looked this good at its lowest ebb, then what was the upside potential? Dick was the only one who had to check his finances, so he said he was in if Carl could make it work for him. Cheesy had enough personal money for this type of venture and Carl told me I was good to go. Cheesy was now in California and not on the Riviera. He'd already been to Atlantic City, so now he had Las Vegas to visit as well, an array of new casinos that didn't know him. In this part of the world, he'll not be without funds when and if he needs them. These casinos had no idea Corridon Zola was in town. The temperature had been sweltering and the sun blistering, so we constructed a large area under a new tarpaulin Dick picked up. If things got really bad, then cooling off in the RVs was always an option. On the bike rides a hat was a must, as was water and places to nip into the shade. Evening rides were popular and we did run into other campers who were even more eccentric than us. The heat made me think that if there are lots of people living here, then they're going to require a lot of electricity. In the desert you don't have hydro dams, being below sea level doesn't let a lot of wind blow by, but you do have an abundance of sun. A solar farm could turn sunlight into hydro into money. Why not? I'll have to find out why not and at least go solar when we live here. Several people had arrived in camp in the last couple of days. They were relatives of the cell traders and performers in the circus who had arrived to work with Marion and Marius for a couple of months. A couple of cases of equipment arrived with them, which included equipment which could be used for climbing. This gave Lance, Dick, Marius, and Marion an opportunity to climb some cliffs, so they rode out on the bikes and found several areas they liked to climb. Marius told Cheesy, on one climbing trip I saw the entrance to cave, but it was out of reach from where I was. The next time we went back to that location I couldn't find it. I began to think that perhaps it was an illusion created by shadows being cast as the sun changed its direction over the course of the day. However, I went back with Lance one day at a totally different time of day and he saw it as well, but again we couldn't reach it. Lance is an avid climber, so he bought the property below the cliff. I had Uncle Sandu pick me up the one beside it, and I think I might throw a tent up there. Where there's one cave, there may be others. On our last night at the Salton Sea, we sat around the fire and looked up at the desert sky with more stars than anywhere I had seen with the exception of Africa. With no background light anywhere, the stars seemed to pop out of the sky. The sky was active here with multiple shooting stars and so many satellites I thought it was an invasion force. How many of those were UFOs? Once the development puts the lights on in the sink, this sky will disappear. The Cell-Traded brothers decided to stay at Bombay Beach and live on one of the properties we bought with the 2 RVs. They had arranged with Dick to take over the financing on the RVs and planned to anchor them down. It was the perfect spot to work on their act and build some new content. The desert seemed to agree with them, and they wanted to take advantage of it as well as have a break. Las Vegas was only 6 hours away, so they decided to purchase some motorcycles to go with the RVs and bikes. Marius and Marian loved the isolation and the crazy antics of the people they met in this environment. Uncle Sandu was expected to join him for a few months or as long as tourist visas last. If all else fails, they will enroll as students somewhere. Cheesy was going to see about transferring from MIT to one of the California schools like the University of Southern California, Berkeley, or UCLA. The Jacks and Cheesy went motorcycle shopping after we left. The rest of us had to rejoin the world and Dick and the boys had to rejoin the cadets. I returned to Oxford and found the house in great shape. Errol had made a few improvements that were on our wish list, so it made it easy to settle into the school routine. To achieve my school goals, I had to earn a bachelor's degree in biological science first. Programs in that area concentrated on cell and molecular biology. It's supposed to take 4 years for an undergraduate degree and both Errol and I are in our second year. Many of our courses are the same, but we do have some elective differences. I wanted to focus on genetic materials rather than general science. There are lots of interesting courses coming up this semester and throughout the curriculum, including organic chemistry, cell biology, structural biochemistry, evolutionary biology and molecular genetics. I sure could use some tutoring from Dr. Sue and Dr. Ben. After that I'll have to get a graduate degree with a specialization in biological science. In that degree program I should learn about genetic systems analysis, microbiology, medical anthropology, evolutionary genetics, and human disease modeling. Errol and I both wanted to learn about CRISPR as well. The CRISPR immune system works to protect bacteria from repeated viral attack. It could be the key to the devil's pendulum. Going to school seems like a way of life to me. Many of my acquaintances at this school are anxious to get out in the workplace and get on with their lives. I still have 5 or 6 years of education left. Either I'm a patient person or being independently wealthy provides one with the patience required. Errol said his mom Mary was doing well. Now that she only had Errol's tuition to worry about, she and Uncle Artis moved into a new place that's closer to the cannery and has better access to her bar job near the center of Hobart. A trip home is still not in the cards for another year. I received a call from Ian in late November informing me that Sir Malcolm had passed away and he gave me details of the funeral. Sir Malcolm was going to be cremated, but there was still a ceremony for his English family. He recounted the story of Sir Malcolm's last night as told to him by Sandy. According to Sandy, Sir Malcolm seemed agitated most of the day by things that would not normally bother him. He was just not his normal self. The evening meal was consumed in silence and then he went directly to his bungalow, sat at the floor cross-legged and went into a meditative state. When I checked on him before I retired, he was still in the same position. I placed my hand on his shoulder and he was ice cold. Waking him just enough to move him to his bed, I covered him in blankets. Sandy told him and then went on to say, I sat with him for a while and as he warmed up, he began to come out of his meditative state and then entered a delirious state that deeply concerned me. Ian said, Sir Malcolm went on to incoherently babble and become increasingly restless as if he was battling all the demons of his life at once. After an hour or so of babbling, convulsing, and raising his arms, Sandy said he let out a big sigh and slipped away. His funeral is in London next week. Will I see you there? I replied, of course. But the words got caught in my throat as they came out and I fought back tears for a man I knew for only a brief period but that I had touched me. Ian added, I'll let Cheesy and Dick know. Dick's short on leave because of your long trip this summer. Ian was right, and only Cheesy could make it. At the funeral we met up with Sandy and had some time to speak to him. Apparently in the will of Sir Malcolm he had left his English estate to a Havelock on his father's side and let him carry on the title of Lord. There were many in India who had an impact on Sir Malcolm's life, so much of his estate was distributed amongst various monasteries, shrines, temples, and individuals. Sir Malcolm left Ian's father a large section of land adjacent to Windhaven that he purchased in 1965 when Ian's grandfather repurchased Windhaven. In addition, he left a small annual stipend to the Windhaven Labs plc. To Sandev he left his father's home in New Delhi, India and all of its contents, including sufficient incomes to maintain it in perpetuity. To Ian he left his own home in India under the same conditions. Ian had been to India as a child, but barely remembered Sir Malcolm's home, because there were so many beautiful estates in that part of the world if you're British. Right next door there could be some horrible places if you're Indian. Sir Malcolm was cremated, and his last wish was to have his ashes spread in a very specific location in India accompanied by a GPS location. Sandy asked if we would come to India next summer and attend to this task with him. There are many factors that can exert force on a pendulum to set it in motion. Sometimes the force is minor or even insignificant. If the motion is minor, then the swing is imperceptible to those who might not agree with the direction it's taking. Sometimes the force is major and significant. If the motion is major, then the swing is major to those who might not agree, and they will definitely push back, if they're capable and if they're willing. And of course, there is that one massive input of force that has been building up which can send the pendulum past its pivot with no opportunity for response. There is no other single factor, outside of nature, that can deliver that overwhelming force than insider knowledge. Insider knowledge provides momentum-built force released all at once like a dam bursting. It's like walking into a door for the outsider. People believe inside knowledge only refers to the stock market and is reserved for the Martha Stewarts of the world. If you have knowledge about a company and that knowledge is not accessible by the public, then you have insider knowledge. Consider a merger with your brother-in-law's company or the company getting a government contract from your Uncle Bob that will have a significant impact on the value of the company. You are said to be on the inside. Inside knowledge can be part of everyday life when you consider it simply having knowledge that someone else doesn't. When Cheesy counts cards, they call it cheating because he knows the next card that's coming up. I think that's inside knowledge, and they're just pissed off they aren't on the inside. When a police officer waits behind a tree at the bottom of a hill where they knows people accelerate, is that insider knowledge or entrapment? When a hunter drives prey towards a cliff, where they know the fall will kill them, is that insider knowledge or survival? When a student has the answer sheet for the exam, is that insider knowledge or cheating? Newton's first law tells us an object will not change its motion unless a force acts upon it. And that's how the apple got Newton's pendulums moving.